Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another big Survivor ranking. We're here for my somehow 6-year anniversary of doing this channel. I'm going to redo the video that I did on the 1-year anniversary of doing this channel. Probably the most controversial rank I've ever done, that being my runner-up ranking for Survivor US. Where again, we are here 5 years later, and in that time there has been 8 more seasons of Survivor to be added to the list, along with other changes I made along the way. And since then, I've also done a global runner-up ranking. In that list, I included Winners at War by that point. Now we're at the point where, again, we have the entire new era to add to this list as well. So, again, we got a lot of people to rank here. Now, again, I will be ranking them on the games that they played on these specific seasons. And to clarify also, when it comes to runners-up, I do consider anybody that made it to the final tribal as a runner-up. As to me, there's not much that distinguishes the games of someone that is a second or third place when they all made the final tribal anyway. Or through them, and you could maybe qualm with the fact that why isn't this called a finalist ranking? Anyway, we're doing the runner-up ranking. We have 79 players to rank. Let's start off at number 79, where straight up, I did end up structuring this list pretty similarly to my winner ranking, my updated one, to where I separated the groups into 9 separate tiers. And we're starting off here with a grouping of people that I do think got just very fortunate to even get to the end of the game, people that never really were in majority groups, or people that had to get to the end through challenges or extensive luck-based circumstances. And through that, again, we're going to be starting it all off at 79 with the biggest example of all this, probably one of the worst games you could possibly play as a runner-up, and that comes from Natalie Anderson from Winners at War. And again, this is not talking about Natalie Anderson as a player. Natalie Anderson is obviously one of the best players to ever be a runner-up on Survivor. However, when we're just simply looking at the game that she played on Winners at War, it is truly atrocious. I think this is the worst possible game you can play for a person that makes it to Final Tribal. She is someone that is literally the first boot of her season and spends the entire season on the edge of extinction. And when she returns from the edge of extinction, she doesn't even proceed to really have much agency in her game beyond that. At that point, she's just on the bottom, simply surviving because she has idols or challenge wins. To where again, she enters the game with an idol in her pocket. She's able to play that final 6 to keep her safe there, in a spot where again, she very likely would have gone in that spot. At final 5, she once again is able to find an idol to save herself there, and even then ends up playing it incorrectly in a spot where again, they end up voting for Michelle. And at final 4, she ends up winning immunity to where she can't be taken out there, and then proceeds to have this chance in front of her of putting herself in the fire, which again, I do think the overall notion of you have to put yourself in the fire to win the game at points to be, again, just ridiculous. But I do think Natalie is the type of person that definitely needed to, especially take out Tony in particular, and the fact that she doesn't end up doing that and just lets herself get to the end against Tony is, again, just so underwhelming. And I think this is a terrible game of Survivor. I think this is one where I think she does almost everything wrong, especially when in the actual game itself, and just kind of stumbles her way to the end in a spot where even then, I don't even know what her win equity is. I think it's very tough to even see a winning scenario, considering it does seem like there was a decent chunk of the winners that were very anti-edge of extinction. And through that, again, I just find it very tough to see Natalie beating most people, to where even in a situation where it's like Natalie, Michelle, Ben, I feel like even then Michelle is probably the front runner, even though, to fair, I think Michelle and Ben could probably split votes. But still, at the end of the day, I think Natalie's game is, again, truly atrocious here, and really like the antithesis to the Natalie that we saw in San Juan del Sur, who was making such bold plays, playing very aggressively. And here we just see her do the complete opposite of that, because that for me, she's the worst runner-up of all time. Again, going even beyond just Survivor US, of any Survivor series I've ever watched. She's here at number 79. Now, number 78, we're moving on to another player that got voted out, came back to the game, which to me, especially in a spot where, again, you skip out on rounds, I feel like that is one of the biggest knocks you can have against your game, especially when comparing against other people that ended up in the same place as you. And at 78, we do have Lillian Morris from Survivor Pearl Islands. And Lil is someone that I actually think her game, outside of the fact that she was voted out and came back to the game, is actually not entirely bad. And even when looking at the situation where she is voted out, I think it is a somewhat unlucky circumstance. Again, the fact that she is on the Morgan tribe, which loses 3 challenges early on, and proceed to not lose another challenge after she's voted out. Again, if she just survived that one round, she's probably set for a deep run without having ever gotten voted out. But still, she's voted out. She misses out on 3 rounds of the game and comes back at the time of the merge, again, in a very beneficial position. Obviously safe throughout that merge vote, and then becomes this massive swing in the game. And again, I talked about this when I talked about Pearl Islands. I do think Lil actually has a lot more agency in how she plays in Pearl Islands than people give her credit for, or I think a lot of people think of her as this GOAT that everyone was just dragging to the end, when that's simply not the case. It was actually really the opposite. People looked at her as this massive threat while on the island, only to, again, realize the jury simply had no respect for her, but in terms of her perception on the island, people actually did think she was a threat in the game, and I do think that makes her navigation through the game a lot more impressive. The fact that she's able to get Dara voted out when she is, the fact that she's able to flip the vote on Burton, and again, I do think there are things that Lil does well. In reality, I think she probably plays one of the better games of someone that has been voted out and had to come back, but she is still in a spot where, again, she still fundamentally failed at the goal of Survivor, and even then, even if she had survived throughout the pre-merge, she was pretty much on the bottom the entire way there. And obviously, again, like the twist does put her in a very good position once she gets back into the game, but I do think her navigation through the game is actually pretty solid, but at the end of the day, I do feel like her being voted out and coming back is enough to put her here at number 78. Now, number 77, we're moving on to a couple players that definitely benefited from a series of challenge wins, where again, for me, again, I do dock against challenge wins. Now, again, for me, I do dock against needing challenge wins, again, being a spot where you go home if you don't win a challenge. But practically, I think at the end of the day, it is more so like a minor nick against a person's game. It's just an aspect of luck where, again, obviously everyone has aspects of luck within their game. It is at the point where you need multiple challenge wins is where I do knock you quite a bit. And again, we're starting it off with a really early winner, one that definitely needed a few challenges towards the end. And that person is Kim Johnson. And Kim Johnson is kind of a weird player in the sense that he is in the majority for a lot of the game. She is with the Boron 3. She is with, again, the likes of Ethan, Lex, and Big Tom. And she's always their fourth. Again, she is in a decent position for the majority of the game in the sense that she is relatively safe in the game. However, she also has very little agency throughout that portion of the game. It really feels like she's more so playing for Ethan, where I feel like Ethan is the one like making the decision to take out Silas. And obviously Lex is like leading the alliance when Lex is there. And again, it doesn't feel like Kim is doing much on her own, despite the fact that she's clearly on the bottom of that group. And again, she gets the final four in a spot where she's going home if she doesn't win immunity and proceeds to be in the same spot the final three, where even Ethan, again, her closest ally in the game, is ready to vote her out had she not won immunity. And again, I think that is a major ding against her, the fact that she needs those final two immunities to get to the end, especially in a spot where, again, the final four immunity is one that, again, notoriously had a very questionable result, and the fact that obviously one of the questions was written in a way that, again, the producers did not realize it had multiple answers, and through that, Lex kind of gets screwed out of not going to a tiebreaker there. And again, at the end of the day, Kim could have potentially won it by the end anyway, but again, it is still something to note here, to where if she ends up losing there, she ends up being voted out there in that spot, to where, again, I think Kim's game is not particularly good. I mean, like, again, if she didn't even need those last few immunities, she'd still not be particularly high on this list. I mean, she'd be maybe like 10 to 15 spots higher. Again, part of this like grouping of people who were just like kind of followers in the game, but get to the end in a pretty clean way. But again, she's not that. She's someone that is that for the majority of the game, but it also has a very rocky end game path. And through that, again, I just think Kim Johnson's game is pretty lackluster. She's here number 77. Now, number 76, a player that I do debate with Kim Johnson in the sense that this is a person who actually needed to win out more. This is a person that had to have a much longer winning streak, but also I do think aspects of their game from before their win streak was actually better. And that person is Kelly Wigglesworth. And Kelly is a player here that, again, early on, she was a massive power player in the game. She's actually one of the few players in the early days that actually was playing the game in the way that we know it now. Again, creating alliances, campaigning for votes. Yeah, something just seems to shift in her by the time the early merge, where she kind of just gives up on that, where she kind of just like falls into the trap of feeling like playing the game is immoral and decides to just step out of her alliance, and through it becomes a massive target on the board. Again, she needs to win a lot of those endgame immunity challenges, essentially from final six on. And again, she does end up winning all those immunities, but it's still a spot where she's on if she doesn't win a single one of those. And I think that is obviously a major knock against her game. But again, in comparison to Kim Johnson, the reason I do have Kelly above her is simply because, again, I do think she had a lot more agency before that. Again, she is part of, again, the first ever alliance with Stacy. She is someone that then proceeds to have a duo with Sue, and they end up pulling in Rich, which ends up the formation of the Toggy Four. And again, I think there is a lot more active work there from Kelly than there is from Kim Johnson, who just seems to just be following for a lot of the game. Again, I feel like Kelly was a driver in the game until she just simply gives up on playing that aspect of the game, which is what makes her game so like kind of underwhelming by the end, and the fact that she had like the right idea for a good chunk of it, but then just kind of gives up on that notion. But still, at the end of the day, for me, I do have to put Kelly here at number 76. Now, number 75, we're moving on to a player that I really want to put higher, as I do like this person, and I do respect the fact that they at least tried constantly throughout the game. But again, their game is essentially summed up by the fact that they failed over and over and over again. And at number 75, I do have Jake from Survivor 45. And again, Jake is someone that I think has potential. Again, I think he's a player that, again, does recognize what he's supposed to do in the game and does make strides to make those moves. The problem is that he fails at making those moves. The fact that he doesn't really have the social capital to pull off any of these moves, and through that essentially ends up being on the bottom for pretty much the entire game. in a spot where, again, he's a decoy vote for a lot of the season. Now, again, I will give him credit for the fact that he seemingly is safe early on in the game. Again, while he's not really in a power position, to be fair, he's probably next on the totem pole after Bruce. He is someone that is at least not in direct danger throughout the entire pre-merge phase, where it does seem like, again, Bruce was the bigger target there. But following that, once we get to the merge, again, Jake just kind of fails at almost every step. Again, he wants to keep Jeremiah around. He ends up not being able to do anything about that. He ends up trying to make a move to save Caleb and proceeds to instead blow up his own game in that process and, again, burn his relationship with Julie. He then also thinks he's going home during the Kelly blindside, uses his shot in the dark, only to obviously realize that the plan was going a different direction. He also ends up being the secondary target during the Kendra boot. During Bruce vote, he has to essentially end up voting out another one of his only allies. He, to be fair, is involved in the majority when Emily ends up going home, in the sense that, again, he is part of the group that votes for Julie, only for the idol play to happen. But, again, he's still not getting his way there. Same thing with at the Drew vote. Again, he thinks that he's concocting this big blindside on Drew when really it was a plan that already Dee and Katurah and Julie already had. And again, we get the final 5 play, which again is admirable in the fact that he is again doing something that should be optimal play, again getting Dee out. But again, the fact that he does not have that social capital with Katurah to make her at least trust him for this one vote that is so integral to both of their games, I think is so bad as well. And beyond that, I just think it's very difficult to see Jake winning this season as well, where while obviously people liked him, and there's just simply not much respect there for him. So again, I think Jake is a player that, again, I really like, and I wish I could put him higher on this list, but there's simply just nothing he really succeeds at throughout this season. So because of that, for me, he's here number 75. Now at 74, pretty much same thing. Again, another person that I do very much like, and I wish I could put them higher on this list. Yet after thinking it through, I just really struggle doing so, because again, this is another person that very rarely finds themselves in a position of power. Now, again, I think this person's probably a better player than a lot of the players we're about to be talking about. I actually think this is a person that has potential in the game, in the sense that I think they at least have longevity in a lot of positions and also would be able to find themselves in a majority group on more seasons. But I just think their overall play on the season that they were runner-up on is very lackluster, and that person is Owen from Survivor 43. And again, I did think about this for a while, as to me it does feel a little bit weird to have Owen this low when we have, again, other very lackluster runners-up that we're about to be talking about. But I think the thing for me with Owen is the fact that, and I just feel like he's never in a position where he's stably in the majority, and if there is that position, it's towards the end game. But even then, that's a spot where, again, people just assume that they would beat him at the end. Or looking at the early game of the season, again, he's the backup target to Mariah. He is someone that, in a spot where they did not feel like they needed physical strength, there's a shot Owen is the first boot there. And beyond that, Owen's probably gone if they go to any of the other pre-merge tribals. Mind you, that's because Gabler has an idol, and because, again, between Sammy and Owen, it does look like Ellie and Janine would have sided with taking out Owen, unless Sammy makes a big move and tries to get the guys together, but I don't know if he necessarily would have in that specific spot. But still, either way, Owen is in a lot of danger throughout the rest of that pre-merge phase, and I think that is something to knock against him as well. And again, it's a position where typically that style of player comes into merge and is able to recover in the game, build strong bonds, and be part of this new majority, only for him to just, again, be on the bottom, where Ellie goes home against his wishes. He's blindsided at the Dwight vote, and then proceeds to also be the secondary target of the Janine vote, to where, again, his early merge phase is also very bad. While, again, he does start to build some relationships with the likes of, Noelle, and we do see them pull off this James blindside. It's still a spot where Owen just doesn't really have much, traction in the game, especially as, again, he's perceived to be blindsided to Noelle boot as well, and loses Sammy at 7, a spot where, again, that wasn't particularly beneficial for his game, to where, again, I think his game really up until the final 6 is pretty bad. Again, very much in line with Jake's. However, I do think his final 6 on is better than Jake's, at least in the sense that, again, he is actually in the majority group. He is at least involved with what is going on. Again, he is involved in the Cody blindside. Obviously, that is something you would give a lot more credit to Jesse, but again, he's still there when it's happening and part of the group that ends up voting out Cody. He then is, again, in a solid, essentially 3-person alliance to get to the final 3 with Cassidy and Gabler, and has a pretty easy ride following that. To where, again, I think that end game stretch, that literal last 3 rounds of the game, is a spot where, again, he actually does have a little bit of agency there. Now, again, at the end of the day, it's just such a small portion of the game to where I just find it tough to really rank him much higher. But again, in comparison to Jake, at least he does have that little glimmer at the very end. Along with the fact that I think he at least has more win equity kind of. Now, again, neither of them were winning the game, and I think Owen, obviously his best case scenario was the situation that he had against Gabler and Cassidy, but again, had there been a final two between him and Cassidy, which again, obviously was never happening, but again, in that world, he probably does win. So again, I think there's at least worlds where Owen could get a good chunk of votes, especially if he has a good final trial performance in a spot where, again, I don't know if Jake ever has that. So again, I think in terms of him versus Jake, I think he's a step above Jake, but I find it tough to really put him that much higher because for me, he's here number 74, not number 73. And this is kind of the epitome of the notion that, again, I think Owen is a better player than this player. Yeah, I think their games are on similar levels, but I think this person had a bit more stable of a ride through the game and also potentially more win equity. And that person is Nora from Survivor Island of the Idols. And again, Nora is a player that I think most people just look at her as this wacky, crazy person that could never win the game. And again, it's partially true. I think she will very much struggle in most final three situations. However, supposedly, if there was actually a Dean Dan final three, Nora would have had a good shot at winning there, where it did seem like the jury at least had like this semblance of respect for Nora, to where, again, I think there's at least a winning scenario for her, which, to be fair, isn't that out of the realm possibility if Dan did not get ejected, where, Dan did not get ejected, then Janet and Lauren are out next, and again, if Ami somehow loses fire making, Nora might win the game in that spot. And again, for me, that's like a main argument of why she's higher than Owen and Jake in a spot where, again, I think she's obviously a worse player than Owen and Jake, but also, again, when looking at like navigation through the game, again, she's more solidly in the majority for a lot of it. Mind you, again, it's a spot where she doesn't really have much agency within that majority. She's simply just there and being like this decoy during the Molly vote, kind of, again, on the outs during like the Kelly vote off. And while she's able to reacclimate within the majority, she's still in a spot where, again, she's just kind of this tool being used by Tommy and Lauren in the game, more so than her having any say in what's actually going on. Just, again, her leaking information between both sides. And again, it's not an overly impressive game. It's one where, again, I do think she's playing against her own best interest for a decent chunk of it. And it's a spot where she's not really doing anything to really benefit her position. And again, even if she had gotten to that end game situation that she could have won, it wouldn't have been an impressive win. It would have been one where she kind of just stumbles into that winning situation, where I don't think she was like actively thinking throughout the entire game that I need to get to the end against Dan and Dean. I think she just would have ended up there because of how the game played around her. So again, I think like the likes of Owen and Jake are actually players I think had more like agency throughout their games, but I think Nora's just a player that, again, was safer and at least was in the know of what was going on for more of the game, also having a winning scenario. So again, I think barely Nora ends up being higher than them at number 73. Now number 72, and this one was a very difficult one for me, where this is a person who was much higher on this list in previous videos, even though, again, they were never particularly high, but I feel like this is a player that, in my opinion, their game has really gone down over time, and that person is Wu from Survivor Cagayan. And again, I think there's a world where you can argue Wu should be, again, higher on this list. Again, probably debatably like 20-ish, 15, 20 spots higher on this list like he used to be. But I think when really contextualizing his game now, I do think Wu's game is pretty bad, and it's another one of these spots where, again, he's really just on the bottom for a lot of the game. Again, he does have an alliance with, again, like Cliff and Lindsay and Sarah initially, but Tony ends up flipping that around, pulling in Sarah, and again, Wu was like more of this like swing vote at that point, but again, likely would have been strong-armed into going against Cliff or Lindsay in a spot where, again, that's something that he wouldn't have wanted to do. He's also on the bottom when Cliff eventually does go home and would have been the next person voted out had they gone to another tribal. But then he gets to emerge where, again, he ends up on the majority side, but again, due to nothing that he like actively does, and he's simply just there when like Trish is the one to pull over Cass, and again, we have Tony really just guiding Wu through the game in a spot where, again, Wu's making these moves that aren't even necessarily for his best interest. Tony ends up tricking him to blindsiding LJ, and Tony also ends up getting him on board, taking out Jeffra, despite the fact that Tony never wanted to go to the end with Wu. And I think this is also a major thing that I knock against Wu at this point, is the fact that Wu's endgame is essentially one where, again, he's so blindly loyal to Tony in a spot where Tony was never really that loyal back. Where, again, in a final two situation, Tony was never taking Wu to the final two. Tony was always going to take Cass over him. And I think you also have to consider the fact that Wu just outright loses if there's a final three. Again, most seasons have a final three. It is very rare, especially in that era of the show, to have a final two. Yet, again, the surprise of a final two is the only reason why Wu even has a chance at winning, as he just outright loses if it's a Tony Wu Cass final three. And while, yes, again, he does finally have win equity in the final two situation against Cass, he then also proceeds to make the wrong decision, taking Tony to the end, where he again would have blown out Cass in like a 7-2 vote. So again, Wu's game really, like when thinking about it, is really bad. I think the pro, again, against the likes of, again, Nora, Owen, Jake, is that, again, he's at least involved in votes for more of the season. Again, he is obviously, again, looped in into pretty much everything that's going on in terms of the vote result for the back portion of the season. But again, there's so many like holes in his game and situations where he just dooms his own game to where, again, I think it's really difficult to put him much higher on the list for me. He's here at number 72. Now, number 71, we're moving on to a player that I think I also used to have higher on the list. Again, a player that I think on paper feels like they should be higher on the list, because I do think this is a person that most of their game is actually not entirely bad. I think their game up until like the final 6 is, again, a competent one. But I do think their endgame stretch is pretty rough, with them being saved by an idol in particular, and that person is Jacqueline. And again, Jacqueline's this player that early on also had a very rough game and was on the bottom from the very beginning. And obviously there was this like all men's alliance that came together. And again, not necessarily faulting her for being in that spot, but I will fault her for the fact that, again, like someone like Baylor found her way to that group and had relationships with people on the other side, where Jacqueline just seemed to not, and proceeded to be blindsided both the Nadia and the Val votes. And then she proceeds to get, again, a very fortunate swap where she works with John from that point on. And again, I think you can give her credit for, again, stirring the votes against Josh, even though, again, you can question the strategy behind that. It does seem like she does it more so just because she's annoyed at how Josh's side isn't giving her attention. But again, it's still a moment where she does end up doing something that John doesn't want to do and gets them to do it. Beyond that, though, I do feel like she's largely just kind of there, and in a spot where she's actually willing to sacrifice her game, where, again, a less talked about aspect of San Juan Lusur at this point is that the Majority Alliance had actually made an agreement to just let John, Missy, and Natalie be the final 3 from like relatively early on. And through that, Jacqueline was in this spot where she was very much willing to lay down her sword for John, given the opportunity, yet just never had the opportunity, as again, she's blindsided when John goes home. Though again, I will say that, again, that stretch before that is decent. Again, she's in the Majority Alliance, and her and John are major swing votes for a lot of it. And again, that is at least impressive. But again, she's blindsided the John vote and proceeds to be saved by Natalie's idol play in a spot where, again, you can argue that, oh, Jacqueline had a good relationship with Natalie to get her to play the idol on her, even though I don't think that's really what happened. I think it's more so the fact that Natalie recognized that if she gets to the final 3 with both Missy and Baylor, then she's kind of screwed if Keith wins immunity. And again, that's more so the reason why Jacqueline ends up getting saved. And again, that's the spot where she's being saved like completely out of her control, essentially. Again, it's more so Natalie's active play that gets her saved more than anything Jacqueline does on her own. And again, I think when also adding in the fact that I think she very much struggles in her jury vote. I mean, obviously, I think she potentially beats Missy and Baylor. She also, again, didn't really have the opportunity to get into that position, both from practical reasons and also, again, lack of agency of maintaining relationships enough to get that situation to happen, where I think Jacqueline's game is, again, just kind of faulty in retrospect. I think it's one that I probably held in high regard beforehand, yet now when thinking about it a bit more, I do feel like she's someone that, while I think there is some decent play there, especially in that middle stretch of the game, I feel like the beginning of her game's pretty bad. I think the end of her game's pretty sloppy as well, and I think she just didn't have that much win equity a lot of the season. So because of that, for me, she's here number 71. Now number 70, we're moving on to a player that I'm sure people are going to be upset at this person being so low, but screw it. You have Michelle Fitzgerald from Survivor Winners at War. And I think Michelle probably plays like one of the more overrated games in Survivor history. It's a spot where, again, a lot of people do talk about how Michelle very much improved her game over Ko Wrong, when it's like she kind of didn't. Like, her game's pretty much the exact same, except for the fact that she had like less win equity. And while, again, she doesn't get there due to a Joe medevac, this time she gets there because Natalie comes back from the Edge of Extinction. And again, to be fair, obviously they all knew Edge of Extinction was in the game the entire time, and no matter who comes back from the Edge of Extinction is pretty much going to work with Michelle. Again, still a spot where like Michelle is just kind of dangling onto the game for a lot of it, and is simply just not taken out because she's not big enough of a threat. At the point where she actually would have been taken out, she's very much benefited from the Edge of Extinction returning, and even then gets to an endgame situation where she has very little win equity. While there are people that do want to vote for her, I think it's very tough to see the world where she actually does get the votes. And that situation is, again, against the likes of Ben or the likes of Denise, people that she votes out of the game towards the end game stretch. But again, her game is one that, again, I just never found overly impressive. It's one where, again, she's blindsided right away when Natalie goes home, and she's able to recover and like work alongside Jeremy and like Adam and Denise and be in more of this like swing position during the Ethan vote, which is probably the highlight of her game. But then following that, again, is very much benefited by the swap, a position where, again, she has her entire pregame alliance with her that keeps her throughout that portion of the game. And then at the merge is once again blindsided when Wendell goes home. And again, is being kept around following that just because there's bigger threats and likes of Jeremy and Kim Spradlin around. but even then isn't being looped into what's really happening because she's being isolated alongside Jeremy. And again, she's eventually involved in like the Sophie blindside, but it's not because of anything like she did herself. And then like once Jeremy goes, Nick ends up trying to pick her up as a number, even though again they're both on the bottom together again. Again, she really is like very rarely in a power position in the game. Again, really the only point that she is in this true power position is back at the Ethan vote, where beyond that she's simply just on the bottom the entire time, and then gets like very much benefited by the Edge of Extinction, where Nally coming back is this really big godsend for her game, as again she's probably the next out had Edge of Extinction not happened. And even when it does, again she's technically supposed to be voted out 5, where had it not been for Ben laying down his sword, she does go at 5. And again, struggles to win against either of Tony or Sarah, who are almost always getting to the end by that portion of the game. Though again, I just don't think Michelle's game is particularly good. Again, it's essentially a very similar game to how she played the first time, even having, again, a very luck-based circumstance benefit her in the game at the very end of the game, to where, again, for me, it's not much better. But it's here to put her at number 70. Now number 69. We're now moving on to a player that has dropped significantly on this list. Now, when I did my global runner-up ranking, they were, I believe, like towards the middle of the list. Mine was right after their season. Yeah, as time has gone on, I do recognize this person got very benefited by twists and kind of messed up their own game. And we do have Deshawn from Survivor 41. And Deshawn's this like weird player in a sense that I think his first half of his game is pretty good. Again, he is in a very dominant position throughout the first portions of the game. And I think if we were just taking his game on paper without looking at like the context of how he navigates through the end portions of the game, again, yeah, he should be in this like semi-dominant tier. This person who has a lot of control early on, then loses it, but still gets his way to the end. The issues with that come from the fact that, one, I think he self-sabotages his game. Again, the fact that he ends up targeting Shan at the Shan boot, I think is astronomically bad for his game and puts him in a spot where he's supposed to be the next boot. He is literally out the door had Do or Die not existed, where again, the fact that Do or Die even existed ends up saving him in the game, as that ends up giving him immunity at the final 7 that he shouldn't have had. And then beyond that is again on the bottom at the final 6, thinks he's even going home and even burns his relationship with Erica even more in a spot where again she's the only reason why he's staying during that round. And then also at final 5 he's kept around just because there's a bigger threat in Ricard, only to then still be the person that would have naturally been voted out at the final 4 had there been a vote there, and even then again barely wins the fire making challenge against Heather, only to still get to the end with pretty much no win equity, where I don't think he can win the game at the end. Where while he can get votes, I don't think there's ever a situation where he gets the majority, even in a Heather, Sean, Xander final 3. I think it's more so between Heather and Xander at that point, with him probably only getting like Danny and Nasir's vote. And to be fair, in that position, like Liana probably is like at least a swing to potentially cause a tie, but again, it's still a spot where it's very rocky. I think Deshawn's game from final 8 on is pretty bad, like probably one of the worst end game stretches for any of the runner-ups we've ever had. And again, that's what makes him tough to rank, because I do think his game before that is pretty strong, and he is in a dominant position. He does have a lot of agency. Again, had Luvu ever went to tribal, again, he would have been in the power position there. Again, he was set up to take out Sydney from the game, taking out a number for his number 1 ally in Danny, and bring Danny in while also having connections to Heather and Erica. He also, again, at the merge, is able to be part of this big alliance that comes together and has a lot of sway at those early votes. Though again, I think it is really that final 8 on stretch that is astronomically bad for his game, to where again, that has really tanked his position on this list for me, putting him here at number 69. And now number 68, we're moving on to a player that initially had much higher on my list, but when thinking about it a bit more, I do feel like she feels more in line to likes of Deshawn. If not, I feel like Deshawn probably has higher highs, but this person probably has not as low lows, and that player is Heidi from Survivor 44. And again, Heidi's this person that also has a very rocky end game. Again, she kind of loses all of her allies, kind of just dangling in the game. Again, had there been just a natural final 4 vote, she probably goes home. She doesn't have immunity, and it's kind of just enabling the peak of 3s throughout a lot of the end game stretch. I think her end game, again, similarly rocky to Deshawn, mind you, not being benefited by twists, which is what puts her a bit higher here. But again, her early game is better. Now, I would not even say her early game's particularly great, though again, she is like a central figure within her original tribe. Or even there, I don't feel like she really has much agency there. She's more so just doing what Danny wants to do and saving Josh at the first vote there. Despite Heidi having a better relationship with Claire, she then also makes some questionable decisions early on in the merge. Again, letting go of Matt seemed to be largely misguided, especially in a spot where she could have made this like potentially big move and causing one of the Ratus to take out one of their own. Or again, she even like flips on Danny at a spot where no one else was flipping on Danny, and again, that's also egregiously bad. But and like Heidi's just a player that I don't think ever really has true agency in the game, yet was able to navigate through the game mostly smoothly until, again, the Final Four, where she definitely needed some sort of immunity during that round. But it's still a spot where, again, like, her game is one where she's kind of just coasting through the game, but in a spot where she's not even necessarily safe and not even necessarily being taken towards the end of the game. But really, like, no one towards the end game stretch really wanted her at the end, despite the fact that she's not even that big of a jury threat, to where, again, I think Heidi's game is kind of lackluster to me. She's here number 68. Now, number 67, and here we're moving on to a player that came very close to winning the game, and that's pretty much all the credit I can really give her. As outside of that, I don't feel like her game's particularly strong. We do have Susie Smith from Survivor Gabon, and again, Susie's this player that, again, was largely just kind of there for a lot of the game, where, I mean, again, she was safe for a decent chunk of the game. Again, there's not many scenarios where she was going home before the very, very end, but she also doesn't really do much actively in the game, to where, again, it feels like she's just kind of going along with whatever the bigger group wants. And while, again, there are spots where she's like more of a swing vote, particularly like the Marcus vote off, I don't know how much real like agency to really attribute to her game. But again, I think on paper, Susie is a player that, again, should potentially be higher on this list. I think there are many aspects of her game that are not that dissimilar from people that will be like 10-ish spots higher than her. And something that's even a pro against those people is the fact that she has votes at the end. Again, she gets 3 jury votes. Again, 1 vote away from a win. If she had made a better pitch to Randy in particular, she probably does go on to win the game. And that's something to note here. Again, the fact that she is pretty close to winning the game. Now, again, I think when we're looking at like other jury scenarios, can she realistically win? Again, I think maybe against like Crystal, there's a winning scenario there. But again, that wasn't particularly close to happening. But again, it's a spot where I do think Susie's game is fine enough until like the final 5. But then the final 4 round is so atrocious in the fact that, like, why is she in a spot where she needs to win immunity at final 4? When, again, the likes of Bob and Maddie are very clearly bigger jury threats. And obviously, again, the answer is Sugar, and Sugar just having a kind of insane way of playing that game. But also, like, even Maddie shouldn't really be incentivized to go through that. Again, he should very much be wanting Bob out. And again, to be fair, I think he probably beats Bob anyway, despite he has like such a close relationship with Susie. And Susie's also, again, not nearly as big of a jury threat as Bob is, who has like 3 locked in jury votes at the end. Where, again, the fact that like Susie's in this final 4 spot, in a spot where, again, she needs to win immunity, is pretty atrocious for me. So, well, again, there are going to be people much higher on this list that definitely needed like a certain immunity win along the way. But again, I think it's more so the context of the fact that she needed this immunity win that makes it even more egregious to me. Especially when, again, when looking throughout the rest of the game, there's not really much agency from her. For a while, again, she almost wins the game. Again, she is very close to beating Bob. The path there, again, is a pretty rocky one, despite the fact that it really shouldn't be. So yeah, I do find Susie's game pretty lackluster. She's here at number 67, not number 66. And I think these next 2 runners up are pretty similar, and this will end this bottom tier of the list of, again, these players that were just kind of out of the loop for a lot of the game, on the outs for a lot of the game, and had a lot of like luck-based circumstances get them towards the end of the game. Though I think these next 2 that we'll be talking about are people that are like in a little bit of this like kind of transitionary position. The fact that they are people that, again, had decent positioning at points, had some agency at points, but were also just completely out of the loop for like 2/3 of the game, all while also having very little win equity, makes them tough to put them higher. But we're going to be starting that off with Matthew von Ertfeldte from Survivor the Amazon. And Matthew's a player that I do think as the game went along, he did pick up the game a bit more. Again, from the final 7 on, he's really in this central position in the game, and a lot of what happens in the end game really comes down to what Matthew decides. Mind you, again, there's some argument that that's because he's a GOAT in the game and people recognize that, but still, it's still a position where he does have agency in those back portions of the season. The problem is that his first 2/3 of the game are pretty bad. Again, it's a position where he's on the bottom of the men's tribe, on the outside to Ryan Aiken boot. He doesn't want Dan to go when Dan does go, and proceeds to be the next boot if they ever go to tribal again. Even at the swap, he's in a position where he is the secondary target. He is someone that is considered to go home over Shauna, and even once Shauna does go home, he is also the next to go in that position. And once we get to the merge, he's once again just kind of on the bottom. And is set up to be voted out the final 7 until Rob flips the vote to save him. But from that point on, again, he's essentially the second command to Rob. Again, he is working alongside Rob, while we obviously give a lot more of the credit to what goes on there to Rob. Again, Matthew is there when, again, the Christie blindside happens, and Matthew then goes off on his own and makes a final 2 deal with Jenna, and actually is pretty well positioned at the final 4, where literally everyone left in the game is going to take him to the end. I think that is pretty impressive. The problem is, again, there's no win equity there. I don't think he can win the game. Maybe against Butch, maybe there's a sliver of a chance, but I don't really think a winning trajectory is really there for him. I don't think he beats really anybody else in the end game. And even again, in the position where maybe he beats Butch, he votes out Butch as well. To where, again, Matthew's game is just one where, again, yeah, he did have a decent end game, but really the rest of his game is just very bad. Though was never in a position where he directly needed immunity. So because that is here, number 66. Now number 65, a player that similar thing, but more of the agency was early on in the game. But also, again, no real inequity, and that person is Romeo from Survivor 42. And again, Romeo's this player that I did debate putting him higher simply because, again, he was in a decent position on his original starting tribe. And again, he was seemingly kind of in the middle there, again, working alongside Drea. And again, they had Roxroy on their side, kind of. And again, he had this relationship with Tori, where it felt like Romeo was, again, in a decent enough position early on. But I think a major issue here is the fact that I think Romeo loses that control at the merge, where, again, in a spot where this new super majority forms, he's somehow not involved in that despite having a close relationship with Drea, and proceeds to just be on the bottom for the rest of the post-merge phase. And again, just isn't really looped into a lot of what's going on there. Again, even in the spot where Hai goes home, a spot where, again, he did not have a good relationship with Hai, he's not even told about Hai going home. He's literally the only person to not know Hai is going home. So again, the back portion of his game is one where, again, he really just does not know what's really going on for the majority of it. And even when he does at the tail end, again, Marianne is someone that gets a lot more credit for taking out Omer. And even at Final 5, he's considering keeping Lindsay around, which is really dumb as well. Well, also, again, having no win equity, I don't think there is a Final 3 situation that he can win, especially by the time of the end game. I think it would have been very difficult to find one. But again, I think it's a spot where Romeo's in-game stretch is pretty bad. Even when looking at the points where his game was good early on in the game, he's not even necessarily getting his way there. Again, he wants Zach to stay, has a close relationship with Zach. Yet, again, Zach ends up going home despite his wishes there. Even when Swathi goes home, I would not even say this Swathi going home is necessarily the best move for him at that point, considering Swathi seemed to be someone that was willing to work with him. I don't even think Romeo's game, when it was better, was even that great anyway. So again, I think at the end of the day, Romeo's game is still largely lackluster for me. He's our number 65. Now number 64, we're starting the next sub-tier of the list of people that were just kind of straight up followers in the game and didn't really do much outside of their own groups, and people that just went along with their alliances, stuck with their alliances. And again, whether or not their alliances were actually the majority is a major thing that will end up differentiating these players. But at number 65, we're going to be starting off with a person that actually kind of goes against even that notion, with this person actually being in the majority for pretty much the entire season. Though again, there's a little bit of rockiness early on, but really the more so reason why they're this low is because the complete lack of win equity. And at number 65, we do have Philip Shepard from Survivor Redemption Island. And Philip's in this spot where, is he safe throughout a lot of the game? Yeah. Again, I don't think there's really a spot where Philip actually goes home. Now, again, there are positions where he's towards the bottom of the pecking order. Again, at the original Ometepe tribe, he is, again, towards the bottom for that first vote, but ends up voting out Francesca. Then is, again, a secondary target during the Christina vote. And really just in general, again, he is kind of on the bottom of the pecking order for a lot of the early game, but it is once we get to the merge where I do think Rob essentially at that point just fully locks into dragging Philip to the end. And through that, again, Philip ends up being in a safer position. Mind you, he's still getting votes at points from the opposition, though again, there's no way he's actually going home in that spot. But even then, towards the end game, he just has a pretty smooth ride through the game, just because, again, Rob's just kind of dragging him through the game. And again, he has no social capital through the game because he's burnt a lot of those relationships, because he's pissing off the majority of the players in the game, and then proceeds to just get to an endgame situation where he has no chance of winning. And I don't think there's any chance of winning against anybody. I can't think of a Final 3 situation where he actually wins. Really, I mean, him getting a vote from Ralph is probably the best case scenario there, where I don't even know if he necessarily even gets another jury vote along the way. So again, he annoys the majority of the opposition, gets into fights with the opposition, while also even gets in fights with people on his own side. So again, I think Philip's game is pretty bad. Again, the only real benefit to him is the fact that he had a pretty stable ride through the game, especially after those first couple rounds, but it's still a position where there's just no real win equity. Again, I put him here at number 64. Now, number 63, we're moving on to a player that also ends up getting to the end with very little win equity, but I think this is a person who does less actively wrong, but also is just simply not stably in the majority for a lot of the game, which is the reason why he's not higher on this list. We do have Troyzan from Survivor Game Changers. And again, Troyzan's game is one where, in essence, he is essentially a second in command. I think you could argue that he is the second in command to Brad Culpepper. The problem is that Brad Culpepper's not even someone that's running the game, where, again, that would not be a bad position for Troyzan if, again, Brad Culpepper was this dominant figure in the game that ran the entire season, as, again, we'll get to people in the second command tier later on of these people that, again, were these people who were, like, actively working with the people that were running the game. And, again, Troyzan is doing that with Brad Culpepper. The problem is that Brad Culpepper, in his own right, is very messily navigating through the game. So, again, with Troyzan being the second command to someone that isn't even running the game, again, that is something that definitely knocks him here. Now, again, like, to be fair to Troyzan, there's very few spots where he would have potentially gone home. I don't think there really is a spot where he's in direct danger, as, again, Brad is always there as a shield for him that would have gone home over him, but also Troyzan has less win equity than Brad. Where, again, I think it's tough to find a final three combination where Troyzan ends up winning, where, again, it's not a position where people, like, dislike Troyzan. I think most people are in the season were, again, kind of just fine with Troyzan, but I don't think anybody, like, had much respect for the game that Troyzan played. And while I think there are definitely spots where he gets votes, again, I think there's a world where, like, Sarah Lucina votes for him. Obviously, Brad would potentially vote for him from the jury, even, like, Sierra. I just don't think there's ever a world where he gets enough votes to win. And I think that is definitely a major criticism of his game, along with the fact that, again, he's just in and out of the majority. Again, he's essentially going wherever Brad is going, which is, again, also in and out of the majority. But I think that's a very bad position to be in when you're someone that, again, can't really win the game. So because, again, I do think Troyzan's game is just, again, very lackluster, where he's not necessarily being involved in what's actually going on. It has very little win equity to really show for that. So again, at the end of the day, Troyzan lands here at number 63. Now, number 62, we're moving on to a player that I think is on a similar level. Again, very similar things. Probably this person's game is a little bit more stable, but a similar concept at least. We do have Ken McNichol from Survivor Millennium Gen X. And Ken is a player that, again, also, again, is just kind of there, kind of like second command figure to David. But again, David's also someone that has, again, a bit of a spotty game. Now, not as much as Brad Culpepper, where David really is only out of this, like, good position in the game for just a couple rounds. I think really it's just like the final 10, which is, again, even their spot where it's a rock draw. So where, again, they had half the people in the game on their side. And obviously the final 9 was very rocky, though ends up flipping that to their benefit. But even then, again, like, Ken is in this spot where he is, again, there alongside David. And again, to be fair, also, again, not in a great position early on, though, again, is never targeted, where, again, he's kind of on the outs of the Gen X tribe, though, again, has at least like a few allies here and there, and is, again, never in a spot to actually get taken out. But again, it's another one of these positions where, again, he doesn't really have any win equity. I don't think there is a situation where Ken can win the game, where, again, in the situation against Adam and Hannah, he's obviously shut out. Even in the final 2 against Hannah, I think Hannah probably shuts him out. And I think it's very difficult to even think of a combination that he even gets a vote in. So for me, and that is the biggest knock against Ken here. Again, Ken's game is one that, again, is just essentially going wherever David's is, but then also has no win equity at the end. Mind you, I think there is a pro along all this, and the fact that he does vote David out, to where, again, I think he at least, like, makes this, like, active decision that is, again, beneficial for his game, increases the odds of him potentially getting votes at the end, and the fact that he takes David out. The problem is that the way he ends up doing it is in a way that Adam gets more of the credit for getting David out, even though Adam had very little to do with Ken's decision making and getting David out, to where obviously there's a massive, like, perception issue there. But again, it's still a position where, again, Ken's game is very comparable to Troyzan's. I think the benefits here are, again, I think he makes this move to cut out his biggest threat in the game at the final 4, and that's at least a benefit, along with the fact that I do think his game was, again, more stable throughout a lot of it, especially throughout the back portions of the season, though, to be fair, even within that, I do think there is some poor play from him. Again, the way that he handles Will during the final 9 is also pretty poor, where I would actually even say that Troyzan's a better player than Ken, but I do think Ken's trajectory through the season is a little bit more stable. He's here at number 62. Now, number 61, we're moving on to a player that I find tough to assess, in the fact that this is a person who I don't think can win the game. I think they had very low win equity at the end. I think they're probably one of the least likely winners of the season in a final situation, along with the fact that they had such a rocky path to the end game. But also, I think they're probably one of the more active players of the last few people we talked about. I do have Julie Rosenberg from Survivor Edge of Extinction. And again, Julie is this player that, again, like the last few people we talked about, I think you consider her second command. Again, second command to Ron in this position. Though, again, Ron is also somebody that doesn't really ultimately end up running the game. But again, she is in a pretty decent position throughout the early portions of the season. Again, she's in this initial majority, where, again, had Kama gone to tribal, she would have been safe for a while. She had a decent backing around her. And when we come to the merge, again, she is involved in the Joe blind side, only then be on the outside to Eric boot, but again, she's able to recover the following round. Mind you, that's also a round where she tarnishes her respect in the game, where the way she acts at that tribal is something that ends up being used to show how emotionally she's playing the game, which is obviously not great. But I do think it's a point where like her and Ron are these pretty big swing votes that are pretty integral to what is happening in the game. Again, they flip to take out Julia, they then take out David Wright. Mind you, she then proceeds to be on the outside to Kelly Wentworth vote, which is pretty bad, especially considering Ron was on the end of that. But even then, again, is involved in taking out War Dog. She also again builds this relationship with Lauren that puts her in a better position in the game. Mind you, again, she then proceeds to lose Ron, and following the Ron boot, she is someone that when Devins is immune, she is again a potential target, only for obviously the votes to flip onto Aurora, though again, that's probably because people just thought she was a goat by that point. But still, I mean, really, she has a pretty clean path to the end from that point on, and she is in this like new majority with like Lauren and Gavin as again Victoria ends up going home, and they're targeting both Chris and Rick Devins, though just aren't able to get them out. But again, it's kind of just a very rocky game. It's just all over the place. I think it's one that had she had a little bit more agency, again, had she been in that like Ron position of again at least being a bit more out in front, actively making more moves, I think there would be more of an argument putting her higher despite her lack of win equity. But along the fact that she's just again in and out of the majority, and again also has very little win equity at the end in comparison to Ken and Troyzan, I do feel like Julie is a player that again played more actively than them, while also was someone that was playing a bit more optimally than them, someone that was aware of what her best endgame position was and was actively striving for that. Unlike the likes of, again, Troyzan, who is actively trying to get to the end with Brad, who he fundamentally always loses against. And it's not much of a difference here, but for me, it's enough to put her here at number 61. Now, number 60, also kind of same thing, though, like better and worse in different ways. I do have Mick Trimming from Survivor Samoa. And Mick is this player that, again, I think in ways you can compare him to the likes of Ken and Troyzan. The fact that, again, he is essentially a sidekick for Russell. Mind you, not even the main sidekick to Russell, which I think is probably the criticism there. But again, he is alongside Russell as Russell ends up, quote unquote, dominating this game. Now, again, as we'll talk about when we talk about Russell, even flawed within that. But again, Mick is in a pretty decent position throughout the early portions of the season. Mind you, not even getting his way early on, where again, he does want Marisa to stay and is on the outside of that despite being called the leader. But still, again, he is in a decent spot early on. But from that point on, he's in a decent spot within Fofo. Mind you, again, how much of that is due to challenge strength, because again, they are constantly losing and feel like they need to help them in challenges. But still, again, Mick's never really in danger from that point on. And again, the fact that he survived so many tribals is something to definitely give him some credit for in comparison to again, the people that I'm putting him above, but also to some people we're about to be talking about. The reason that, again, he is lower than the people we're about to be talking about is, again, because he is not even really the main ally for the person that he is like following in the game. Again, where Russell, again, never really like actively wanted to go to the end with Mick. He just like ended up doing so by the end. And it's also a spot where, again, like he came into merge down in numbers. Mind you, again, obviously that's due to how challenges played out, but it's not even like even then he did that much to really get the numbers back on his side. Again, we don't really see Mick doing much like active work there to make things happen there. It really feels like other people are doing things kind of around him to get back into a good position. Even after that happens, again, we don't see really Mick doing much to really navigate through that end game stretch. And once we get to the tail end, really the main reason why he even gets to the end is once again just due to challenge strength, and not even the fact that he is winning challenges, but more so the fact that they think that he can win challenges against Brett. Or again, in the Jason boot, Mick was the initial target, yet they end up voting out Jason against Mick simply because they feel like Mick is more likely to win a challenge than Jason, even though Jason had technically won more challenges. But still, like, Mick is someone that largely gets saved in the game at that point due to his perceived challenge strength, and gets to the end and ends up losing in a shutout. Mind you, I do think Mick had winning scenarios. Again, it's not like Mick was this like massive goat on the board, where again, had there been like a final two between him and Russell, again, I think Mick is very likely to win there. Also, again, if we swap out like Natalie for Jason, he very does likely win in that spot. If you swap him out for Shambo, I think it's, again, probably closer, but again, I think he likely does win still there. But again, I think Mick is someone that, again, at least had this win equity in the game, which is definitely better than the likes of Ken and Troyzan, and better than the next couple people we'll be talking about. But I do think, again, the overall trajectory through the game is a little bit rockier than the next couple people we'll be talking about, who had more stable rides through the game, where Mick is, again, kind of on the outside points, not really doing much to get himself out of those positions, just kind of ends up being there, especially because of challenge strength, where, again, I think it's kind of just a messy game, but it's enough to be here at number 60. Number 59, we're moving on to, again, these more followers in the game still, but these that actually were in decent spots for a lot more of the game. People that were, again, in the majority for more of the game, had less positions where they were in any danger of any sort. We're still starting off with a person who still didn't have necessarily the cleanest path in the world, but still, we're moving on to Sue from Survivor 47, one of the latest runner-ups to be added to this list. And again, Sue's in this position where, again, I think she is mostly a follower. I don't think she really has much agency throughout a lot of the game. She's kind of just following along with whatever Gabe is doing and later Rachel. But again, I think her navigation through the game is a lot more stable than these last few people we talked about. Again, there's never a point where she's really in danger. There's never even really a point where people talk about taking out Sue, especially outside of those first few rounds where, again, even that was like more so based around like challenge strength and her being looked at as like a weaker member of the tribe. But again, she is someone that is instantly in a very good position with her connections to Caroline, her connections to Gabe, that puts her in the center of this core group on Tuku, while also, again, having connection with Tiana, the women coming together. And again, all that's very good from Sue's point of view. I think her game in the early portions of that season is pretty solid outside of, again, she does isolate TK and that's kind of bad. But again, still, I think her navigation through the game is pretty solid. Once we get to the merge, again, she's also, again, alongside the Tukus, who do have a decent amount of power during the early portions of the season. But we do get to the point where, again, Gabe is blindsided. She's on the outs during that. Mind you, that's the only vote that she's like truly on the outs for, where, and obviously she is on the outs during Operation Italy, but that's still a spot where she was technically in the majority. It's just obviously the minority end up outplaying them. But beyond that, again, she's able to recover, be part of this like underdog alliance while having, again, still really strong connection to Rachel and Caroline. And she's really involved in like most things that end up happening from that point on in the game. Again, outside of Operation Italy, where, again, she's involved in taking out Kyle. She was, again, looped into the Rachel vote during the final 6, and even then was actually in the know of what was ultimately going to happen in Andy going home. And again, that's actually a point where you can give her some credit in getting Andy out, and the fact that she was actually the one to supposedly lead the charge in keeping Rachel on taking out Andy, even though, again, at the end of the day, it was more so an emotional move for Sue and that she just wanted to get revenge for Caroline, but it's still a move that, again, she does actively do there. And again, we see her being in the majority and taking out Genevieve, and again, she has a pretty smooth path to the end. The problem is, again, just lack of win equity. I don't think there's a path for Sue to win this game. I don't know what the combination is that would get her to win. I don't even know a combination that would get her many votes, and I think that's obviously a major knock here. But again, in comparison to the last few people we talked about, I think all their games are games that are a lot less stable. I think they're in and out of the majority at points. There are points where there are major targets in the game, while Sue is someone that, again, was really only outside of the majority for like one vote, that being the Gabe vote, and really outside that was never targeted throughout the entirety of the game. And again, I think there's at least some credit to be given to her for that. So because of that, for me, she's here at number 59. Now number 58. Kind of the epitome of a person who was just in the majority and never was in danger and also could never win. We do have a Natalie Tenorelli from Survivor Redemption Island, where really at the end of the day, I feel like Natalie is kind of like this baseline here of this player who doesn't really do much, is just kind of there for a lot of the game. Also has a very like clean game. Again, there's not really much to criticize in terms of her navigation through the game outside of obviously just not taking out Rob and not really having respect from the jury. But in terms of, again, how she gets through the game, again, she's in the majority the entire time. Again, she's working alongside Rob. She's in this big majority group. She has connections with, again, the likes of Ashley and Andrea, and there's never really a point where Natalie's in any true danger. But also, Natalie has very little win equity, where, again, I think the only path for her to win is in a final 2 against Philip, which, again, that wasn't happening. Mind you, I think there are positions where she could potentially get votes. Again, if she had gotten to like a final 3 of like Andrea, I think there's a shot for her to get votes there. But again, it's still not that likely. And again, it's really just a game that, again, she's just stably there in the majority, working alongside Boss Rob, but isn't really doing anything on her own. It's just kind of this there as Boss Rob really controls the tribe, taking them all the way towards the end game. And then again, she just kind of follows whatever Rob is doing and like taking out Andrea, taking out Matt earlier. She is in a little bit of danger when Grant ends up going home, though even then, I don't think there's ever a spot where Rob was going to vote her out. And again, she has this opportunity at Final 4 to make a move of her own and just simply doesn't end up doing it, which, I mean, to be fair, I don't know how beneficial it is for her game to save Ashley, but again, it could have at least been something that she did in the game that isn't just following Boss Rob. To where, again, at the end of the day, like, her game is just, again, essentially just her following whatever Rob does and getting to the end in a very clean way where, again, there's nothing to really mark her for in terms of her navigation through the game, but there's also just no win equity and there's no real agency throughout a lot of the game. So again, I still think I, again, rank her above these people that had much tougher paths to the end, as at the end of the day, again, Natalie was still able to, again, maintain these relationships in a way that got her to the end of the game, but she also had no path to a win, and that's the major reason she's here at number 58. Number 57, kind of same thing. but this person could at least win, maybe at least get for jury votes. And that person is Courtney Yates from Survivor China. And again, Courtney, obviously incredible character. Her game's not the greatest. Her game's one where, again, I think she's essentially the same thing. Kind of just following alongside Todd and Amanda, just kind of ending up at the end because she has a good connection to them. Which, again, credit to her for building these connections with Todd and Amanda. Also, credit to her in the sense that she is in the majority for the entire game. There's never really a point where she's in any real danger. I don't believe she gets a vote against her the entire season, and has, again, just such a clean path at the end, very similar to Natalie Tenorelli. Now, unlike Natalie Tenorelli, there are points where she doesn't get her way. She doesn't want John Robert out of the game at points before he ends up going. It doesn't really get her way there. She doesn't want to take out Frosty when Frosty goes. And again, I think that's a criticism, but it's also, again, kind of a spot where it at least shows that she had more gumption in the game than someone like Natalie, who never really had much of a mind of her own. And really, at the end of the day, it's just kind of a wash, to where I think really the main thing here, again, in comparison to Natalie Tenorelli, that really ends up being a benefit for Courtney is the fact that, again, she definitely gets votes, as we see in the real life scenario. Again, she gets 2 votes there. I think in other situations, she could theoretically get more, with her, again, being very effective at selling her game. And again, I think Courtney's game is, again, one that is, again, still pretty lacking. It's the one where, again, she is kind of there. I don't think she's really driving the strategy of the game at any real point. I don't think she's even necessarily building strong connections in the game outside of her core group. But again, the fact that she has a pretty clean path to the end of the game, and again, at least gets a decent chunk of votes, I think makes her, again, better than Natalie Tenorelli, and that's why she's here at number 57. Now, number 56, moving on to another player that had a lot of potential to get votes, again, almost theoretically wins the game, was 1 vote away, yet I feel like their game surrounding that is not great, despite the fact that they're a majority the entire time, and that player is Clay Jordan from Survivor Thailand. And Clay's this player that, when looking at his game, it is one where he largely does follow Brian Heidik, and I feel like there are very few positions where Clay really exerts whatever he wants to do in the game. I feel like he's just kind of following along with whatever the majority is doing, to where, again, I did have this debate for me on, is he a second command to Brian, or is he just a follower of Brian? I decided to lean on follower just because, again, I can't think of a single point where Clay actually goes out of his way to get his way. Now, beyond that, I feel like Clay is also a player that has some really bad jury management at points with certain jury members. Again, I don't think he has much respect from his own fellow Chuigan members. He also, again, treats Jake pretty terribly, but he also does have pretty good jury management with other members of the tribe. Mind you, again, there might be some other reasons for that, but again, he did build a really good bond with Aaron and Penny, to where, again, they were very pro him on the jury over Brian in particular. And I think Clay is someone that definitely has those strong suits. So again, he had those 3 jury votes locked in against Brian, and to be fair, Brian, under that particular situation, also had 4 locked against him. But again, the fact that Brian Heidik, again, one of the most dominant players in the history of the show, ends up almost losing to Clay in a 4-3 vote is something that, again, I'll at least give a little bit of credit to Clay, especially because, again, I think he does some good work to get those jury votes, particularly Aaron and Penny's. And that's something I will give him credit for. But again, I feel like in terms of his navigation through the game, there's just very little agency in how he does so, where, again, I just really can't even think of a single point where he's getting his way in a spot where other people didn't want to go that way, and he actually had influence in the way that vote was going, where there's more so just these situations where he takes advantage of positions where things aren't necessarily going his way, where, again, when Penny goes home, I think he does very good work in managing her jury vote during that. But at the end of the day, I don't feel like there's that much actual agency in how Clay navigates through the game, and because that, for me, is here number 56. Number 55, and now we're moving on to a player that I did very much debate where this person should be. I do think this is a player that a lot of people find this person synonymous with being this massive GOAT in the game, when the reality is that's not really the case. Though, I do think this is a person who kind of just takes their foot off the pedal towards the back portion of the game, despite having a active very beginning of the game. But again, still enough to still fall into this follower tier for me, and that person is Will Sims from Survivor Worlds Apart. And again, Will is someone that gets constantly trashed on, and again, understandable for sure. But the reality is, Will could have potentially won this season. I mean, again, despite the fact that Will gets only 1 jury vote in the real life situation, again, he came into Final Tribal actually having 3, and would have likely had 3 in a lot of scenarios, where, again, he is someone that always gets Rodney's vote pretty much no matter what. I feel like he also, again, had Dan Foley's vote and Tyler's vote coming into that Final Tribal until Mike was able to convince them out of it, to where the fact that Will Sims, who is someone that, again, is one of the biggest coasters in Survivor history, especially in the back portion of the season, goes on to have potentially 3 jury votes against Mike Holloway, who has one of the biggest underdog stories in the history of the show. Again, I think that is something to note here. Beyond that, also, he actually does have a move on his resume, very early on. I think he, again, at least does have this agency that he's able to display through him voting out Vince at that first tribal. Now, mind you, I don't think it was a good move. I think that was bad for his game in the sense that Vince was someone that actually did want to work with him. Him also taking out Vince essentially put him on the bottom moving forward, where, again, once Nina ends up going, he's someone that would have gone home if they went to another tribal, in a position where he could have been towards the top of the pecking order instead. But still, I do feel like Will is someone that, again, at least exerted agency at a point in the game. Mind you, again, it doesn't last, where beyond that, I don't think he really does much outside just flipping on the no-callers at the merge, and a lot of that being due to, again, pregame, where supposedly, like, him, Rodney, Carolyn, and Kelly were, like, kind of chummy pregame, where they always knew they were going to work with each other when they came into the merge. And, again, Will is in that spot where he just, again, ends up becoming a follower of Rodney. I don't think he really does much, like, on his own from that point on. He's really just kind of there for really the rest of the game. Again, it becomes a bit tougher to dissect his game, because I do think if he at least maintained some agency through the back portion of the season, I would have probably ranked him higher. Considering, again, I do think the first half of his season is not that bad. I mean, again, it is in terms of what he was trying to do, but at least he was able to do something. But again, at the end of the day, I do feel like it's tough to really assess him too highly. But again, he is still a player that, again, has a move on his resume, along with the fact that he also had some jury votes. So again, at the end of the day, for me, he lands here number 55. Now, number 54, we end up getting to the top of this sub tier, this being a player that I also feel like was like largely dragged through the game, didn't really do that much actively on their own, though also could have potentially won the game, and in a way you can argue like kind of got screwed-ish out of that win. And that person is Cassandra from Survivor Fiji. And again, Cassandra's a player that I don't think was a very active player. I mean, from the very beginning, we see her being on the bottom of the original Moto tribe, where again, it was really between her and Liliana for that first vote. And beyond that, again, she kind of was like on the bottom alongside Dreams for a lot of that. Also, it's very weird in the sense that obviously against Survivor Fiji is this season that starts off with every player together, and there were these like initial connections that were formed there, and she ends up being swapped into a position where she's essentially with all those connections. And again, that ends up very much benefiting her there, with her being relatively safe after a swap. And really from that point on, again, she's kind of there for the ride. I mean, she's in a decent position, though we don't really see her doing much actively, though does have a very strong connection to Dream, and is also part of the like All Black Alliance with her and Earl and Dreams, while also again having connections to Yao Man. Again, they end up essentially running the game from that point on, though again, I do question just how much Cassandra necessarily had much to do with that. Though I will say something to give her credit for is the fact that, again, her and Dreams do flip against Yao Man at the final 6, and again, make a move against Earl's best interest, and again, something that Earl's not looped in, which again, I'll at least give her credit for that. At least attempting to make a move there, even though again ends up falling through because of Yao Man's idol. But again, still ends up getting into the final 3 that she wanted, which again, at this point, they had not known about how the game can end at the final 3, as again, they hadn't seen Cook Island's finish at this point, to where, again, I think that is something that you could argue screws Cassandra over. The fact that, again, if she was under the assumption of a final 2, and if she does get to the final 2 against Dreams, she does win. I do think she handily beats Dreams in the final 2, and through that, again, you can say she was screwed by the final 3 here. The problem for me personally is that I don't really even know what Cassandra is necessarily going to do, as again, while we do see her have a very close relationship with Dreams, it did seem like she was willing to vote him out at final 4 had he not given up his necklace. So I think that makes like Cassandra's endgame stretch like a little bit rockier to me, even though again, I think theoretically you can argue the fact that she was screwed over and that she should be higher on this list because of that. Especially as again, she is like in the majority for really the back portions of the season, but I think even within that though, I think it's still a spot where like I struggle to see how many people she can necessarily beat outside of Dreams, where again, I know Boo is someone that, again, questionable respects. I think Boo probably still beats her, though. But again, a little bit up in the air. Even, like, again, Stacy, I think Stacy gets some votes. And again, I think it's kind of close there. So again, her game's just very tough to gauge. So I don't really see much that, like, Cassandra's doing on her own. I also think she was, like, on the bottom early on in the game. And, like, she's someone that, again, has very rocky jury prospects. But she's also someone that, again, theoretically should have won the game had there been a final 2. So again, I think there's things that are up in the air here for sure. But for me, I still end up landing here number 54. Now number 53, and now we're moving on to the next sub-tier of the list. This sub-tier being the Power Goats, these players who I don't think had much win equity in the game. Mind you, again, there's some extenuating circumstances in that, but again, a lot of these people did not really have much respect from the jury, and at times benefited from not having much respect from the jury and were able to have a lot of control in the game because of the fact that they had no respect in the jury. But we're still able to control portions of the game, and we're still, again, these kingmakers in the game. While, again, the moves that you are making are not necessarily benefiting yourself in the game, the fact that you're at least making moves, the fact that you're actually impacting the game is better than, again, some of these followers that don't really do much in the game, even though some of those people probably had more potential to win jury votes. And I want to specify the Power Goats here that a lot of these people are people who had simply influenced influence in the back portion of the game, where, again, there are other people that are much higher on this list that, again, have these similar traits. These people who weren't targeted towards the end game stretch and had a lot of influence because, again, people thought they could beat them. However, again, those people had a lot more influence throughout the entirety of the game. These are people who had, again, kind of spotty influence throughout the game, again, where they were kind of just in and out with the majority at points, but ultimately were in positions that had them potentially deciding who the winner is. And after the 3, we're starting off with a player that I think I had a higher opinion of this person's game when this season concluded, though as time goes on, I do feel like they end up being somebody that, again, I don't think can win the game. I don't think there are really any jury situations where they get the majority of the votes, where he's also someone that just enables the majority to go on to be in a better position to win the game, and that person is Dean from Survivor IOI. And again, Dean's this player that, again, I think he 100% is this power goat in the game. He's someone that, again, cannot win the game, but again, is being an added number to Tommy's side of things, where, again, he is pretty loyal to Tommy. I don't think he ever would have taken Tommy out of the game, and Tommy's someone that always beats him in the game. Again, we even get the point where, again, Tommy is potentially being targeted by the opposition. He ends up ratting out the opposition and ends up ruining those plans, where, again, I think he kind of like perfectly fits into the role of a power goat in that sense, though, that being said, I don't think Dean is like an entirely bad player. Again, I think when like looking at how his game played out, I think there definitely are some strong qualities to his game, but I just think in terms of how he navigates through the game, it's in a non-winning position. It's in a position where he's having influence, but influence that makes it even harder for him to go on to win the game. Now, beyond that, another thing that does knock him a bit from this list here is also the fact that he did need to get saved by an idol. Mind you, he gets saved, yes, due to his relationship with Kelly Kim. Though also they had like a connection from before the show, and even then, Kelly Kim only uses the idol on him because the idol expires in that round. Okay, I think there's some wonkiness there, where again, if that is not the case, Dean does go home during that penultimate tribal before the merge. Where again, that's something that does knock him a bit here, especially within this sub tier, where again, amongst the other power goats in the game, none of the other ones needed to be saved by an idol from another player that he did not know existed until the last second. Where again, I think that is something that I am going to knock against Dean a bit to knock him down to the bottom of the sub tier here at number 53. Now 52, we're moving on to a player that I do like kind of qualm with the definition of like her being a power goat, just because I don't feel like there's as much influence that she necessarily had in the end game portions, but I do feel like she had a lot more influence in the early game, while also, again, being in a potential power goat position, just never really being able to do anything with that. But that person is Angelina from Survivor David vs. Goliath. And again, Angelina is this player that, again, was on the top of her tribe at the very beginning, and we see her being in this big majority alliance, had good relations with, again, likes of John, Natalia, Kara Kay, and again, it seemed like she was in a very solid position through that first tribal in the Goliath tribe. Then she gets swapped into a fortunate position, and while, again, there was some debate over should we take out Angelina, I don't think it would have ever really gone anywhere. And again, she comes to the merge back with her Goliaths, but then plays a bit sloppily. Again, her handling of the Elizabeth situation is pretty bad. Her then being essentially a backup target because that for really the next few rounds, someone that is kind of expendable in the game, is also pretty bad. And someone that, again, her own Goliaths end up turning on her during the Dan Rengering vote. We're willing to take her out there. But so yeah, I think that stretch of her game is pretty bad. And she ends up flipping the side with David following that, only for Christian and Gabby to flip also, where she gets blindsided when Carl goes home, which is also pretty egregious. But I do think her game from the final 8 on is better. Where at that point, I think she is in this more like power goat position. This person who people stop targeting, people don't really want out, as again, I don't think many people thought that she could actually genuinely win the game. And through that had, again, a minor influence in how things were playing out. Again, she was one of the votes to take out Gabby. She had this alliance with Nick and Mike White that ended up dominating the endgame stretch. And again, had Nick not won immunity, she would have been a major reason why Nick got to the end. Mind you, again, that's obviously bad for her game, as I do think she has a better chance against other people. But realistically, I don't think she wins in any final 3 situation towards the end game stretch. Again, I think she obviously loses to Nick, she loses to Mike. I think she maybe has a chance in a final 2 against Kara Kay, but again, even that's not even like 100% there. But again, I do think she is struggling to win a jury vote towards the end portion of the game, but again, she is still a very active player. Now again, I don't think she has as much direct influence in the back portion of the season as what some of the other power goats that we'll be talking about have, but I do feel like her early game is probably better than some of these players, with her being, again, kind of at the top of the Goliath pecking order, which for me, again, is enough to put her here at number 52. Now, number 51, we're moving on to another player that, again, were very spotty in the game, in and out of the majority at points. Definitely one of the bigger mover and shakers of the game, but also a person who I just think cannot win the game. I don't think there's even a final 2 situation where this person can win the game. But that person is Dreams from Survivor Fiji. And again, Dreams is a player I used to assess a little bit higher than this, so I did knock him down a bit. Where, again, Dreams is a player that, again, simply I don't think can win the game. I don't think there's really anybody that he can potentially win against. Well, also, his influence in the game is very spotty. Again, like early on in the game, he is on the bottom of his original tribe. While he isn't necessarily going to be taken out because of, again, physical strength, he is somebody that, again, is not in any power position early on. He then gets swapped, and once he swaps, he gets added to the Four Horsemen, and he ends up having, again, a semblance of agency throughout that portion of the game. Though it is really when we get to the merge, I think his game comes alive, but also in a spot where it kind of dooms him in the game. Again, him flipping against the Four Horsemen is something that I don't even think is necessarily beneficial for his game, where instead it just puts him on this path to go to the end of Earl, who he easily loses against, and to be fair, again, he loses against everybody, but yeah, again, burns the respect of the Horsemen, and to be fair, again, like how much did he already burn that respect beforehand, but still, I think just as a whole, the flip on the Four Horsemen is something that I do question for sure, where I do think it definitely burns him respect from the jury, and even in that plan, he's not even looped into the actual final plan. Again, he's tricked into thinking it's still Mookie that's getting voted out, because they simply did not trust him enough. But beyond that, again, he does have a cleaner path for the next few rounds. Again, he is in the majority. He does flip against Yao-Man in a spot where, again, I thought that was a decent move had they been able to execute on it. However, I think a big issue here is, again, the fact that he was planning going to the end of Earl, to where he was just going to lose in a landslide against Earl. It would be better here if Dreams is at least trying to get to a better Final 3 situation. Again, I don't think he wins anyway, but again, at least if he tried to go to the end against somebody, so someone that he would have had a more of a chance in, again, the likes of a Stacy, the likes of a Boo, I think his game would be a little bit more respectable. Also, the fact that he was potentially going to get voted out if he did not give up that necklace. Again, for a power goat in the game to actually be in danger during that penultimate round is pretty bad too. Again, there's no reason he should be in danger in that spot, especially when like someone like Earl is on the board, where, and I think that's also a major criticism here as well. But again, in comparison to the likes of Angelina, the likes of Dean, I do feel like Dreams did have more agency throughout the back portion of the game. Again, especially him leading the charge against Yao-Man, I think is something that I would definitely give him a lot of credit for. And again, also his ability to flip on the Horsemen, though, again, that doesn't end up gaining him that much. But still, I do think he is, again, a much more active player throughout the majority of the season than the last two people we talked about, even though, again, he was still in a position where he's essentially just enabling Earl to his win. And at the end of the day, I do put him here at number 51. Now, number 50, we're moving on to a player that I did find a little bit tough to assess, because I do think this player is someone that probably plays a better game than people give him credit for, but they still were also in this like power goat position for the majority of it, and that person is Ben from Survivor 46. And again, I think there are benefits to Ben's game. The fact that I do think towards the back portion of the game, he is, again, this major decision maker. I think he is this person that has a decent chunk of influence in deciding how the game plays out, and through that, again, he ends up going to the end with his friends. The problem is that, again, one, I don't think he can win the game. I think he very much struggles in most jury situations. I mean, maybe there's a chance against like Liz and maybe like Venus that Ben could potentially pull out the win, but it's still a struggle to even get there. And though, again, he's also one of the main proponents for getting Venus out over Kenzie, even though he ends up voting the opposite. But either way, I do think Ben is this person who plays a pretty emotional game towards the back portion of the season. But I do think Ben is someone that is still a pretty competent player. Again, the fact that he has such strong social bonds, particularly with Charlie, to where Charlie ends up siding with him over Jem and ends up getting Maria to do so as well, despite the fact that Maria didn't like him, I think is something that I would give him some credit for. And while he's, again, on the outs for first few merge votes, by time of the Tevin blindside, from that point on, he's in the majority that entire time. The problem is, again, I don't think he's really making decisions that end up benefiting his game. He is in a position where, again, I don't think the jury has much respect for him, and in that spot, he's essentially just trying to get to the end with Charlie and Kenzie, which is also, again, opposed to his actual end goal of trying to give Charlie the win, as, again, if he was trying to give Charlie the win, he would have picked better opponents for him. But still, it's like, Ben is a player that, again, I think was pretty stably in the majority for really a lot of the back portion of the season. Really, the only points where he's on the outs of what's going on are those first couple merge votes. And really, again, I do think he has a lot of influence in how the game plays out. It's just a factor of, again, he can't win the game, and the game wasn't really playing for his best interest. So at the end of the day, for me, I do land him here at number 50. At number 49, and now we're moving on to, again, kind of the more definitive power goat in my mind. Again, this is kind of like one of the first people that come to my mind, of this person who essentially decided how the game was going to play out, but had very little win equity in their own right. And that person is Monica Culpepper from Survivor Blood versus Water. And again, Monica's this person who, again, was pretty stably in the majority of the entire season. Now, again, where she was in the pecking order definitely shifted across time, but she is someone that, again, was in the majority of the entire season. had a lot of influence in giving Tyson the win, where again, she ends up being in this swing position quite a bit towards the end game stretch and ends up siding with Tyson every single time to give Tyson that win. And again, I will give Monica a little bit of grace here, especially in comparison to Ben, and the fact that I think Monica very much struggles to win the game in most situations. I don't think there were really anybody in the end game stretch that she would have beaten in a final three anyway, to where I think it makes her overall like decision making on giving Tyson the win like less egregious to me. Well, also I feel like her navigation through the game, and again, in comparison to Ben, is again a lot more stable. Again, she is in the majority the entire time. She is part of the initial majority on Galang Tribe. She then at the swap is once again in the majority, mind you, again lower in the pecking order, but still again is safe when working alongside the likes of Tina and Katie. She then gets to the merge where again she ends up flipping on Aris, but ends up finding her true alliance at that point with the likes of Tyson and Jervis, and they end up essentially just running the show from that point on. To where again, I do think Monica's game is again pretty stable. The problem is again lack of win equity and the fact that I don't think there's many people that she can beat at the end, along the fact that she doesn't really have like major influence of what exactly is happening until like the end portions of the season, where again, while she is in the majority for the first like 2/3 of the season, she also is again just kind of there as things are happening, where like we have other people being the decision makers in those spots, where again Monica doesn't really become this big decision maker until again that final few rounds of the game where she has that opportunity to flip on Tyson, just never does. So again, I don't think she has enough like consistent influence in the game to be higher on the list, but she is here at number 49. Number 48, maybe a controversial opinion, even though it's not like I think this person's that good, but a person that again I think had a lot of influence in the game, is just misguided influence, and that person is Michael Skupin from Survivor Philippines. And again, Skupin's a player that can't win the game. I don't think there's a single situation where people respect him enough to let him win the game. Mind you, there are some minor pros in comparison to Monica Culpepper, where I do think they're in similar positions. Again, they're both in the majority pretty much the entire season. Mind you, Skupin was actually probably more out of the majority at points. That wasn't really tested, where we do see on his original tribe that by the end of the pre-merge phase, again, he was someone that was definitely on the bottom of Tandang alongside RC. Though even then at the merge, ends up flipping against RC instantly, ends up having this really strong connection with Lisa, and actually ends up being involved in every single vote in the post-merge phase, which I think is something to definitely give him credit for. The only person to actually do that, to where again, he's involved in take out Jeff Kent, he then flips and takes out Artis, and then proceeds to just be in this power goat position from that point forward. He is essentially the decision maker on who goes on to win the game, mind you, from a misguided standpoint, where again, I think that is something to at least give Monica a little bit more credit for, is the fact that again, at least she was pretty self-aware of her game, where again, Skupin wasn't. Skupin thought he was dominating the game, thought he was headed for an overly impressive win by the end, in a spot where instead no one respected him and no one was ever going to give him enough votes to win. Now, something I will give him credit for, especially over Monica, where Monica again at best gets that one vote from Vetus. I don't think anyone else was really wanting to vote for Monica. Skupin actually would have had more votes given different jury situations, where again, had we had and like Abby, Lisa, Skupin final three, which would have been his best case scenario that again he doesn't strive for, he would have had 3 jury votes in that spot. Again, he would have had Carter, who we already gotten, plus also Malcolm and Denise, who have both said post show that they would have voted for Skupin. Now again, I think the remaining votes probably go to Lisa, with the remaining votes being pretty anti-Skupin, but again, the fact that he gets 3 votes in that spot is something to give him credit for, especially when again he has so much influence in the end game, where again, I think he is the main reason why we get the result we do. Again, he is the person that really fights for working with Malcolm and Denise throughout the endgame stretch, where again, Lisa wanted to flip on Denise at the final 5. Skupin fights hard against that. And again, is it bad for his game? Yes, but it still shows he has influence in the game, that he is deciding how the game ends up playing out there. So again, I do think he has a lot of influence in the game. I do think he also, again, had some jury votes by the end, but again, he still had no real win equity in terms of, again, I don't think there's ever a spot where he gets enough votes to win. And I think he is, again, one of the more definitive power goats in the game, and that's why he's here at number 48. Now number 47, and now we're moving on to a strange portion of this list where this is kind of a grouping of people that are kind of in between tiers here, where again, we have the power goat tier there, while also the following tier, which is, it's more so these players that had influence in the game and could have potentially won, but were just so in and out of the majority constantly. That's tough to put them much higher on the list. And again, these are people that are kind of in between the two tiers. I feel like they kind of fit into both categories. They definitely have aspects of their games that were them enabling the people that went on to win the game, while they also have aspects of them having more agency in their own right. And we're going to be starting that grouping off at number 47 with a player that I've definitely gone down on over time. I feel like the more and more I think about this person's game, the lower I get on it. I actually did very much debate even putting them lower on this list, more in the followers category. I did still decide to put them in this grouping, specifically because I do think they were still a very active player in the game, despite the fact that they were very ineffective in the game. But I do think they were playing for their best interest, which is something that you can't really say for the last few people we've talked about. That person is Cassidy from Survivor 43. And again, Cassidy is this person that I think people have very much overrated over time, where obviously there's a lot of people being upset over how Gabler had won, and again, through that, obviously there was a lot of Cassidy was robbed and trying to assign more agency to Cassidy's game than what she probably deserves. Where, again, in retrospect, having rewatched 43, Cassidy's game is not that good. It's really her being on the bottom for almost the entire season, having very little control over what's actually going on, and being in a spot where I don't think she can win the game. Even in a final 2, I don't think she can win the game. Unless we're going like pretty far back until like, I don't know, maybe someone like a Ryan, and even then it's like questionable. So again, I think the jury had more respect for Owen than they did for Cassidy. And again, in the final 3, she obviously only gets James's vote by the end. I just don't think the respect was there for Cassidy to go on to win the game. Now, despite that, again, she was still targeted throughout the end portions of the game and was talked about by the fellow players as a threat, even though, again, a lot of that was unfounded. And obviously, we'll get to somebody that has a similar trajectory in the game in the sense that, again, they were constantly talked about as a threat despite not being the biggest jury threat on the board. But I think the difference there is that that person actually had influence at points. Cassidy really doesn't. I mean, when looking at Cassidy's game, again, she's initially on the majority on Coco, but proceeds to be taken out of that majority by the time of the first vote, where, again, she ends up losing one of her closest allies in Lindsay right away, and then proceeds to barely squeak on by the following vote, where, again, you can credit for having the relationship with James and Carla to save her over Gio, but even then, that's not really much credit to really give her. It's really just her skating on by in the game, and then when we get to the merge, she's also not having much influence in the game, where we see her trying to keep Janine around, ends up not being able to do that. We see her barely surviving over Ryan during his boot round, where, again, that's a spot where really Gabler, Jesse, and Cody make that decision at the very last second. It's not really due to anything that she actively did. Supposedly, it was a spot where it was going to be based on who went home on the other tribe. And then from the final 8 on, again, she's in the majority for every vote, but she's not really having much agency in how those things happen. Again, it really is like Jesse and Cody that were in the middle during Noelle boo and the Sammy boo. And then at the final 6, again, she's not particularly involved in how the Cody blindside ends up going through. She's just kind of there. And then for the end game stretch, she does end up playing a little bit more actively. Again, I'll give her credit for the Carla boo. I think that's one that she did fight for. But really, again, throughout her game, there's not really much to truly give her that much credit for outside of just surviving in the game. Where I think the one like move I can assign to her is the Carla move. But really outside that, she's just going along for whatever the majority wants. And again, it's still a spot where she has no win equity. But I will say, again, I do give her credit for here in this position where she is at least going for her best case scenario. She is playing optimally in terms of how she's navigating through the game. Again, her going to a final 3 of Gabler and Owen, which was her best case scenario. The problem is that even in that best case scenario, she can't win. Where it seemed like the jury is more willing to vote for Owen than they were for her. Again, I think at the end of the day, Cassie's game is not particularly good, but again, I do think she is an active player and one that, again, at least does have a move by the very end and was, again, playing optimally. So again, for me, that's enough to put her here at number 47. And at 46, we're moving on to player that I also have a lot of ups and downs in this person's games. I actually think this person's actually probably has lower lows than Cassidy, but probably has higher highs and is more stably in a majority than Cassidy. And that person is Xander from Survivor 41. And again, Xander's a player that I actually feel like my opinion on Xander's game has gone up a little bit over time. I think I was very low on Xander the last time I did my global runner-up ranking. I think where I stand now is, again, I think his end game is actually pretty decent, except for the fact that he takes Erica to the final 3. I think that's pretty bad. But again, outside of that, I think his end game stretch is actually pretty competent. I think how he plays from the merge on is, again, decent enough. I think it's in line with the people that we're going to be talking about moving forward. Again, I think it would be something that puts him in line with the people that we're going to be talking about in the upcoming tier. Again, these people that had influence at portions of the game. And again, I do think Xander's endgame stretch is, again, pretty solid. Now, again, obviously you have the knowledge of power play, which I don't know how much credit to really give him for that. But again, you do have him building really strong relationships with the likes of Erica and Heather that wanted to take him to the end. You didn't have him building a relationship with Ricard, to where Ricard was fully loyal to him. And again, obviously there was this talk about how Xander can't win, and that's why people were dragging him through the game. Again, that's why, again, like Danny himself specifically says that in his exit press. That's why Xander's never targeted. But still, spot where, again, Xander's actually able to cultivate an alliance around him through that back portion of the season, and is actually like pretty lock safe within that. Again, having connections to both sides of that alliance with Ricard and with Erica, to where, again, I think that is a pretty strong position to be in, to where, again, he's never really in danger throughout that end portion of the season. And I'll say, potentially has win equity. Now, again, he messes up in taking Erica to the end, but again, had Erica gone at Final 4, I think there's a shot Xander wins the season. Now, again, it's up in the air for sure. I think all 3 of them really get votes in that position. Again, Heather probably gets the likes of Ricard and Evie and Erica. Deshawn probably gets Nasir and Danny. I think Xander probably gets Shan's vote, along with, again, a chance at Tiffany and Liana's, where, again, he has votes. Now, again, even if all those play out, again, if there is a tie, Sean probably votes Heather over him, but still a spot where, again, like, he comes pretty close to winning in that situation, which was not that far away from that position. But again, the reason why Xander is this low on the list, because again, I think the end portion of his game is not entirely bad. The reason why he's this low is because his beginning of his game is pretty bad. Like, I think the first half of his game is pretty atrocious. Again, he's on the bottom the entire time, is the next to go had his tribe ever gone to another tribal. This is where, again, he theoretically is saved at the Voce vote just simply because he doesn't have a vote, and they think that he's easy to get out following that. And again, you could definitely say that he was disfavored by the fact that him and Voce went on the Sweat and Savvy, which made it tougher to build connections, but I don't think that really holds that much weight by the end, where, again, I think Xander's early game is very bad, but I do think his end game stretch is pretty decent, which is enough to put him here at number 46. Now number 45, and now we're moving on to a player that is probably one of the biggest examples of a power GOAT in the game, even though, again, I would definitely qualm with the terminology of GOAT for this person. But and they were someone that essentially led the eventual winners to the win. They are the major reason why they win. But I think her game outside that is also pretty decent until she ends up essentially laying down her sword for them. But again, at number 45, I do have Laurel from Survivor Ghost Island, where, again, I think Laurel's game is probably one that's a little bit underrated in the sense that, obviously, yes, she does actively go to the end against Dom and Wendell and then proceeds to lose to them. And again, I think she had like an overall like jury mindset that was a bit flawed in the fact that she was thinking that Dom and Wendell would maybe split votes where she could pick up some of the Malolos and potentially win in a weird plurality vote. Again, it's something that never was going to happen. But I think Laurel's also in a spot where really up until the final 8, I feel like she's actually playing a pretty competent game. Again, she is someone that, despite losing most of her numbers coming into the merge, I do feel like she's able to really rebuild her game in a really strong way. Again, picking up Dom and Wendell, having a 4-person alliance with them and Dominic, having Dom and Wendell actually be loyal to her, which is pretty impressive considering the fact that, again, they were on the same starting tribe. And again, I think that is something that I would definitely give Laurel a lot of credit for. And through that, again, she had a lot of options coming into the merge phase, especially by the time we get to final 8, to where, again, I think a final 8 is probably the point where I will definitely dock her some points. I think that is the point where, again, she does essentially just hand the game to Dom and Wendell by not making a move against them in a spot where she could have. Again, that was probably one of the only points where Dom and Wendell, again, we're not going to use their advantages. We're also very vulnerable had Laurel flipped, where, again, Donathan wanted to flip. If Laurel had flipped in that position, Wendell probably does go home there. And I think that is obviously a major criticism of Laurel's game as a whole, is how much she was influenced by Wendell. The fact that, again, she was unwilling to turn against Wendell ever, and also even at the final 9, again, Wendell ends up sparking this like feud between her and Kellen by getting Kellen to vote for her. And again, I think that is something that ends up harming Laurel's game, and the fact that she ends up fully buying into that rivalry, to where, again, I think that is obviously a negative there. But I think something that is a pro for Laurel is the fact that I do think she very likely wins in a lot of other situations without Dom and Wendell there. Where, again, even at the time of the final 5, if she gets the end against Donathan and Angela, I think she wins the game. Or I think she was the most respected of them. And I think definitely had Malolos that were waiting to vote for her if Dom and Wendell were not there. The problem is, again, that she does go to the end against Dom and Wendell, who are, again, pretty much unstoppable forces at the end. In the 2 biggest jury threats on the board, to be able to, again, beat everybody at the end game. To where, again, I think that is obviously a major issue. But I think the fact that there was at least that like semblance of potential had it not been for Dom and Wendell having all these advantages is something that, again, elevates Laurel a bit here. Now, again, it's not enough to really put her like in these higher tiers of the list, as, again, at the end of the day, she is essentially still a power GOAT. She's essentially deciding who goes on to win the game over actually making like these active decisions for herself. But I do think the fact that she did at least still have this win equity, and I think was playing a very competent early game, is something that at least give her some credit for. She's here at number 45. Number 44. Now we're moving on to the official top of the Power GOAT tier, though at the end of the day, again, this tier and the next tier, again, just so intermixed that it doesn't really matter that much. But at number 44, we're going with the player that had a lot of influence early on in the game and availably had influence towards the back portion of the game, just, again, not in the way that got her to win. And that person is Sherry from Survivor Karamoan. And again, there's a lot of talk about Sherry as this person who, again, just let Cochran win and got dragged along through the game. And again, I don't think that's particularly fair, considering the fact that I think Sherry actually plays well given the circumstances around her game. Again, I think early on she's in a pretty good position on the original fans tribe, and while she's not necessarily like this big decision maker there, she is at the top of her side that, again, has like Matt and Mike in the middle of them making those decisions. But again, I still do think she had some influence there, had a group around her, and again, the likes of Julia and Laura and Shamar. Again, I'll at least give her some credit there. And again, all that crumbles when she gets swapped into a position where she's on the bottom. And again, I think that is something to definitely note. Here's the fact that, again, she's on the fans versus favorite season where the favorites just won everything and just stuck together, to where the fact that Sherry ends up surviving all that, I think, is actually impressive. Now, again, it doesn't really show much influence in the game throughout those middle portions of the season, but I do think it is pretty impressive how she's able to navigate through the game despite the fact that she should be kind of screwed. And while, again, a lot of that is also due to the fact that, again, she can't really win the game, again, there's not really much win equity there, I do feel like by the end portions of the season, we do see her having a bit more influence in the game. Again, we see her being a major pusher and trying to get Brenda out during the Brenda boot, and she ends up having this final 3 alliance with Dawn and Cochran that ends up allowing her to have a pretty easy path to the end. Now, again, obviously the major issues come from the fact that, again, she can't win, and again, she's just empowering Cochrane to allow him to win. But again, I think the fact that Sherry ends up being, again, essentially a power goat, but also had some influence early on, and was also able to do this despite the fact that all the cards are stacked against her, I think it's something to at least give her some credit for, to where, again, I think at the end of the day, she ends up being at the top of this tier here at number 44. Now, number 43, and again, this is technically the start of a new tier, even though, again, it's a little bit wonky on like the lineations between these tiers. Again, there's definitely some people that we'll talk about in this tier that are essentially power goats as well, but these are players who I think had a lot more influence in the game. People who had, again, messy games for sure, especially this first few we're going to be talking about, people that were like in and out of the majority at points, people that got saved due to somewhat fortunate circumstances, but still people that, again, had a lot of agency at a point in the game. Also, again, for these first few at least, again, definitely had winning scenarios, but again, these are people that in general, I'll just give them a bit more credit for how they navigated through the game than the people in the last tier that we talked about. And at number 43, we're going to be starting off with the most recent runners up on the board. We got Sam from Survivor 47. And again, Sam is this player that I do think kind of perfectly fits into this grouping here. Again, a player that had agency early on for sure. Again, he was in this pretty dominant position on his original tribe, him alongside Sierra, where these major swings, and he ends up doing a lot of good work and pulling in Andy, convincing Sierra to go against her own best interest and voting out one of the women. And again, I think his early game is very good. The problem is I think his game is very sloppy from that point forward. Again, I think the fact that he gets to the merge and kind of just isolates Andy and then proceeds to lose Sierra is again all pretty bad there. He then plays the game essentially from the bottom from that point on. Though, again, I think something to give Sam credit for is I do think he does some decent work while on the bottom. Again, I think when he's on the bottom, again, he ends up still going alongside the majority, is still looped into plans. He still ends up being a major force in Operation Italy, where, again, while obviously the show gives a lot more credit to Andy and Genevieve, I feel like he's someone that I would give him definitely more credit for the plan than Genevieve, in that we've learned from Exopress that was actually like his idea. And while, again, I think Andy probably had the same idea, it's still a spot where, again, it seemed like he created the idea more so over Genevieve, and I think he does some subtle good play in that to put this target on Genevieve over him. And the fact that he gives her the idol instead of using the idol himself, making it so that if the plan doesn't go through, then Genevieve is targeted over him. And beyond that, Genevieve is also just constantly looked at as a threat. And also, again, it increases the threat level of Genevieve, keeping her as a target in front of him, while also he's able to then rat her out about her fake idol to make her the target over him when she eventually does go home. So again, I think that is some pretty good play there from Sam. And again, he was also in the majority during the Andy boot round, where again, had Rachel not had an idol, he would have been in a pretty clean spot to potentially win the game. Where again, had he been able to get Genevieve out, I think he's probably the next biggest jury threat on the board. And while again, I think Andy would have had a fight there and would have argued his case, I think Sam could definitely beat the likes of Teenie and Sue, to where again, I think Sam still had winning scenarios by that end game stretch. I think another issue to call out here is the fact that by the time of the final four, I do think he gets very fortunate in the fact that, and he probably would be taken out for in most given situations had there not been fire making there. He just straight up is voted out. And in a spot where there is fire making, even there, he barely ends up winning in the fire making challenge. So where again, I think that is something to at least note here. But again, I think Sam's game is again one that has some highs. I think again his involvement in Operation Italy and the fact that he was in a good position early on, I think is really good work there. But he also has some lows. Again, the fact that he ends up isolating allies at points, the fact that he ends up losing Sierra, the fact that he ends up playing from the bottom for the majority of the game is something to note here. To where again, I think Sam's game is still pretty lacking, but it is one where again I think there are enough highs here and a lot more points where he demonstrates agency in the game to again put him above that power goat tier. So again, for me, he's here at number 43. Number 42, a game that, again, I look at like relatively similarly. Now, not exactly the same, as I think this person was able to actually exude a lot more control in the game at points, but also, again, finds himself on the bottom eventually. And that person is Brad Culpepper from Survivor Game Changers. And again, Brad is in this position where, and I think he is a pretty dominant force early on. Again, we see him really leading the charge on his original tribe, where we even like explicitly see him during the Malcolm vote. Again, whispering with JT, we see him again telling Ty to play his idol when he eventually plays it. And again, it really feels like he is the shot caller during that portion of the game. And I do think there is some very good work from Brad Culpepper early on, again, cultivating these relationships that do keep him pretty safe in the game, along with him, again, getting to the merge and becoming part of the majority once again at the merge. And again, being in the majority when Ozzy ends up going out, though I think it is from that point on where his game gets very rocky. Ozzy gets flipped on during the Debbie boot, and really from that point on, again, he's barely clinging on, and he's winning a lot of challenges. Mind you, I don't think he necessarily needed to win a lot of those challenges. I mean, as we see when Andrea ends up going home, again, he doesn't win immunity there, and again, he ends up surviving over Andrea in that spot. And by the time of the very end of the game, again, from Final 6 on, he does have an alliance around him. And Troyzan and Sarah, and mind you, Ozzy advantage get in itself is very rocky. But again, I do think Brad Culpepper, despite him going on this massive immunity run, didn't necessarily need to win a lot of those immunities, but it is still a game of him playing from the bottom, and one where even when he does gain some influence back in the game, again, by the time he does end up really building building back up his alliance with, again, Sarah and Troyzan. They end up running the end game. That's even a spot there where, again, they end up just having a 3-3 tie at Advantage Geddon and would have potentially lost out in that vote had they not had all these advantages. And even at like the final 7, that was a very wonky round as well. And I think Brad's end game stretch, again, while it's not like the worst in the world, as again, it's not like he needs these immunity wins, it is still like one where he does have these very spotty positions in the end game. And also, I think he makes the wrong call of who to take to the end, where obviously we see him make this decision to take Sarah to the end over Tai in a position where, again, I think he would have been better off taking Tai. Now, again, I don't think he's necessarily guaranteed to win in that spot, but he definitely does come closer to the win. Where, again, Brad is kind of this player that, again, has two radically different halves of his game. Again, the first half is pretty strong, him being in this dominant alliance, him having a lot of influence within that alliance, only for his back half to being one where, and while he does eventually find an alliance, he does have less influence there, and even when he does at the very end, I think he makes the wrong decision. So, again, it's a very rocky game, but I do end up landing him here at number 42. Number 41, we're moving on to a player that I have a very mixed opinion on. This is actually a player that was much higher on my previous list. Yeah, I feel like as time goes on, my opinion of this person's game goes down, and that person is Carolyn Rivera from Survivor Worlds Apart, where, again, I think most people probably assume Carolyn would be higher. I think when people look back on Carolyn, they do look at her as a pretty solid runner-up, where I know at the time there was talk about how, like, Carolyn should have won over Mike, and I think for me, Carolyn's game is one where, again, I think there are strong points. Again, Carolyn is someone that is in the majority early on. She's in a pretty strong position on the original White Collar tribe, and even when she was swapped into a somewhat unfortunate position, she's able to make the most of that and gets into the merge, where she's able to find some really solid allies in the likes of Rodney and Bill and Kelly, even though she's gone almost instantly, but again, still has Tyler on her side. And again, once Tyler gets brought into that majority alliance, again, she's in a seemingly good spot in the game. The qualm here comes to the fact that I feel like her game just kind of goes downhill from the final 7 on, where again, I think up to the final 7, I think Carolyn is playing a very strong game, one that, again, perfectly fits with the players that would be higher on the list. But I do think once we get to the final 7, her game kind of crumbles in a similar light to the likes of a Brad Culpepper or a Sam, mind you, again, a bit later on, but again, that's kind of why she's higher than them here. But she still is in a spot where, again, she does end up being a deciding vote and taking out Tyler. Again, that is her move. The problem is that it's a bad move, and it's one that causes her to be on the bottom the following round, where, again, to be fair, Mike wins immunity, and that causes her to be in danger, but that's also just a massive aspect of her game in general, is the fact that Mike winning immunity and Mike winning out here is both a fortunate and unfortunate aspect for Carolyn's game. It's unfortunate in the sense that, obviously, she is a secondary target, though it is also very fortunate in the fact that Mike is actually someone that is protecting Carolyn in the game. And again, yeah, you can obviously credit Carolyn for cultivating that relationship with Mike, but considering the fact that she also still actually wanted Mike at every turn, it's just that she never had the opportunity to get rid of him. I do also find that questionable play, especially when, again, she just loses all power in the game following that final 7 round. Again, at final 6, she was getting voted out, and again, only survives due to the idol play. At final 5, she is completely on the outs of that vote, even in a spot where she didn't even need to be on the outs. Or the only reason she ends up voting for Sierra is because she ends up picking up on the fact that the others were voting for Sierra by the end. And at final 4, again, she's given this chance to go into fire, but again, she's given that chance mainly because Mike allows her to. And really, again, I think that's just the thing, is that a lot of her end game is simply just Mike allowing her to survive, because, again, she does do good work in cultivating a relationship with him, but it's still a spot where she's actually on the bottom for a lot of that stretch, where Mike is her only true ally through that back portion. Again, like, everyone other than Mike votes for her at the final 6, and really no one wanted to go to the end with Carolyn. Again, she was looked at in game as like the second biggest threat on the board, again, next to Mike, but the reality is also her win equity wasn't even that large. And the fact that, again, people did not really like Carolyn. A lot of the jury did not like Carolyn. I think she's someone that, again, probably wins against Rodney and Will, but obviously Rodney and Will were not probably loved by the jury either. And even going beyond that, I don't think there's any way that I would say she's like a shoe-in to beat. To her, again, I think Carolyn's game is just kind of sloppy in retrospect. It's one where, again, it is pretty solid for first 2/3, but I think her taking out Tyler leaves her very vulnerable following that, and she's just skating through really on the whims of Mike following that, to where, again, I think Carolyn's game is a bit more flawed than I initially assessed her as, which is why she's here at number 41. Number 40, we're moving on to a player that, similar thing, I mean, they were in the majority for most of their season. They did also win a lot of challenges, and at least came very close to winning the game. And at 41, we do have Ozzy from Cook Islands. And again, Ozzy's game here is one that I do find very tough to assess, because I do think, yes, he does win out. He does win 5 out of 6 immunity challenges, and I do think he definitely needed some of those. Look at his endgame stretch. I mean, he was essentially being targeted from the final 5 on. If he does not win any of those challenges, I think he is taken out by his own alliance. But he still was pretty safe before that. I mean, again, I do think, again, his early move to take out Billy Garcia is kind of ridiculous and kind of just a bad move. And beyond that, again, he finds himself on the bottom at the swap. But again, I think he does decent work to reassimilate himself there. Even though, to be fair, I think Sundra does better work, and Sundra actually becomes part of the core there with Yul and Becky. And again, Ozzy, again, is able to avoid being targeted for the next few rounds, even though, again, I think he definitely would have been in danger if they had gone to another tribal before the mutiny, and even if they went to a tribal within the mutiny. But still, once we get to the merge, again, he does win out in challenges, but again, it's a spot where he's still safe no matter what. I mean, even if he doesn't win immunities there, again, I still think Penner flips that final 9. I still think his alliance is able to really control the numbers up until the Parvati vote. Now, again, I think once that ends up happening, I think he is probably more in danger. I think he probably does go home if he doesn't win those last few challenges. So, again, I think you could say he's like somewhat fortunate because of that, but also I do think he is someone that is kind of screwed by the overall format of the season, where obviously this is a spot where this is the first ever final 3 in a spot where, again, had there been a final 2 and Ozzy just continuously won until the end, he very likely is the winner of this season. Now, I would not say guaranteed, or again, I would not have faith in Ozzy to make the correct calls towards the end game, and I could see him pulling a Kyland and wanting to play like Goku at the end and face off against the best and take Yul to the end and potentially lose to him. But again, I still think obviously the common assumption would be that he doesn't do that and he would win the game. I think that is something that you could definitely say that maybe he should be higher on this list, because again, he should have won the game, and even in the spot where he doesn't, again, he came close. He got a 5-4 vote. So again, I think he gets outplayed by Yul in that spot, but again, he still does almost win this game, and that is something to definitely prop him up. I just feel like his navigation through the game is, again, not as clean as the people higher on the list. Again, he definitely needed some of those immunity wins. He also was in a spot where, and he's kind of dangling on the bottom of his post-swap tribe for a little bit, but again, I think Ozzy's game is one that, again, I do find very tough to gauge on this list. Yeah, I do feel like the fact that he had such win equity, especially more so than the likes of the last few people we talked about, again, I think is enough to put him here at number 40. Number 39, moving on to a player that I've always also had a very tough time dissecting this person's game, as I do think there is a massive strong point to this person's game, but there's also some lows. And at number 40, I do have Nalia from Survivor Marquesas. And again, Nalia is this player that obviously has this big move on her resume. Again, the flip against the Road 2-4, the John Carroll boot, is something that I would give Nalia most of the credit for. I mean, while it is something that obviously Kathy and Sean were pitching for, it is Nalia that actually makes this move go through. Again, it is the fact that she ends up pitching to Pascal and gets Pascal to flip in a spot where Pascal is very reluctant to flip, I think is the main reason why this vote ends up going through, and it is something that sets her on a trajectory to get to the end of the game. And I think that is something that, especially this early on in Survivor history, is very rare. Now, the problem really comes from the rest of her game and the fact that, again, early on, she, again, isn't in danger at any point, and again, does have obviously a lot of influence in her post-swap tribe, but is still in the spot where, again, she's kind of just on the bottom of the pecking order of the Road 2s, where while she never ends up facing any true ramifications for that, again, it is a spot where, had they gone to more tribals, I think there's a world where Nalia ends up being an earlier boot there. Also, while, again, she's stably in the majority for those next few rounds after the John Carroll boot, I do think her end game is also very rocky, especially Final 4, where, again, that's a spot where, again, she does end up going to a tie, and had Pascal not been Pascal and actually cared about staying in the game himself, I do think Nalia would have gone home in that position, but again, gets put in the spot where she needs to win final immunity. But I think a main reason why I have Nalia this high is because she almost does win the game. Again, even in the real life scenario that we see, she gets a 4-3 vote. She is 1 vote away from winning there, and also supposedly she was the front runner coming in the final tribal, where had she just owned her game, the Road 2s would have ended up voting for her. But the fact that she wasn't able to really articulate any aspect of her game is obviously a major reason why she ends up losing at the end here. But again, I do think Nalia is, again, someone that has these highs, has these lows, again, has decent amount of win equity in the final 2 situation that she has, even though, again, to be fair, that was one of her better case scenarios. But again, is the person that actually gets the John Carroll vote to go through, but really the rest of her game surrounding that is either a spot where, again, she's kind of just following in the game, or a spot where she's in actual danger. And because, again, it's a very rocky game, but I have it here number 39. At number 38, we're moving on to, again, kind of a subgroup within this group here. Again, more so in line of these power goats in the game, these people who didn't really have much win equity, but played the game in a way that led to the eventual winner winning. Though I think these are people that had more agency in the game, people who were at least playing in their best interest for a lot more of the game for the most part. And that's why I have them in the sub tier above them. We do have Hannah Shapiro. And Hannah's someone that I did rank higher on my global runner-up ranking, and I do think there are arguments for it. Again, I think Hannah is someone that is probably understated as a runner-up, in the fact that obviously she gets shut out by Adam. But again, I think, for my opinion, I think she played a better game than Adam. Again, I personally would have voted for Hannah. But also, I think Hannah is someone that, again, like, obviously it looks bad that she loses with no votes to her name against Adam, but I think there are worlds where she does get votes. It's not like I don't think she ever gets any votes. I think the issue is that she goes against Adam, who is someone that they looked at as playing similar games, just Adam was better, and through that, Adam gets all the votes in those positions. But again, I think had she gotten to the end against someone like a Brett, someone like a Sunday, or a Will Wall. Again, I think there are definitely worlds where Hannah gets a decent chunk of votes. And again, in a like Will, Hannah, Ken final three, again, I think there's at least a shot she could potentially win. But again, obviously at the end of the day, her win equity is very low. And again, a lot of that's because of perception, where I don't think she's able to show people that she's actively playing a game, that she's not playing this emotional game. But again, I do think she was playing a pretty savvy game for a lot of it. Again, despite the fact that she was on the bottom initially and again did not want Mari to go home, she was still looped into the plan at the very last second because she had this very good relationship with Michelle. She then proceeds to be relatively safe moving forward, where again, she's part of this archetype that could very easily be a very early boot in most given situations. Yet despite that, again, she is again in a decent spot, never really in danger, where it does seem like Zeke was someone that would have gone home had they gone to another tribal. And while she's blindsided again at the Michaela vote, once we get to the merge, I feel like she's playing this middle position pretty well. Again, we see her, Zeke, and Adam really play the middle between the millennials and the Gen X tribes pretty decently, and we get to the point where like Zeke flips against their alliance, and we do see Hannah being a major reason why her side's able to combat that, and we see her actually having pretty good reads in the game, again knowing that the fact that the other side must have voted for her because she's the safe vote, only for obviously people to not listen to her. And again, I think that is a major issue with her at points, is the fact that again she does have accurate reads in the game, she does know what she should be doing in the game, yet despite that, again, people just don't really take her seriously. And again, obviously that is still an issue fundamentally, but I do think it also does show that she has this ability to play a pretty strong game. Has she been able to have more social capital in the game? But again, she ends up being on the bottom after the rock draw, but then back on top after the Zeke vote. And really from that point on, she's a major decision maker in the game. Again, her and Adam are in the middle, but it does seem like Hannah is getting more of her way. Again, we see during the Sunday vote that Adam really wants to go after a bigger threat. Yeah, instead, Hannah is able to get her way in keeping around the bigger threats in the game, which again, I don't think is necessarily a bad strategy. Obviously, it's again questionable from a jury management perspective, in the fact that they think you're getting dragged through the game, when the reality is that she was actually actively taking these bigger threats deeper into the game, so they're bigger shields ahead of her. Now again, did Hannah herself necessarily need these shields? Not really. As again, I think Hannah is someone that people are going to take to the end either way, but I do think it is a strategy that could be pretty effective in most given situations. And again, I know she gets a lot of flack for like the Brett vote, where she votes out Brett instead of David, but again, I think keeping around David for Final Four is not the worst call in the world, considering it does keep her pretty locked safe at the Final Four, and now knows that everyone has to take out David at 4, though again, it also is again bad for jury perception. And again, I think that's the overall thing with her game, is that her game is actually not that bad, especially from the merge on, where she does have a lot of influence in how the game's being played out. Problem is that the fact that no matter what she does, the jury is not really respecting how she's navigating through the game. They're thinking that she's playing emotionally and that she's not really making the right calls, when again, I think there definitely are arguments for the moves that she makes. And again, I think she ends up being a bit understated from the jury perspective. But again, I think the fact that again, she had some points where she was being blindsided, and the fact that obviously I do think a lot of the jury perception is still on her. It's still enough to put her here at number 38. Number 37, we're moving on to a player that I think is in a similar light, influenced the game at points, and was actually in a majority alliance for a lot of the game, but also, again, very much struggles to win the game. And even then, I do think had like other people in the game playing more actively around her, and that person is Danielle De Lorenzo from Survivor Panama. And again, Danielle's a player here that, again, she is in the majority for a good chunk of the game. She does start off the game in a pretty decent spot on Kasaya. Again, she is part of that 4-person alliance that forms, even though it disintegrates pretty quickly, but still, she is part of Kasaya that ends up running a lot of the game up until the final 6. And that is the point where, again, she starts to get in a little bit more danger, but even then, she has a good relationship with Sari, she has a good relationship with Aris, that ends up cultivating that group to allow that 3-2-1 to happen. Though, again, how much is Danielle involved in that happening? Not much at all, really. Now, I think you could argue the fact that she was definitely, like, kind of screwed-ish by the fact that Bruce ends up going home, or Bruce is someone that she was in particular close to, and Bruce getting medevac ends up lessening her potential in the game, though at the same time, I don't know how much she was really going to utilize Bruce in the game beyond that, as I don't feel like there's ever a point where it seemed like she was actively going to use him as a number. And again, there's also an aspect of her potentially being screwed over by Terry's idol, where Terry obviously has an idol that is so safe at Final Four, in a spot where, again, that puts her into that fire-making challenge against Sari. And while, again, she's able to get Terry to help her, and she ends up beating Sari, it's still a spot where she can't win the game. And I think that is the major thing here, is that, again, she is pretty much also, like, kind of definitively a power goat, someone that can't win the game. I don't think there is a Final 2 situation that she wins, especially in the endgame stretch that she was, like, trying to get to. Again, she was trying to get to the Final 3 with Aris and Sari, and I think she loses to both of them. Where, again, had she been trying to get to the end against, again, maybe a Courtney, maybe a Shane, I think maybe there'd be a better argument here, but again, she actively got them out instead. And again, she was essentially just the decision maker on who ends up winning at the end, where again, taking either Aris or Terry essentially decides who wins against her, to where I don't think Danielle can win the game at the end, despite the fact that she gets 2 jury votes. I think it's just, again, a very big struggle here to figure out where she gets 4 votes from in many jury situations, where, again, I think Danielle is someone that, again, was in the majority for a good chunk of the game. And again, even the point where she's out of the majority in the endgame stretch, it is one where she is very much harmed by Terry's idol, but it's one where, again, she just simply cannot win the game. The fact that she was consistently in the majority here ends up putting her here at number 37. Now, number 36, we're moving on to someone whose game is one that I've gone up on over time, especially after my latest rewatch of this person's season, where I always looked at them as, again, this power goat in the game, someone that should be a bit lower on the list, probably more in line with someone like a Cassandra, though. But again, rewatching their season really boomed my opinion of their game, and that person is Katie Gallagher from Survivor Palau. And for Katie, this was actually a very difficult decision on where exactly to put her in, because I think there's an argument that she should be higher. I think there's actually an argument that Katie was playing the best game up until the final 6 on Palau. Again, I think she's someone that was in the majority alliance the entire time, was actually the central figure within the majority alliance, where again, we see this alliance between Greg, Jen, her, Tom, and Ian form, and she's really in the middle of everything going on there. Again, she again has a final 3 with Greg and Jen. She has a final 2 with her and Jen. She has a final 2 with her and Ian. She has a final 3 with her, Ian, and Tom. And Tom was always in a position where he planned on taking Katie to the end. So again, she's essentially locked safe in the game. Now, again, you can obviously argue that that's because no one thought she would win at the end. But despite that, I think she at least had a winning scenario. Mind you, it was not with that alliance, it was with taking Karen to the end. But again, I still think Katie is someone who was so well positioned in the game early on. I think that is something to definitely give her credit for. And that's something, again, I debated putting her higher simply because of how well positioned she was in the game, and also how actively she was thinking about the game. We see points where she does consider making a move against Tom, only to never go through with that, seemingly because of her hatred of Karen, which I do think is a major knock against her game for me. The fact that it really does feel like a lot of her potential win equity kind of goes out the door simply because she's just not willing to work with Karen, just because she outwardly doesn't like her. Where again, had she just been able to consider working with Karen, she would greatly increase her win equity. Again, Karen being probably the only person towards the end game that she had any semblance of a chance at beating. Yes, that she just throws away her number, but still, I do feel like Katie was in a position to have a lot of influence at that point in the game, especially if she wanted to make a move against Tom in particular. Yeah, again, just never really pulls the trigger there. Now, again, from the final 6 on, her game wants to make these moves against Tom, but is just never given the opportunity, considering Tom continuously wins challenges. And from that point on, again, she's kind of goaded into going to one of her worst case scenarios, where again, she strong-armed into taking out Greg at the final 6, something that burns her relationship with Greg. She then ends up taking out Karen at 5, which again, I think that's probably a point where I would definitely qualm with her to a degree. Again, it's tough because again, Tom is just winning so many challenges. Again, if you can't beat Tom, might as well try to get second place at that point, I guess. And again, Ian is someone that also is going to take you, and someone that at least could theoretically beat Tom, to where again, if Tom's out of the game, you have a better chance at winning. To where again, I just think it's a very tough decision, just because again, she simply just can't get rid of Tom. And really, I think a lot of her endgame decisions are just kind of irrelevant at that point, because again, I don't think she can win, but she's also just pretty safe to final 2 no matter what. To where again, obviously, like, she takes out Jen and allows Ian to go to fire. Is it the right call? Probably not, realistically, but again, probably, as again, I think she has a better chance against Ian than she does against Tom, but also ends up burning her relationship with Jen on her way out. And again, it's just a lot of just points where again, like, yeah, you can criticize her decision making, but she didn't really have much of a decision to make, where again, the move is to get rid of Tom, and she was never really in that position to do that. And really, the rest of her game from final 6 on is essentially just her playing for second place. I think in many ways, I think you can kind of see her a bit more similarly to the likes of someone like a Laurel, in the fact that obviously, like, she had the likes of Tom and Ian around her and never made the move to take them out, despite the fact that she would lose against both of them. And to be fair, I think Laurel is probably someone that had a bit more win equity than Katie did, but I do think Katie is somebody that was just much better positioned for a lot more of the game, while also being a player that had a lot more influence in the back portions of the season, which again, you can definitely argue is a negative in the fact that again, she had these opportunities to take out these big threats and never did it. But again, she's kind of in this position where she's screwed either way, where again, she's essentially at a point where again, if she's not going to work with Karen, which again is a criticism there, she's essentially playing for second place anyway. And through that, again, I think when looking at just her pure navigation through the game, I think there's a lot of impressive aspects of her game from that point of view, even though again, I do think lack of win equity and again, her inability to work with Karen is definitely a massive negative at the same time. I think the fact that she ends up being very well positioned up until the final 6, and even from the final 6 on, again, was definitely disadvantaged from the fact that Tom just won all those challenges that she was not able to do anything about. Again, I think at the end of the day, for me, enough to put her here at number 36. Now, number 35, we're moving on to the last player in this tier, a player that I do also have a very tough time wrapping my head around. This is a player that has a pretty stable end game stretch and actually potentially has some win equity maturity, but also has a very rocky game before that, to where, and it's kind of the opposite of some of the other players we talked about in this tier, where earlier on, of these players that had very good beginning of the games, but very rough end games. This is a person that has kind of the opposite, and that person is Tai Trang from Survivor Co. Wrong. And Ty's another one that I did rank higher initially. I do think Tai is somebody that, again, was like in and outs of the majority for really a lot of the early game stretch. I mean, again, looking at the original Beauty Tribe, he was part of that initial majority group that formed between him, Caleb, Anna, and Julia, and eventually, and the women create a thing. And really, but if they ever were to go to Tribal, I really don't even know who necessarily goes home by that point. But still, it's like he is still someone that's, again, sketching people out because of him constantly looking for idols. He gets to a swap where, again, I do think he does some good work in building a bomb Scott Pollard, but, and again, he's part of the group that strong arms the brains to take out Peter. And again, I do think that is pretty decent work, though I would say Scott probably does a little bit more of the legwork there. But still, it's like by the time we get to the merge, he's just kind of following the likes of Scott and Jason. And again, that's fine initially because he is part of the majority initially. But again, his game kind of crumbles for a few rounds following that. Again, the point where, again, we get to like the Debbie blind side, where again, he has no clue what is happening during that round. And obviously we have his like big move with the Scott maneuver, which like him like openly betraying Scott in that spot is something that, again, I was very anti at the time. I did not think that was a good move for him, and again, it works out for him. Again, obviously he does find a solid alliance with like Aubrey and Joe, and from that point on, again, he has a solid ride to the end. He is going to the final three if Aubrey and Joe had these extraordinary circumstances not happen. And again, in that final three, he stands a shot at least, while the Bronze, again, were upset at Tai for flipping on them. Like, they also did not like Aubrey or Joe. I know they have said in some exit press that they would have potentially voted for Tai, that they've also said other things. But still, it's like, I do think Tai would have had potential win equity in that position. And the reason why he is, again, lower than even the second command players for me is mainly because I just don't think Tai had that much influence in how the game played out. He was relatively safe throughout a lot of the game. He, again, was this like integral swing vote at points, but he very rarely like pushes in a direction and actually gets his way through that. Again, we see him during the Cal Jason vote. That's a spot where he very much wants to save Jason. He uses his extra vote to try to take Michelle out of the game, and no one ends up following him. Not even Jason ends up following in that plan to try to save himself. Where, again, I think that is really bad and just showing like how little influence he has in the game. And again, when he also had like a rocky mid game, he was even like, again, inconsistent earlier on. Again, I just think Kai's game is one that I'm just a bit unsure about, just because like, I don't really feel like he actually does that much, despite the fact that he is in the majority for a lot of the game. And again, the fact that he is in the majority for most of the game and could have won in a specific scenario that, again, wasn't that unlikely to happen. Where I also think, again, it's a similar thing against Sydney, where, again, I think the Bronze were very much more anti-Sydney than they were him. Where, again, I think Tai definitely had possibility of winning, though, to be fair, again, would he be able to state his case? Probably not based on what we saw. But again, I think Tai is someone that, again, had a sliver of win equity. I just think, again, the lack of influence in the game is largely what keeps him below the tier we're about to get to. And that's why he's here at number 35. Now number 34. And now we're starting off a new tier of the list. Pretty much the tier right in the middle of the list. And that tier being the second in command tier. A tier of players that I feel like were second in command to a more dominant presence in the game. A person who is more active in the game and then got their way more often. But this is a player that, again, worked alongside them, but we're also still contributing to that alliance. To where, again, I think there is a difference here between these players and the people that are in the followers grouping beforehand. Again, where I feel like those players are players that didn't really do that much actively and were just following orders and did not really contribute to their side's success outside of just being a number. Where I feel like these are players that actually did do more in the game. And at number 34, we're going to be starting off with a player that was probably one of the more active players of the people in this tier. I think this is, again, someone that was very active in the game. Though I get the debate if he was even technically a second in command, but still, I think it's the criteria for the most part. But I think it is the fact that he like actively tried to do things and kind of failed at those things, leaves him at the bottom of this tier. And that person is Albert from Survivor South Pacific. And again, Albert is this player that, again, I would say he is kind of a second in command to Coach. Now, again, like Sophie is also in this tier when it comes to the winner ranking. I think both of them were, again, essentially second commands to Coach. In the sense that, again, I don't think they were the main reason why their alliance succeeded. I think Coach was that reason, which, again, we'll talk about. But I do think they still had influence there. I still feel like they were able to influence Coach at points. Mind you, again, not enough. And I think this is another thing with Albert that, again, makes him somewhat similar to the likes of Ty, is that we do see him, again, trying to do things and kind of failing at them a lot of the time. And we see him try to save Michaela alongside Sophie, only for Coach to get his way there and win that vote over. We see Albert doing something like very blatant jury management to the point where people just recognize that he's doing that and get annoyed at him for that. And along with that comes like him trying to create these plans to make these big moves, only for him to just never actually follow through on them. And again, I think that is a negative for Albert here, in a sense that, while again, I do appreciate how active of a player he is someone that also is actively failing at a lot of things he's trying to do, or some of these things that he's like pretending like he wants to do with no intention to actually follow through with, is also just poor play, as it again is just terrible jury management, despite the fact that he thinks that's good jury management. Now, aside that, again, he has a mostly smooth ride. I will say, again, he did have a rocky stretch at the first final five, where Brandon Hance goes home, where it did seem like he was initially the target for that round, despite the fact that he had a final three of Sophie and Coach. And again, he was just like overplaying his hand during that round, only for him to, again, actually do some decent work at the very end and actually goading Brandon to give him his immunity necklace, which, again, on paper is an insane move, again, with an assist from Coach there. But again, I think that is something that is at least good to mention here from Albert. But outside that, again, he is pretty stably just in the majority, again, working alongside the likes of Coach and Sophie, but is also someone that, again, has no real chance at winning the game. I don't think there's a final three situation that he wins. I don't think the jury particularly respected him. I think they just looked at him as someone that was kind of a phony. But I do think, again, there are some good aspects, there's some bad, but I think there's enough good there, especially considering how active a player he was, to put him in the second command tier. So he's here number 34, now number 33. Another person that you could debate is even a second command, but I think that's probably a better way to describe her game, because I think this is another person that, again, is an active player. It's just, again, a question of how effective they are. That person is Carolyn Weiger from Survivor 44. And Carolyn's someone that I know at the time was getting very much overhyped as a player, especially in the sense that obviously the edit wants you to think that she's this really great player. Really, for me, Carolyn is just kind of fine. To where, again, I actually did, again, debate if she should fall into the second command tier, because I think there's an argument that she should be more, again, like with the Ties of the world, which Too Fair isn't that far away in the ranking itself, but again, more so in line with that, in the sense of a person who doesn't really get their way, is not even necessarily in the majority for a lot of the game, and kind of fails at a lot of the things that they want to do. Now, again, I think, to be fair to Carolyn, there are things to give her credit for. Again, she makes that move, take out Sarah Wade, which puts her at the top of the Tika power structure, at least short term. But again, I do think that is something that I can give her credit for. I think also the fact that she, again, seems to be a savvy player, again, had some decent reads at points, and obviously knows the game very well. The criticism comes from the fact that I don't feel like none of that mattered, in the fact that when we look at how the game plays out, it's essentially Carson and Jam Jam being the ones that got the Tika 3 through the game, more so than Carolyn, where Carolyn's just kind of there, while Carson and Jam Jam were more important to how they navigate through the game, particularly through their relationships with the likes of Lauren and Jamie. Like, we hear a lot about how, like, Carson and Jam Jam were really in with the Ratus, where Carolyn just wasn't. And while we see Carolyn, again, build this really strong bond with Franny, again, that never really benefited them in the game, and more so actually leads to her being blindsided when Franny ends up going home. Now, I will say, again, in comparison to someone like an Albert, I do think there's a pro here in the sense that I think Carolyn can theoretically win the game. I think Carolyn's someone that, again, theoretically could have been respected, and had she been at the end against someone that wasn't Carson or Jam Jam, I think there's definitely a serious shot that she at least gets a decent amount of votes, potentially even wins, especially in like a Heidi Jamie final three in particular. I think she definitely has a lot of win equity there, to where, again, I do think Carolyn is someone that I will give her credit for, again, at least demonstrating a lot of skill for the game. I just think in terms of like how her game plays out on this season, I don't feel like a lot of that mattered, especially in the post-merge phase, where I feel like a lot of the success of the Tika 3 was more so down to how Carson and Jam Jam navigated through the game, where, again, I think Carolyn was just kind of a sidekick to them, which, again, considering how active of a player she is, and the fact that she, again, at least has some minor influence at points, I feel like that is enough to put her in the second command tier, even though I struggle with putting her much, much higher than where she is currently, which is why she's here number 33. Now number 32, and now we're moving on to the more traditional second commands. Again, these next few people we're going to be talking about are pretty much like the people that come straight to my mind of these second command runner-up players. And here we're going to start off with Becky Lee from Survivor Cook Islands. And Becky is someone that, again, I think is a solid second command in the sense that, again, she was 100% working alongside Yul. We do see her actively strategizing with Yul at multiple points in the season. The problem is that, again, she's strategizing to give Yul the win, which, again, is something that makes it very tough to dissect Becky's game, where, again, I think Becky is actually a very competent strategic thinker in the game. She is someone that, again, very much helped Yul navigate through the game, and someone that, again, he could workshop his plans with. The problem is, again, that Becky just doesn't really try to win the game herself, where again, I think she was undyingly loyal to Yul the entire time and never would have cut Yul at the end. I mean, obviously, again, like Becky is someone that I do think gets kind of fortunate in the game, where obviously, again, I talked about this with Yul, but again, I do think the fact that the I2s came into an emergent spot where they could even get the numbers back, I think is pretty fortunate for them, considering the bottle twist of it all. So again, I think that same thing applies to Becky here as well. Also, only Becky can win the game. Again, she gets close, and I will say this is something to somewhat credit her for, is the fact that if there was a final 2 on this season, Ozzy had one final immunity, and if Ozzy does take Becky to the end, Becky does get 1 vote away from winning the game. So again, that's something. But again, I just don't know if there's a winning scenario. I mean, maybe if she gets to a final 2 with Sundra, maybe there's a chance there. But again, I think you'd argue the fact that it was a final 3 instead of final 2 kind of screwed her. But at the same time, it's not like she was planning on going to a final 2 that she was going to win, because she was always planning on going to the end of Yule. So again, I think just at the end of the day, it's like that's the thing with Becky's game, is that none of it really matters, because she was always planning on going to the end against someone that she knew she was going to lose against. And when also considering the fact that, again, Ozzy was there winning all the challenges, again, like Becky had no chance at winning this season. But again, I do think Becky is more integral to her alliance member success than the previous players we talked about. Well, also again, gets unfortunate that there isn't a final 2, to where again, I think there's enough pros here, and that's enough to be here number 32. Now number 31, we're moving on to another kind of typical second command, and that person is Sabrina Thompson from Survivor One World. And Sabrina is one that, again, I think you could argue isn't a second command, simply in the fact that Kim technically has another second command that we might talk about relatively soon. But I feel like Sabrina, again, still falls into that category. And again, for me, really, there isn't much difference between Sabrina and the next person we'll be talking about, as again, they played very similar games. They were very loyal to Kim. Again, helped Kim navigate through the game, but still were essentially playing for a loss. Again, we're essentially playing to get to the end against Kim, where they were going to lose. And obviously that is a major issue there, but also we're solidly in the majority of the entire game. There was never a point where they were out of the majority. And I think a pro for Sabrina over the next person we're talking about is I feel like Sabrina does a lot more to build relationships with people outside of her core group, where I feel like we see Sabrina build these bonds with some of the men in the game, which the other player doesn't necessarily do. But to be fair, I feel like that's probably more of a thing to add to an actual general player ranking, more so than, again, assessing their games. Because when assessing their games, again, I take a lot more consideration to their positioning in the game. And I feel like Sabrina is someone that was, again, a bit in a lesser position than the person we'll be about to be talking about, in the sense that, again, I think Kim was more loyal to the other person than Sabrina. So while Sabrina, again, still has a very stable game in the majority throughout all of it, she also doesn't really have much to say on her own. I don't know if there's a single thing outside of, I guess, giving the idol to Colton, and again, just having certain bonds here and there. I would say Sabrina does that much actively on her own. But again, I do think Sabrina is still, again, a very competent player here, one again in majority from beginning to end, and that's enough to be here number 31. Now number 30, another player, similar thing. We got Chelsea Meisner from Survivor One World, where again, I think Chelsea and Sabrina's game are pretty similar. Again, both, again, just second commands to Kim. And I think Chelsea was more so second command to Kim. Again, I think we see Chelsea a lot more being involved in decisions being made, and we see them idol hunting together. And Chelsea's the only one that knows about Kim's idol. And again, I think if Kim had to make a choice between Sabrina and Chelsea, I think she would have picked Chelsea. And I think that's something that, again, boons her on this list, in the sense that I think she was better positioned in the game, simply because, again, Kim was always going to save Chelsea in the game. Now, outside that, again, I think there are aspects of Chelsea's game that are worse than Sabrina's. Again, I think Chelsea's someone that doesn't really have the best social connections in the game. She doesn't really bond as much with people outside of her alliance. Even people within her alliance didn't particularly like her. Again, the likes of Christina and Alicia. To where I think there's definitely qualms there. Though with that said, I'm actually not entirely sure who would have won between Chelsea and Sabrina, where again, had there been a final 3 of Chelsea, Sabrina, Christina, which we were, again, not that far away from. I mean, I guess kind of in the sense that, again, no one's voting out Kim, but still, again, I'm not entirely sure how that goes. I do feel like Chelsea definitely has some locked in votes from the likes of Kim, and I know she was particularly close to Jay in particular, though again, I think Sabrina obviously has Troy, Zan, and Leaf, as we see in the real life situation, while also, again, probably the likes of Alicia, who again seemingly did not gel with Chelsea. I think you got the likes of Kat and Michael and Jonas, where I just don't really know where they go. Again, I know there was more sentiment to the fact that Chelsea was essentially the lesser Kim, to where again, if Kim wasn't there, then they would potentially vote for Chelsea. But again, there's also the fact that I think Sabrina just had better relationships out there, to where, again, I'm not entirely sure where that would go. And I think that's what makes this decision here between Chelsea and Sabrina very, very tight. Both have, again, very similar trajectories through the game, while also it's very unsure about the win equity for either of them, to where, again, I think I personally would give the edge to Sabrina, but I don't really know. So again, I think because that, again, I would say Sabrina is potentially the better player than Chelsea. I think she is someone that I would probably have more faith in to win any given season. but I think Chelsea's the one that, again, just barely edges her out here and having a better game. Again, being more involved in what Kim was doing and actually having more loyalty from Kim herself, to where, again, I think she was higher on the pecking order, to where, again, it's barely anything here, but again, I think those minute differences put Chelsea here at number 30. Number 29, also another pretty definitive second command, but kind of the last one in this position, and I guess technically the best one, considering the ones after this are weird games. But at number 29, we do have Jervis Peterson from Survivor Blood vs. Water. And Jervis is just another person, again, like, is alongside Tyson for a lot of the game, though I do think is a, again, solid second command to Tyson. We do see Tyson and Jervis, again, strategizing throughout the game. I think Jervis was, again, very involved in what Tyson was doing in the game. I think because, again, it's relatively similar to someone like a Chelsea, but also like Chelsea, again, didn't have the greatest social connections with a lot of the jury members. I do think Jervis, again, does a lot to kind of burn jury votes. Again, his treatment of Hayden on his way out is kind of dumb. And also, again, we do have him, like, betraying Aris when, again, they were friends before the show. And to be fair, that is something that, again, is just a bit strange to dissect with this, because there are aspects of Jervis's game that are affected by pregame, and that he was friends with some of these people coming into the season. That leads to the likes of Aris and Tina feeling more betrayed by him. But still, it's not like he was ever going to win against Tyson anyway. But something I will give Jervis some credit for is the fact that I do think Jervis would have tried to take a shot at Tyson had he had the opportunity. The issue is that he just never had the opportunity. Now, yeah, I think it was a spot where Jervis was only willing to take that shot at the tail end of the game, like had like Tyson not won immunity at Final Four, and he didn't have another big threat in Tina there. I think Jervis would have taken the shot in a spot where, again, I don't think the likes of Chelsea or Sabrina would have. So again, I think that is a bit of an edge towards Jervis here. But realistically, again, like, I don't think Jervis is that different from the other two. I looking at their games, again, I do think Tyson was pretty loyal to Jervis the entire way. And again, we do see Jervis being involved in how they were navigating through the game. So again, there's not much of a difference between Jervis and the likes of Chelsea and Sabrina, but considering the fact that I do feel like he had like a little bit more of a mind of his own, I'm going to put him here at number 29. Number 28, and again, we're keeping with the second command here, but kind of transitioning a bit to more active players in the game, players that did more on their own, had better positioning in the game. Now, again, this is someone that you could still argue is even second command. But this is, again, just another one. I'm a bit conflicted on where to land their game. I actually debate if they should be in the more dominant tiers of the list, as I do think they're somebody that was in the majority for most of the season. And again, was arguably a decision maker throughout a lot of the season, though also don't know how much decision making she was really making. And that's the reason why she's here. At 28, I'm going to go with Missy Payne from Survivor San Juan del Sur. And again, Missy's just a strange player to assess in the fact that, again, I don't think she's a traditional second command. I don't think she's a person who, again, is just the closest ally to someone that was running the game, as I do feel like she's somebody that was, again, just solidly positioned in the game. Again, she had really close bonds to both John. She obviously had Baylor there, but she also had Natalie. And I do think she's essentially, again, a second command in the sense that she, again, is an active player. Again, she's not doing nothing, but she's also, like, not necessarily, like, pushing her own agenda. Is more so going along with other people's agendas, and ends up being like a major swing vote at multiple portions of the game. And I'll say, I do think early on she actually does some decent work and being pretty much right in the center of the Hunapu tribe, and ends up voting out Drew Christie. And then at the swap, she ends up also keeping John and Jacqueline on board, with siding with her over Dale and Kelly. Though I think when we get to the merge, again, it really becomes a point where she's, again, just kind of following what other people are doing. And initially she's part of like Jeremy's alliance as they take out Josh, where, again, I don't know how much Missy was necessarily really involved in a lot of the goings on there. And we get the actual Jeremy blindside, where, again, it's a spot where, like, Missy doesn't necessarily want that to happen, but again, goes along with it as a major swing vote in it, but ultimately, like, thinks it's too early, but again, just goes along with it because John is really pushing for it. And then when we eventually get the John blindside down the road, again, that's a spot where she's once again just going along with Natalie's plan. She actually doesn't actually properly go along with it, in the sense that she's actually not willing to vote for John. She votes for Jacqueline both there and on the revote, as again, she was so unwilling to vote for John because of a promise they had made, to where, again, I think there's like an aspect of her game here where, again, she's more so like a follower. She's more so just following along with other people's plans. But again, I do think she is someone that is, again, for me, better than a follower. Is that, again, I think she's a very active player. Again, I think she is actively maintained these relationships that keep her in the middle of the game. She is someone that was in a good position really from beginning to end, despite the fact that this is actually, again, somewhat turbulent season. Again, the only points where she's blindsided throughout this entire season are when Natalie switches her one vote to take out Alec Christie, and when Natalie plays her right out final five. Both points being spots where she's technically in the majority when she's being blindsided. Where, again, I think it is like kind of just a tough thing to gauge with Missy here. And it's just that, again, she is someone that has a pretty easy ride through the season. She's in the majority from beginning to end and is a major swing vote along the way. But despite that, I just feel like she doesn't really have much gumption in the game, along the fact that she also has no win equity at the end. And I don't think there's a single situation that Missy can win. Where, again, there are situations where she gets jury votes. I mean, even in the one that came relatively close to happening in her Jacqueline Keith Nail, she gets jury votes in that position. She obviously gets jury votes in the position that she does get, but obviously that's more so because Baylor is there. But again, I think there are spots where, again, like someone like Jeremy, someone like Natalie, if they're on the jury, they are voting for Missy. I just don't think there's another vote headed her way in most given situations, which, again, makes her essentially someone that, again, can't win the game. But I do think she is someone that, again, was solidly in the middle for a lot of the season. I just wish that she, again, had more of an agenda here, where, because I kind of look at her as more of, again, a secondary player to, again, these more domineering presences like a Jeremy, John, Natalie. So again, because of that, for me, she's here at number 28. Now, number 27, we're moving on to a player that I actually think is probably one of the more competent players in this tier here, one that actually probably has some of the higher highs of the people in this tier. The problem is that they kind of give up their game by the end, and that person is Tasha from Survivor Cambodia. And again, Tasha is someone that on this season demonstrates a lot of great game ability here. I mean, especially at the swap. Again, at that first swap where she gets pretty swap screwed, again, alongside Savage and being on the bottom against Takeo's in a spot where, again, that's the only tribe where Takeo has a majority, meaning that Takeo's should be even more incentivized to stick together. She's somehow able to come on top despite that, again, flipping over Abby and proceeding to then flip over Varner and be able to maintain the numbers until the next swap, which, again, I think that is insanely impressive. I think that is something that, again, simply should not have been able to be done. But again, I do think Tasha plays that particularly well, and I think that is, again, a much bigger pro than, like, really anything Albert or Carolyn have on their resumes, or really any of the people we're probably going to be talking about in this tier following this. The issue, again, I do think is the fact that her game in the back portion of the season kind of just dies, especially after the Cass boot, where I feel like after Cass goes home, which, again, I would give her credit for leading the charge against Cass, I do feel like she then just kind of lets Jeremy take control and is kind of, again, this sidekick to Jeremy in a spot where, again, she knows Jeremy will beat her, yet despite that, she's still trying to get to the end of Jeremy. And beyond that, I also feel like her navigation through a game even at that point is a bit rocky. Mind you, it is for everybody on Cambodia, where no one is really consistently in the majority the entire time. But obviously, again, she is someone that is blindsided when Steven ends up going home. She, to be fair, does end up voting for Steven the previous tribal, which actually, to be fair, makes it even more egregious the fact that she is blindsided the next time when they tried to make the move. But again, it's still a spot where, like, she is playing actively. Like, we do see her playing the game still. Again, at Final 7, she's still trying to make moves there. She, again, is aware of the fact that Kimmy flips and is trying to convince Jeremy of that. Again, she is still doing things. And I think that's the thing that makes it so frustrating about Tasha's game, is I do think it could have been a pretty elite runner-up game had she simply tried to win the game towards the back portion of the game, but I just don't feel like she was. She was instead just trying to navigate through the game to give Jeremy the win. So again, we never get any sense that she ever would have considered taking out Jeremy. And again, that's something that I do feel like I have to dock on her game here, is the fact that she was simply kind of just an enabler for Jeremy in the game, while also, again, not even having necessarily that stable of a ride through the game, and also has, like, very little win equity in a lot of situations where even in the, like, Spencer, Tasha, Abby final 3, which I think is probably her best chance, maybe a chance with Keith, but even in those spots, I mean, to be fair, she gets votes for sure, but I don't know if she gets enough votes to win. So I ultimately look at her game as one that is just, again, kind of underwhelming, just considering the fact that I do feel like there was a lot of potential there for a really great runner-up game, but instead she just doesn't really try particularly hard to win the game, which is why she's here at number 27. Now number 26, and here we're moving on to the top of the second in command tier, though one that is kind of a wonky second in command, in the sense that I think you can argue this person played a dominant game, and this person was looked at as, like, the leader of their alliance by the people in the season. The problem is that that's not really reality, and through that makes it tough to distinguish where they should land, where actually last time I actually put him at the bottom of the second command tier. However, I'm going to put him at the top this time around. That person is Stephanie LaGrossa from Survivor Guatemala. And again, Stephanie's the spot where I think her game is actually, like, kind of bad. Again, it's a spot where I think she makes some terrible decisions for her game. I think she, like, actively burns jury members along the way. She even lessens her chances of even getting to the end by taking out Lydia over Danny, a spot where, again, at that point, Danny was taking Rafe over her. And again, I think that's really bad. Again, her burning the likes of Judd and Jamie is really bad. But outside of that, again, she is in the majority the entire game. That's something I will give her credit for. And also something to note here is, again, everyone perceived Stephanie as the leader of her side, the one that was making the decisions. And that's why people are so upset at her at the end in her taking out the likes of Jamie and Judd, because again, they assume that she's involved in that she was the person that did that. Now again, was that true? No. As again, I think it's very clear when we watch the show that it was Rafe that was really orchestrating these votes and was the one that nudged Stephanie to do things that were against her best interests. So again, he gets her to make these calls that are again bad for her game, but I will say like something to credit her for is she was even in these positions to make these calls, because I do think genuinely this is Stephanie making the calls here. Like Stephanie is in this swing position that again, she had essentially the deciding over again Judd going home or Lydia going home, but again, she just makes the wrong decisions. And again, that's what makes it so tough to rank her, because I think she actually plays the game pretty poorly and again had no win equity. But to be fair, I think her lack of win equity, while again she definitely did not act the greatest out there, and it's fully understandable why people wouldn't want to vote for her based on how she acted out there, but also to be fair, there was also an anti-returnee sentiment as well, where I think that definitely would have harmed her chances of winning anyway. But again, I just think Stephanie is a player here that is just tough to gauge simply because she was in a dominant position, but then used that position to make moves that benefited other people and moves that had her be influenced by other people. So again, the next person we'll be talking about, again, you can argue a similar thing, but I think that person was acting a lot more on their own. Again, they weren't being manipulated by other players. They simply were making decisions that were bad for their game. Where Stephanie, again, does have technically some agency, is that she's using that agency incorrectly at almost every turn. And again, that's what makes Stephanie tough to rank here. But yeah, I still think the fact that she was perceived to be at the head of the alliance, the fact that she still was technically the one making the ultimate call by the end, even though, again, she was being nudged to by Rafe, I think is enough to put her here at number 26. Now number 25, and now we're moving on to someone that's essentially a transitional player here between the second command tier and the semi-dominant tier, which we're getting to. Again, a player that, again, I would say like Stephanie, again, like was making a lot of bad decisions for the game, was not trying to win the game, and probably couldn't win the game. But with that said, did have a lot of influence in the game and was doing so independently. Unlike Stephanie, who again, I feel like was manipulated by Rafe. And here at number 25, we're going to go with Sugar Kuiper from Survivor Gabon. And again, we obviously talked about this tier of power goats early on, and realistically, the likes of Sugar and Stephanie can also be looked at as power goats in this position. Though again, unlike the power goats from earlier, who again, I feel like really were more so just deciding who was going to win at the tail end of the game, I feel like Sugar is a player that essentially was deciding who was going to win for most of the season. Really, after she survives through her initial tribe, she ends up being a major swing vote through really the rest of the season, and is in a position where, again, she annoyed people didn't like her, she was never going to win the game because of that, but she did still have, again, a lot of influence in the game. Now, again, how many of those moves were actually good for her? Again, very few of them, but she at least made moves. She at least was influencing how the game played out. Again, she made this massive flip against Ace, which, again, terrible move for her. Has no reason to be making that move. But to be fair, it kind of works out for her in the sense that he has like Kenny and Crystal as pretty solid allies following that. She then flips against the Kodas at the merge, which I will say that move is probably a bit better for her, as obviously she was on the bottom of the Koda power structure, and through that, again, now she's at the top essentially. Again, she's this person kind of in the middle of like these duos in the game. Again, she's close to Kenny and Crystal. She's also close to Maddie, and Susie's kind of there, but still she ends up being in a pretty powerful position, and she ends up keeping Bob safe, someone that she really wants to take to the end. And again, she ends up really fighting at the end game to take Bob to the end. Again, at Final Four, she's able to get Maddie to agree to take Bob to the end, and it's a spot where she does demonstrate a lot of influence there, where even when Susie ends up winning immunity, again, we do see Sugar again going out of her way to vote with Bob to take out Maddie. Now again, terrible move. No reason for it. Again, it doesn't matter the match, she's going to lose anyway. And in that spot, again, she was very much wanting Bob to get to the end, as again, he reminded her of her father who just passed away. And again, there's the other circumstances around that, but it's still a play that burns a jury vote for like no reason with Maddie. But again, that's Sugar for you. Again, her entire game is one where, again, she's in a position of power, but she's playing terribly. She's making the incorrect call at almost every single turn. But also, I feel like she herself knew that. Like, she herself knew the fact that she couldn't win the game, so I might as well try to get someone that I want to win the game to win the game. And again, I think that ends up being this weird dynamic here, Sugar, to where, again, I think at the end of the day, I am going to include her in this semi-dominant tier, as it really from, again, the Ace vote on, she has a lot of influence in the game. The problem is, again, that she's not playing for her best interest and simply can't win the game. even if she was playing in her best interest. So again, it's kind of this tough game to truly dissect, but at the end of the day, I'm going to put her here at number 25. Now, number 24, we're moving on to a player that I really want to assess higher. I feel like this is a person that I used to assess higher. Again, this player, like, having somewhat dominant end game. Again, definitely had like a power duo towards the end game stretch and had a winning scenario, but I think when looking at this game a little bit more critically, I think there definitely are more holes to pick at it, and that person is Lisa Whelchel from Survivor Philippines. And again, I really wanted to assess Lisa higher because I do feel like Lisa is a player that, again, had she been left to her own devices, I think she likely goes on to win the game. Again, she did want to go to the end against Abby and Skupin, and that's a spot where she does win the game. The problem is that she obviously, one, fails in that position to get Skupin to go on her side. While, again, that's bad for Skupin, the fact that he's dumb and doesn't realize what's even in his best interest. I think it's also bad for Lisa in the fact that she couldn't get Skupin to see that it was in his best interest. Beyond that, her beginning of her game is very rocky. And again, she perfectly embodies this like semi-dominant tier, and the fact that her first half is actually kind of bad. Where like, I mean, she's in this spot where she probably is the first boot had Tandang gone to any of the initial tribals. She's then able to recover from that, but even then is on the bottom of the Tandang power structure. And ultimately, the move that gets her in a power position is one that isn't even made by her. It's one that Skupin ends up flipping against Artis on his own, independently from Lisa. That then puts Lisa in this position where she can go alongside Skupin to become this like power duo that's really in the middle of everything. But even then, it's largely a position where, again, it's because she's largely perceived as a goat, where people are looking at like both her and Skupin as these goats that were going to influence how the game played out. Where through that, again, we see Malcolm pitching to her, we see Penner pitching to her, and again, she's a very integral number, but one that largely is a number because people think she can't win. And again, I think credit to her is that I think she can win. She does have a final three situation that she can win. Mind you, it's probably the only situation she can win. But again, there is a final three of her, Abby, Skupin that she actively wanted to go to the end with, only for Skupin to just fight against it. And through that, essentially force her hand to go to a final four where she ultimately ends up losing. But again, I think the issues of Lisa's game really go even beyond that, where she just straight up is pretty ineffective at almost everything she does. And again, I really want to like Lisa's game. It's one I did hold in high regard earlier, but when really thinking through it, again, she tries to flip the onto Malcolm by like leaking that he has an idol. People don't even believe her when she does that. Again, that's pretty bad. Again, she refuses to flip on Tandang despite clearly being in her best interest. She ultimately tries to make this move against Malcolm and is never able to actually make it go through until the final four. Or even at final six, we get talk about taking out Malcolm, but I don't even think it would have gone through considering Skupin was very anti the concept of taking out Malcolm at that point. To where I think really, again, she's pretty ineffective even getting her own number one ally to go her way. To where, again, I think sadly, Lisa is someone that, despite her being in a, again, dominant position as, again, she's in the top of her tribe, she is this swing vote, again, she's essentially just a glorified power goat, and even one that doesn't necessarily have that much power. But again, something I will give her credit for over the likes of Sugar is the fact that, again, I think she could win. She at least had a winning scenario, and she was striving for that. And I think just in general, I do have faith in Lisa to at least know what she should be doing. It's just a question of can she do it, and even at points, does she have the motivation to do it considering her own morals? But again, I think Lisa's, again, a very flawed player, but at least was in a power duo that did have a decent amount of control in the game and was pretty safe throughout the entirety of the game, which again, I think is enough to put her here at number 24. Now, number 23. And here we're moving on to a player that, again, people are going to be upset by. Again, this is one of the big placements on the list that people are very upset by in my original ranking, and who would have guessed it? I stand by it. If not, actually, she's actually a little bit lower. I have Parvati Shallow from Survivor Heroes Villain. And Parvati plays a game that, again, is impressive. It is a very impressive game, the fact that she comes into the game with such a massive target on her back and is able to still navigate all the way to the final two while pulling off some big moves along the way. Again, it's a very impressive game. It's not a very consistent game. And again, it's a game that has her, again, being on the bottom from the very beginning. Again, she's able to build a bond with Danielle and Russell, but she is fundamentally on the bottom to where after Randy goes home, again, she is the target. She would have gone home had it not been for Russell finding an idol, which again, very luck-based in the sense that Russell even found the idol to begin with, and luck-based in the sense that like someone like Russell was even on the season that would go out and find an idol to save her in that specific spot. So I think she gets very fortunate in the fact that Russell is someone that is playing the game in a very bold way and also did not really care if he stayed or went during that Tyson boot round, where again, I think there are, again, luck-based circumstances of her surviving in that round, where obviously you can argue that, again, Parvati played such a good social game for Russell that got her to save her, but also, yeah, I think when taking in all the context here, it's not as impressive. But either way, we find that again, the lead up to the Rob vote off, and at that point, she's able to take control alongside Russell. Now, again, I would give more credit to Russell for pulling off the Rob vote, considering Russell was the one to pull over Jerry and coach, while Parvati was someone that, again, did do some work with Jerry, but more of it was just damage control, considering like she just did not have a good relationship with Jerry to begin with. But beyond that, again, she's on the top at that point, and again, technically gets her way during the coach vote, then proceeds to not get her way during the Courtney vote in a spot where she wanted to save Courtney, which even then, questionable move, considering Courtney had so many connections on the other side and would have flipped, but again, still, she does end up failing to get her way in that vote. And then we get to the double idol play, which again, I think is obviously a very impressive move, a very flashy move, and again, leads to an easy path for the villains to go on to win the game. Now again, I think she was kind of lucky to be in a position where she could even pull off that move, where obviously, again, I think really more so comes down to JT's questionable play of handing the idol over to Russell, and Russell being able to play that up well, more so than like Parvati doing much outside of, again, just having a connection to Russell to get that second idol. But also, ideally, she would have not needed to play both idols and would have just played the idol on the person that she knew would get the votes on. And also, again, it wasn't that impressive of a read to get off of Amanda, where it felt very obvious that she was clearly lying to her in that spot. But again, still, like, a very bold move that, again, I don't think many players at that point in Survivor would have made. So I think there's a lot of credit to be given for that alone. And really from that point on, again, the villains have the majority. But even then, again, Parvati's not necessarily getting her way, but even then doesn't necessarily have a smooth ride where, again, she gets blindside Final 7, where Danielle goes home, and from Final 6, Final 5, she wins immunities in spots where, again, there was talk about potentially voting her out. I don't think it would have happened, especially at 6 over Rupert, maybe at 5 over Colby, but still, I do think obviously her winning immunities just stopped all those plans anyway, and we do see her barely scraping by through Final 4 in a spot where, again, I don't know how much Parvati did herself to save herself in that spot. It felt like more so just Russell on his own, coming up with the idea that if Jerry goes on the jury, then he would have her jury vote that caused him to vote out Jerry over Parvati. And again, she gets to the end in a spot where I don't think she can win, at least, again, in very few situations. I think to win the game, she would have to be against like Russell and Danielle, which, to be fair, was her plan. But obviously, again, she fails at keeping Russell in line. And obviously, again, there were these other weird things going on with Russell. But I still feel like at the end of the day, like, Parvati's game is very flawed. I think it's one where, again, she does have control at points. She does make these big, bold moves. Again, I still would give her a lot of credit for, but it's still a game that, again, I don't think she can win the game. I think it's also one where she does get blindsided at points. She's also doesn't necessarily get away at points. And again, I think her Heroes of Villains game is very overrated by the majority of the fan base, but it's still, again, a impressive game, especially considering the context of her coming into the game. But again, my opinion has not really changed over time. I still think this is one of the more overhyped runner-up games in the history of the show. She's here at number 23. At number 22, moving on to a person that actually has swapped with Parvati for my previous list, where I used to have this person lower, now I have them higher than Parvati, and that person is Amanda Kimmel from Survivor Micronesia. And Amanda's game is a bit tough here in a sense that I think there's obviously the argument that she played a dominant game on Micronesia in the sense that she was part of the Black Widow Brigade that ran the show, and she was technically in the majority for a lot of the season. But again, I do think there are some major qualms here, particularly in the fact that, one, she obviously needed an idol at Final 6, where, again, that was a spot where, again, no one knew she had an idol outside of Parvati. And in that spot, we do see Cirie essentially just fold instantly and decide to vote her out, which, again, I think really shows, like, her placement in the totem pole. The fact that she was on the bottom of the Black Widow Brigade the entire time, and, again, needed an idol there. I think that's a major negative. But also, I do think the major negative here is the Ozzy vote, which, again, on the show, we are shown to see that Amanda's on the outs during the Ozzy vote. She was blindsided during that vote. However, there are stories after the fact that, again, supposedly she was in on the vote and actually was the one leading the charge in the vote. Either way, I actually think this is bad. Or, again, it's either she got blindsided during the Ozzy vote, which I think is, again, bad, because, again, she's shown to be on the outs there. But also, even if she did do it, I think it's also bad because she then proceeds to be on the bottom of her alliance because she takes out one of her closest numbers for the sake of that alliance. Where, again, I think no matter what, Ozzy going out in the game at that point is bad for her game. But again, outside of those situations, she's a player that is largely safe throughout a lot of the game. Obviously, early on, she's in the majority. She swaps into a majority. Never really faces any true adversity during those positions in the game. Though, again, I do think a big question mark with Amanda is simply win equity, where we'll always see her get 3 votes against Parvati, and again, a 5-3 vote. It's also kind of a struggle to see Amanda winning the game, where, again, I think she loses to both Parvati and Cirie in the final 2. Even in her planned final 3 with Parvati and Cirie, I think she's the least likely to win of those 3. Also, just in general, the over-jury perception of her was one where, again, she really did not really take the time to bond with people outside of her core group, and was just looked at as this doe-eyed figure. And Amanda is a player here that, again, if she did not need the idol at Final 6 and was actually involved in the Ozzy vote, I think at that point, she's a top tier runner up. Again, one that came extremely close to winning the game. Again, was a vote away from a tie. Again, I think that would have been a very impressive game at that point. But again, the fact that again we see her be either blindsided by the Aussie vote or lead the charge on the Aussie vote, both of which lean to her being on the bottom of her own alliance, and then proceed to need an idol through Final 6, which, to be fair, is only necessary because Eric wins immunity, but still. And again, in comparison to Parvati, I do feel like she was, again, more stably in the majority for more of the season. They're all both needed, like, idols at points to navigate through the game. I do feel like Amanda's path was a little bit cleaner, and because of that, for me, she's here at number 22. Number 21, now we're moving on to a player that I also think is probably a bit overrated by the general community. Another one of these placements that was very controversial on my original list, and to be fair, they are higher than what they were on my original list. Still probably not high enough for some people, but again, I think this person's game is, again, a massive mixed bag. That person is Chrissy Hoffbeck from Survivor HHH. And Chrissy's this player that I think definitely had a lot of influence at points in the game. I mean, I think she had a lot of influence early on in the game. I think she had a lot of influence at the end of the game. The problem is kind of the middle stretch of the game where, again, on the original Heroes tribe, again, she's seemingly on the bottom initially, but she does eventually build a strong bond with Ben and Alan, and again, is in the majority if they were to ever go to Tribal again. At the swap, she could have potentially been in danger, but again, we do have Ryan giving her the idol from the offset that cultivated that bond between them two, and again, she ends up running that pre-merge tribe alongside Ryan, and once we get to the merge, again, she's in the majority, where again, the heroes and the hustlers come together. By the time the final 9, I feel like her game just kind of crumbles for a bit. It's a spot where, again, she is outplayed by the likes of Ben and Devin and Lauren and Ashley, to where they end up completely flipping the script on them, blindsides Chrissy in that spot, to where she's pretty much a dead man walking at Final 8 had she not won immunity, though she does, which good for her, but also, again, it's a knock on this ranking, the fact that she needed immunity during that round. But I do think she's, again, able to recover pretty well eventually. Again, she's still on the outside in the Final 8 round, and again, her jury management with Joe is very questionable. And just in general, Chrissy's jury management is very questionable, where that's kind of an understated aspect of Chrissy's game is the fact that, again, I don't know if she can win a jury vote, where a lot of people talk about how Chrissy was robbed and that she should have beat Ben, when reality is, I don't think she wins anyway. And even if she got to the ideal Final 3, I think it's more likely to be either Devin or Ryan that win over Chrissy. Where we see a lot of the healers were very anti-Chrissy on the jury. Again, we already know, like, Ben himself has said that he would have voted for Ryan. We have Devin having closer connections to the likes of Lauren and Ashley, to where, again, I don't think Chrissy's winning this game anyway, largely due to the fact that I think she does mismanage the jury pretty poorly across it. But again, she ends up winning a lot of challenges, and to be fair, she didn't need a lot of those towards the end game, so at least there's something there. But again, she's able to pick up the pieces by the time of the Final 7, and by the time of the Final 6 especially, she's able to essentially run the show. At that point, her, Ryan, and Devin are the majority, and they're running those last few votes, with obviously them being a bit unfortunate how things are playing out with Ben having idol after idol after idol, only for her to ultimately, again, be screwed over by the forced fire making. Though, again, my argument would be the fact that I don't think she was the one screwed over by the forced fire making. But still, I do think Chrissy's this player that, I think a lot of people really overhype Chrissy, specifically thinking that she would have won had not been for forced fire. But again, I don't think that's the case. But again, I think she's perfectly in line with this semi-dominant tier. Again, the person who had a lot of influence early on, a lot of influence towards the end of the game. But again, I do think her middle game is very rocky, especially with her needing to win immunity at one specific spot, which again, I think keeps her in line with someone like an Amanda. Again, I think them being back-to-back feels pretty apt here. So again, I went with Chrissy here at number 21. Now number 20, and now we're moving on to Chrissy's game, but slightly better for my eyes. That person is Ryan Ulrich from Survivor HHH, where, again, I don't think Ryan's game is that different from Chrissy's. I think they play pretty much the same game. Now, I will say, I think Ryan has a cleaner start. Now, again, I think they both were in pretty decent positions on their original tribe, and we do see Ryan be tested more, where we see him go to more tribals, and where it did seem like him, Devin, and Allie were really running the show. And I was like, a pro for Chrissy is that after the swap, we do see Ryan flipping over to Chrissy in a spot where I do question if that was the right play for Ryan in particular, though, considering he had already given her the idol previously. Again, that is obviously something that makes it a bit wonky, but again, they end up essentially running that tribe together at the merge. Again, they're working together as again, the heroes and the hustlers work together, but again, they're also blindsided together by the time of the Final 9. Ryan ends up incorrectly playing his idol at 8, and again, I think that's a bad look there as well. But again, once again, Ryan and Chrissy get back in the numbers following that. Now, I will say, I do think Ryan is someone that did seem to lose steam towards the end, where I feel like Chrissy is someone that was seemingly more actively gaming towards the end game, or it seemed like Ryan kind of fell back into the shadows. And I don't know if that's just because he was kind of depleted while out there or what, but it did seem like he didn't have as much gusto during those last few rounds. But even then, like, he's headed towards a pretty good end game for him in a spot where, again, he is getting deep with Chrissy, getting deep with Devin. Ben, who he also had a very close relationship early on. And even Ben getting towards the end game is actually not entirely bad for Ryan, considering Ben and Ryan were actually pretty close as well, even though obviously, again, you needed to get Ben out at some point. And he ends up having a pretty clean end game stretch where, again, he's never in danger from that point on. Mind you, again, you could argue the fact that obviously that was because people did not look at him as a threat. Though despite that, again, it does seem like he does get votes if he had gotten to his ideal final three. Obviously, in the real life final three, the only vote he gets is Devin's. But again, if it was a Devin, Ryan, Chrissy final three, we do know that Ben would have voted for him. Joe implied at the time that he would have voted for him, even though, again, he's changed his mind since then. Which, again, I would put more faith into what he said immediately after the season, more so what he said years after the season, him saying now that he would vote for Chrissy, even though he originally said he would vote for Ryan. But again, that's another potential vote there. And if he's able to make an effective pitch that I got to the end against the two people that I was the closest to through the game, again, I think that can be an effective pitch. Now, again, at the end of the day, I think Devin is still probably the front runner there, but I don't think it's this clear-cut case. And I do think Ryan, again, almost got to a pretty optimal final three situation for him. Though, again, realistically, again, his game is nearly as flawed as Chrissy. Again, it is essentially the same game, just not needing an immunity win along the way. But again, I think Ryan had a sliver more win equity, where I think it's more likely that Ryan pulls off the votes in that ideal final three than Chrissy does. So I think considering all those things, so while I do think Ryan, again, kind of peters out towards the end, I feel like the fact that I have more faith in him potentially winning at the tail end there is enough to put him here at number 20. At number 19, we're moving on to a player that this placement here is a switch up from the last time I did this list, where this player and next person I'll be talking about were, again, the opposite. Yet now, at 19, I do have Spencer Bledsoe from Survivor Cambodia. And Spencer's game here is one that is obviously very turbulent, as, again, anybody on Cambodia's game is. I think Cambodia is obviously a season that very rarely had a solid through line throughout the entirety of it, to where, again, Spencer's game's just all over the place. Again, he is part of the group that controls the Vetus vote, though is then proceeds to be on the outside of the Shireen vote. He then gets swapped to a spot where he's on the bottom and is kind of aloof to what's going on there, even though he does build some good bonds with the likes of Fishback and Jeremy, though there was obviously some pregame involved in that. He then gets swapped in another bad position where he's almost voted out of the game. That is until, obviously, Cass and Sierra decide to make this big move. They end up being saved by, and straight up, again, that first half of the game is pretty bad. Mind you, it's not him being saved by immunity wins or idols in the way that, again, it was with the likes of Poverty, but it's still, again, not ideal. But I do think the back half of the season is pretty strong. Again, he plays this pretty decent, like, floater game for the early stretch of it. Again, him being kind of in the middle. And again, while he's not really enacting many plans during the early merge phase, he is a pretty major swing vote in where things are going. Again, where he ends up siding with Bayon initially, and then ends up siding with Steven and Jeremy and flipping against Kelly Wigglesworth. And then he leads this charge against Steven that was going to go through until Jeremy plays the idol to save him. But he did get the majority to get on board with that plan and proceeds to do the same thing again at Final 9, which I also think is very impressive. And following that, he ends up also finding himself in a new majority alliance that essentially ends up running the show, where, again, he has a Final 3 of Jeremy and Tasha that actually gets to the end. Now, again, the qualm is the fact that obviously he doesn't win that scenario, and he can't win that scenario. Again, Jeremy just handily beats him, but Spencer also was considering that fact as well. And I do think Spencer gets pretty unfortunate how endgame competitions played out, where, again, his plan was always to cut Jeremy. He just never had the opportunity to cut Jeremy. Where it seemed like Spencer was aware of the fact that Jeremy and Wentworth were these bigger threats that he needed to get out. It's just that he didn't have the opportunity to do so. And obviously, I think in retrospect, he probably should have attempted to take out Jeremy at 5 and then take out Wentworth at 4. But again, I do think he had a pretty difficult endgame path to get to any scenario. But I do think he theoretically can win. Again, in a Tasha, Spencer, Keith, or Tasha, Spencer, Abby final 3s, I think he at least gets votes in those spots. Though he's definitely someone that could theoretically win the game in those positions, but again, was just kind of far out from making those spots. And to be fair, again, he was one of this big proponent of wanting Abby out because she was this person taking up a spot in the final 3, though I think unbeknownst to him is that he kind of needed Abby as this person that he could be, as he couldn't really beat many other people. But again, I think he plays like the final 6 round very well, where he's aware of the fact that Kimmy is flipping and is able to get Jeremy on board with that. He stays in the majority that entire endgame stretch. And again, I think the back portion of the season is pretty strong. And the only time he doesn't really get his way in the back portion of the season are when idols are in play. So again, I think he actually plays a pretty solid game by the end, but I do think, again, that rocky stretch at the beginning is something that really harms him on this ranking, where, again, I can't put him in the top tier of the list, but I think, again, being in the semi-dominant tier makes a lot of sense here. So again, he's here at number 19. Now, number 18, moving on to a very similar style player, though someone that, again, was not on the outs for as long, while also somebody that kind of gets screwed by twists to a degree. So again, I swapped these positions from my last list, and at 18, I do have Gavin from from Survivor Edge of Extinction. And again, I know I used to be very low on Gavin. I used to look at Gavin as just a very passive player and was just generally annoyed with him and how he played. And to be fair, thinking of him as a pretty passive player has not really changed. Again, I think he is. I think he is a player that finds himself in a majority and then kind of just goes along with what other people want. I feel like he very rarely exerts his will in the game. And while again, I don't think that's necessarily a fundamental issue, I think what is an issue is that I do think the moves that he ends up doing under the guidance of other people are, again, not necessarily in his best interest. I think he takes out people that do want to work with him in spots where I don't think it was the right call. Again, him like flipping against Eric, I think was kind of a dumb move. Him flipping against Ron when he did, I don't know was necessary. He obviously flips against Victoria, though to be fair, I think that one was probably the right call. But even in all those positions, at least to us, the viewer, how it's portrayed on the show, it doesn't really seem like Gavin has that gumption to really allow those votes to go through. It's more so, again, the likes of, again, Victoria or Lauren or some of these other players in the game that are kind of getting him on board with those plans. But again, something to give Gavin a lot of credit for is that it's very impressive that he's even in those positions to begin with, where again, it kind of is similar to like the Stephanie position from earlier. Again, a person that's like in a dominant position, but doesn't really utilize their dominance in their best interests. And I think, again, that is a little issue with Gavin. Now, straight up, again, Gavin plays a better game than Stephanie, and I think does play more optimally throughout more of the game than Stephanie. But again, I think that is definitely something to call out there. But again, like the other players in semi-dominant tier here, again, he is in and out of the majority at points. Again, the entire post-merge phase of Edge of Extinction is very rocky, and Julia goes home in a spot where he doesn't want her to. He's blindsided at the Kelly Wentworth vote. That's pretty bad. But I mean, like, considering the cast of Edge of Extinction, like, he's actually probably the most stable player on that season. And he's someone that, again, I do think he gets pretty screwed by the Edge of Extinction. Now, again, everyone knew about Edge of Extinction, but like, it's still a spot where, again, had a season not had Edge of Extinction, like almost every other season of Survivor, Gavin is a very likely winner. Where while Victoria was someone that was a bigger jury threat than her, again, he always planned on cutting Victoria. His planned final three was Julia and Lauren, a spot where, again, I think he's very likely to win. Where obviously it's between him and Lauren. And by the way the jury talks, I do think it leans Gavin, where, again, I think he's someone that had a winning scenario right in front of him and simply just was not able to go to that scenario because Rick Devens and Chris Underwood were still in the game. But again, I do think Gavin is a pretty solid runner-up here. Again, as much as I, again, was annoyed at his game at the time of Edge of Extinction, I do feel like he actually plays a pretty competent game. It's just one that I just wish he, again, had a bit more influence in how things actually played out. But again, he still was in a very impressive position for a lot of the game, especially being even more impressive considering the fact that this is Edge of Extinction, a season that was so turbulent. Yet he was in the majority for most of it, to where, again, I think that is very impressive, and that's why he's here at number 8. Now number 17, and moving on to a player that I am kind of surprised at this high, considering I remember I always assessed this person immediately after the season as someone that was like, again, closer to like the Brad Culpepper sort of mold. But I think as time goes on, I think my opinion of their game goes up slightly, but also I find it very tough to distinguish how good their game actually is, where I feel like this is someone that was very much teetering on the edge of, again, dominant and semi-dominant, which is particularly tough to say here because this is a person that was actually in the majority for pretty much the entire season, though I did ultimately decide to put him at the top of the semi-dominant tier here. I do have Mike Turner from Survivor 42. And Mike is someone that never really dinged on me as someone that was playing a dominant game. Then when actually like looking through his game, he is actually in the majority for pretty much the entire season. Now, again, I will definitely criticize some of the decisions that he makes. I think he definitely makes certain moves that don't really make sense for his game. I think there are times where he's manipulated by others, particularly Omer. And again, I think that is obviously bad. But in terms of like how much influence he had in the game, he was in a pretty decent position for really the entire game. Again, really on the offset, he's in the majority. He has an alliance with Jenny. He has an alliance with Daniel and Chanel. And again, they were the true core alliance that, again, gets very unfortunate in the fact that him and Chanel end up losing their votes. And we had that crazy tri-board where everything blows up. But again, he was primed to be in a very solid position coming to the merge, only for that to crumble, do things that, again, I don't think he does that much wrong outside of, again, I guess, finding an idol. But beyond that, again, I do feel like, but again, he does good work following that. Again, despite the fact that he was anti-Lydia and Hai during that round, he then actually ends up working with them immediately afterward and becomes very close to Hai. They're already working a lockstep for a little while. He also, again, leads the charge against Daniel. Now, I will say, again, this is part of the issue of Mike's game and the fact that I don't feel like a lot of his game is very strategic. It feels like a lot of his game is just kind of emotional in the sense is that once someone breaks trust with him, he just feels like he instantly has to get them out. And again, I think that is an issue in the sense that I think he ends up making some plays that are not fully optimal for him because of that, particularly later in the game. But again, we get to the merge where, again, I think he does good work there. Again, builds a lot of strong bonds with the likes of Drea, Jonathan, ends up being part of this like mega alliance. Also ends up like trying to start this like men's alliance with Roxroy, and again, it doesn't come through. But again, I do think he actually does some very good work early on in the merge to remain in a majority as, again, they vote out Lydia. Now, again, I will say during that portion of the game, I would not say he is a dominant figure in the game. I would say, again, the likes of Omer is someone in particular that I would say is like more so controlling how the game is maneuvering, but he is still somebody that, again, has a lot of influence in the game and has a lot of connections in the game. But again, we do see the likes of like Hai and Omer getting their way at the Roxroy vote, and we see Omer goading him into taking out Hai, which, again, I think that is probably the big questionable move of his game, and the fact that, again, I think it is purely a suboptimal move. I don't think it is a good move for his game. I think it is one that just makes him look gullible, and the fact that he essentially targets Hai simply because Omer told him that Hai looked at him as a puppet, which, again, just fully looks like an emotional move. But I do think actually beyond that, I think his game is actually becoming pretty strong, and he's able to counter Drea's knowledge without power pretty effectively and take her out when she was targeting him. And then him and Jonathan actually are the ones that orchestrate the Omer vote until they back out at the last second under the worry about Lindsay's idol, only for then Marianne to end up following through with the move simply because she knows that she has a backup. But again, I will give Mike credit for at least doing the initial setup for that move, and beyond that, he also leads a charge in getting Lindsay out and gets to an endgame stretch where he is looked at as the front runner to win the game at that point. Again, he is someone that everyone looked at as a threat, and despite that, I do think Jonathan is still someone that would have been very willing to go to the end with him. But obviously, like, the big issue with his game at Final Tribal is that he, again, doesn't really own his game. He instead tries to preach about honesty and ends up losing him all these jury votes that he potentially had coming into it, where, again, we saw the jury even say themselves that it probably was going to be a tie coming into Final Tribal, and Mike essentially lost their votes through Final Tribal, which, again, is a negative for sure. But I still think it's a spot where, again, Mike is relatively close to winning the game there, where, again, had he been able to get Marianne out at 4, which, to be fair, isn't that improbable if him or Jonathan win immunity. Mike probably goes on to win the game, like easily being Romeo and Jonathan, and Mike's game is one where, again, I think there is a lot of win equity there. I think he beats a lot of people on the board, while also is one that, again, was in a solid majority position for a lot of the game. I think the question obviously comes from how he was using that influence in the game, and for me, again, I do feel like the big detractor from his game is simply the fact that I do feel like a lot of the decisions he makes were either emotional decisions or decisions that he was kind of goaded into doing so that aren't in his best interest, but where, again, I think there are probably more dominant figures on that season, particularly someone like an Omer. But I do think Mike's game, again, is still solid enough, but also flawed enough to still have him here at number 17. Now, number 16. Now we're moving on to the top tier of the list. Again, these players I would consider dominant for the most part. People that were in the majority for most of the game. People that had influence in the game. Though we are starting it off with the first sub-tier here of people that still have a bit of an asterisk next to them. And we're starting it off with a person that, again, is typically on the bottom of my top tier. Again, has been for the previous times I've done this ranking. And that person is Aubrey Bracco from Survivor Co. Wrong. And again, I think Aubrey's just, again, another player that's so tough to assess because there obviously is a very impressive stretch of her game. Again, really from the Nick vote on, I think Aubrey plays a very impressive game. One that is definitely on par with some of the better runners-up of all time. The issue is a lot of her game before that. Mind you, again, early on, again, she has this meltdown. I'm not really knocking that against her, but after that, again, she's able to recover pretty well. She's in the majority when Liz goes home, and is technically in the majority after the swap as well, though that was kind of handed to her. But even then, I feel like she kind of misplays the Peter vote, which ends up lessening people's opinions of her. And then we get to the merge where she's just outright in danger, potentially goes if Neil doesn't get medevac. And again, for me, I do think that's a pretty major knock against her game, especially, again, amongst the best of the best, again, in comparison to these more dominant runners-up that didn't really have these major danger points in the game. I think Aubrey is someone that, again, having that spot where she potentially goes home had the merge vote not been canceled, I think is something to definitely call out here. But beyond that, again, her game is pretty good. I mean, again, she ends up reforming a majority and takes out Nick. She then ends up forming the Debbie blindside plan, which, while it burns her jury vote from Debbie, I think it is a very impressive play there to counter an idol. And then I think the creme de la creme of her game is, again, pulling over Ty to take out Scott Pollard, which, again, very impressive play there, along with also pulling in Ty, who ends up being third in her alliance, which, to be fair, I don't know if that's even necessarily better for her. I think it would have been better off, actually, if she'd taken Sydney to the end over Ty, but still, I think very impressive play there. And she's really just, again, running the show from that point on in the majority as they take out each of the next few targets. And obviously gets very unlucky at the very end with the Joe medevac, where that was a spot where, again, that allows Michelle to stay, or Michelle ends up winning out and ends up beating her at the end. Where again, I do fault Aubrey for like how she managed her perception at points in the game that led to her jury loss, but even though, again, certain jury rationales were definitely a bit irrational. But still, it's a spot where, again, obviously getting against Michelle is something that was purely unlucky. The fact that she loses her number one ally with him getting Medical from the game. I don't know if Aubrey necessarily wins even with Joe there. Now, again, it definitely is obviously way more likely. As again, either way, she gets to the end. And I think she probably gets to the end against, again, Joe and Ty in that spot. And again, I think it's very likely that Ty could beat her even in that position where I believe the like Bronze plus Julia would have been more likely to vote for Ty. Even Joe might get like Debbie's vote in that spot. I think you could never really know where Sydney's going considering her own weird rationale for ultimate jury vote. I think some people will think that like Aubrey clearly has the votes there where like I don't know if that's necessarily the case. And again, I think Aubrey still ends up playing a pretty impressive game. But again, the reason why she has to be this low on the list for me is just because, again, I think there is that pretty big danger spot for her that she kind of gets lucked out of at the time to merge, while also I'm not even entirely sure she ends up winning, even if she isn't like kind of screwed over by the Joe medevac. Again, I do feel like Aubrey plays a pretty dominant game on this season, but one that again does have these glaring issues that make it tough to put her above these other dominant runners up of the game. So again, because of that, for me, she's here at number 16. Now number 15, moving on to, again, another very flawed, dominant player of the game. Someone that, again, I think his end game stretch is very good. I think the beginning of his game is also very good. The issue is the middle. Again, definitely some rockiness there, but even then, it was mostly because he came into merge down in numbers. But still, at 16, we do have Russell Hantz, this time from Survivor Samoa. And again, Russell's Samoa game is kind of strange in the sense that I actually think Russell plays a more stable game and probably in his own best interest for more of Samoa than he does for Heroes Villains, despite the fact that obviously his Heroes Villains run is higher on the list. But again, that's largely because I think his Heroes Villains run hasn't been pretty solidly at the top for most of that season. Samoa is a spot where, obviously, again, like early on, he does seemingly take control of his tribe. Now, technically, again, he does lose out on like the Benvo, and I don't think he had as much influence as the show tries to portray it. But again, he was definitely in a good position, easily skates through the pre-merge of the game, despite going to so many tribals, which I do think is impressive. And once he's able to take control back after the merge, again, it's a pretty smooth ride from that point forward, where again, he faces the adversity of having Brett win out. But outside of that, again, he is pretty solidly getting to the end without any real difficulty. Again, the issue for me is the middle stretch, where obviously we do see him, again, being down in numbers because Fofo only has 4, Tagaloo's 8. Again, obviously that is something I'm not necessarily docking from him. What I am docking from him, though, is how he plays those rounds. Again, the Eric Cardona boot is one where he's just kind of aloof at what's happening and even like wastes his idol in that spot where felt pretty clear he wasn't getting votes there. And also, again, following vote, he does need his idol. Mind you, again, I'll give him a little bit more grace there. In that position, again, Russell wanted the votes on him, and it was also a spot where Shambo was telling him where to play the idol, and also Shambo was going to flip, and he likely would have won out had Laura not won immunity, but again, that stopped that plan, where again, I think there are at least some graces to be given to that, but again, it's still a spot where he does need an idol to survive that round, but again, following that, I think he does very good work at the final 10, again, pulling over Shambo, pulling on John Fincher, and again, he ends up pretty much running the game from that point on. Obviously, the big issue is win equity, where again, Russell is someone that, obviously, again, I don't think can win the game in most situations. I mean, I do think, again, if there was the Shambo, Jason final 3, there's at least a shot. But again, I think he loses against Natalie. I think he probably loses against Mick. He obviously loses against Brett, and I think he loses to most other people on the season. And again, I think that is obviously a major negative here. But I do think when he controlled the game pretty well, and again, had that very impressive play at the final 10. Again, did a lot of good work even when he was on the bottom, to where, again, I do find it like a little bit tough to assess his game here. But again, I do feel like he is a largely dominant player, especially at the points where, again, he's not unfortunate the fact that he comes into merge down in numbers, but even then he does a lot of good work to recover from that. After a while, again, I do definitely qualm with the fact that you need that idol in that one specific round. I do feel like outside that his game is pretty solid, even though he had, again, kind of lackluster win equity, which all that together for me puts him here at number 15. Now number 14, we're going from Russell Hantz to Russell Hantz, and we have Russell Hantz from Survivor Heroes versus Villains. And again, this is a bit of a tougher ranking because I think Russell's game in Heroes versus Villains is a spot where, again, I think he does more actively wrong, especially from a jury management perspective, where, again, I think it makes a lot of sense why by the end of Heroes versus Villains, he loses a jury vote because he openly antagonizes a good chunk of the jury. But that being said, I do feel like his navigation through the game here is a little bit cleaner, where while he obviously utilized idols to his benefit, he very rarely needs an idol himself. Like, will definitely say that I think his beginning of his game on the Villains Tribe is a bit questionable in the fact that he kind of isolates himself from the Rob side of things, mainly just due to the fact that he seemingly had a crush on Parvati and also him having a massive ego. And he's able to actually take that spot and do pretty well with it. Now, I will say at the end of the day, I do look at the Tyson vote as still a pretty luck-based circumstance. While again, he does have an idol and he ends up using it effectively to save Parvati and snipe Tyson out of the game, it is a position where it's not like he manipulated Tyson into doing that. I mean, Tyson more so just did that on his own. And again, I think you give Russell credit for having Tyson think that he could pick up Russell as a number, but I don't think this is like this deliberate play from Russell that he spent the entire time getting close to Tyson, knowing that they were going to split the vote and that Tyson would switch his vote. And again, all that, again, I don't think is actually what he thought was going to happen, where again, like I feel pretty confidently about what he thought was going to happen is that he was potentially going home when playing the idol on Parvati, where again, I think this was a spot where Russell did not really seem that invested in the game early on. He was kind of okay with going home, had the plan failed. Still, I do think after that, again, he does very good work. Again, similar work to what he did with John Fincher and Shambo. He ends up pulling over, again, Jerry and Coach, flips them against Boston Rob. I think that's all very good play. Again, I think his targeting of Coach is something that a bit questionable considering all these promises he had with him. And again, him also trying to like feign like he wasn't in on it by like not voting for Coach. Again, all that, not great. But I do think actually getting rid of Coach at that point isn't a very interesting move, as again, it plays into this idea that heroes think that there's this all women's alliance. And again, Russell ends up using that very effectively. Now, again, I don't think he could have predicted how well it worked out for him, but I do think that is something that, again, ends up being very effective for him. And the fact that JT proceeds to give him his idol, which is, again, just pure insanity, which, again, I would still say that's more so on JT than anything Russell actually does. But again, still kind of an insane thing he does. And then Russell's able to really implant himself within the heroes at the merge very effectively. The problem is that he also ends up getting close to them just to take them out of the game, and a spot where, again, he is the person that they fully blame for their downfall, which, again, just further burns his jury chances. But again, his navigation through the game from that point on is that he's essentially the sole decision maker from that point on. Now, again, you could definitely argue that he is a power goat, as he essentially is. I mean, that is what Russell is at that point. Again, he is someone that no one really thinks that he can win the game, and no one like tries to take him out because of that, but they do know how much influence he has in the game, and through that try to work alongside him because of that. And again, it is this weird dynamic there to where, again, I think you could definitely argue Russell should be lower simply just due to the fact that he simply cannot win the game, though, again, we still have a few more people that probably couldn't win the game, though, again, we still have at least one other person that we're about to talk about that simply could not win the game either. And considering how Russell, like, again, seemingly did control the back portion of the season, I still think that is something you have to credit him for, especially when, again, he had a pretty solid run early on as well. Again, I think he really ends up essentially dominating the game from the Tyson vote on, and again, in the post-merge, we see him do moves independently. Again, I will say, again, I do question Amanda vote off round, where that's one where he's seemingly aloof at what's going on, and obviously, again, the Candace vote is one where he is in the majority, though the minority ends up outplaying the majority there for a bit, but still, again, he ends up leading the charge and taking out Danielle, which, again, I definitely have things to say about his motives over that, but I do think it is still a move that shows him picking up the outsiders and convincing Jerry over, and again, it does show him having a lot of influence in that spot, and then he proceeds to, again, remain in the majority as Rupert and Colby end up going home, and he ultimately has the final decision when Jerry goes home as well, which, again, question mark if he should take out Jerry, though to fair, it doesn't really matter, he's losing anyway, but still, it's like overall, like, I think Russell's just this player that, again, had a lot of influence in the game for the majority of the game, and through that, again, I think someone that has that much influence on how the game plays out should be this high on the list. The thing is, though, is that at the end of the day, again, he simply could not win the jury vote, especially when some of the maneuvers he pulls off here are extremely impressive. But for me, that is the big difference between Russell and someone like a Sugar, who's dropped off a bit earlier in the list, is that I feel like with Sugar, it felt like more so her just like kind of falling into these swing positions, and that's how she kind of dictated the game. Russell is someone that I do think does a lot of really strong active work to control the votes in the game. And while, again, I think there are other flaws in his game for sure, I think that aspect of his game is something that I do at least respect from Russell. And again, I think at the end of the day, I don't think you could put him much higher on this list simply just due to complete lack of win equity, and again, also that kind of rocky-ish beginning stretch of the game. But I think everything outside of that is, again, pretty strong from a pure navigational standpoint, to where at the end of the day, I do have him here at number 14. Now number 13, and here we're moving on to what was probably one of the toughest placements on this list for me to really hone down of where this person should land, where I really did debate a lot between, is this person a dominant player or a semi-dominant player, and even once I wrapped up the debate, there's a lot of debate on how high he goes into the dominant tier, to where, again, I had a lot of question marks on where to land this person. Where again, this is another person that, again, that was again towards the top of their power structure for a lot of the game. And even when things unravel for them, they still are able to recover. But at the same time, like Russell, they had so little win equity. But ultimately, at number 13, I am going to go with Sash from Survivor Nicaragua. And again, Sash is just very tough to place here. I think he's a player that I have a tough time wrapping my head around the concept of him being a dominant player. As again, I don't really look at him as a person that was like controlling a lot of what was happening in the game, but realistically, kind of was. Again, he was in the majority, especially early on. He's at the top of that pecking order alongside Brenda, where, again, they were kind of running their original tribes. And again, he ends up organizing this group, kind of organizing all the stragglers. And while, again, I would give Brenda more credit for, like, pulling in Chase, again, I do think he does some pretty good work there. And Swap, he still has the numbers, is able to get, like, Marty to give him an idol. And again, that's all pretty good play as well. I do think an issue, Sash, and this is probably more so from a player perspective, but the fact that, again, he comes off very smarmy. And yeah, I think some people don't really gel with that. Also, the fact that I don't think he manages his threat level well coming into the merge, where, again, kind of an underreported story that led to the Brenda boot is the fact that, like, Brenda was coming for Sash during that round. Again, Sash's number one ally decides to flip on him at pretty much the very beginning of the merge, which I do think is pretty damning there for me. Again, I think that's a spot where, yeah, he ends up getting Brenda out, but I think that does show a lot of failure in his, like, management of his relationships and his overall threat management as well to have that happen in that spot. But again, he's able to recover pretty well. Mind you, again, the double quit happens, and again, it's an unlucky circumstance in the sense that he does lose out on 2 allies at that point, but it's also fortunate in the fact that he gets through 2 rounds, and also beyond that ends up now being in the swing position, which at the end of the day, I do think him losing Kelly and Nayanka ends up being kind of a wash there. But again, from that point on, he's in the majority solidly until the end in a final 3 alliance with Holly and Chase, only for Fabio to end up upending that. But it's still a spot where, again, Sash, but it's still a spot where, again, I don't think Sash was going to win the game even in that natural final 3. And again, I think Sash's game for me is just like a very weird one to dissect because, again, he is technically in the majority for a lot of the game. Really, that's the main highlight of his game, is that for the first like 60% of the game, again, he's pretty much on the top of the power structure and having a lot to say on how votes play out. Though I do think that while he gets knocked out of that position for a short little while, he's able to then get back into a majority alliance towards the back portion, though even then I would question like how much influence he necessarily had in those last few votes. But Sash, again, does have some pretty impressive navigation through the game. But again, ultimately, my big debate with Sash here was simply, again, is he dominant? Is he semi-dominant? What exactly is he? And I really did not know where to land him. But ultimately, again, I do think at the end of the day, he was in the majority for most of the season. And even when, again, Brenda comes after him, he's still able to succeed through that. And beyond that, again, is able to recover beyond that, even though, again, there were some wonky circumstances there. But again, the biggest qualm is win equity, but that's really the qualm with, again, Russell, who we just talked about, and the next person we're going to be talking about as well. So I still do look at him as a pretty influential player in the game, to where while I do find it very tough to necessarily say he's a dominant player, I feel like he does fit in line with the players around this grouping here. So again, for me, he's here number 13. Now number 12. We're moving on to essentially the last person on this list that I think has pretty much no win equity, where from this point on, again, these are all players that remain in the majority, had influence in the game, and were people that could theoretically win in certain scenarios. However, this person is the last person that I don't think can be a single person on this cast. And that is a major thing that knocks them down, even though I think their game, especially in retrospect when I rewatched their season not that long ago, is pretty strong in terms of, again, a navigational standpoint. That person is Twyla from Survivor Vanuatu. And again, Twyla is this player that I think, despite the fact that she is so abrasive and confrontational, she somehow plays a pretty stable game throughout the entire season, where, again, it's kind of insane when you look at like just how many fights she gets in and how mean-spirited she comes off during those fights. Yet despite that, she's in the majority the entire time, to where, again, she's in the majority, again, that's a little bit of a question mark, but on the original women's tribe, where, again, the older women technically don't have the numbers, but they're able to pull in Eliza for that first vote to take out Dolly, and again, it works out for them, and they maintain the numbers following that. But again, Twyla's in a decent position within that alliance. Again, has Scout as her solid number 1. The likes of Amy and Leanne plan on taking Twyla further into the game than Scout. So again, I think Twyla actually is pretty decently positioned within that group. We then get this swap where she's swap screwed essentially. Again, she swapped away from her allies, only alongside Julie, someone that she has no connective tissue with. And despite that, she actually comes out of that in a pretty good position. She somehow ends up integrating herself within the men, to where they take out John Kenny over her, and she's, again, part of the group more so than Julie. Again, Sarge wants to take Twyla towards the end of the game. Chris makes a final 2 with Twyla at that point. And again, Twyla ends up playing the swap there pretty well. While we get to the merge, where, again, she flips on the men. Again, I think it is a questionable move. I think she probably in retrospect should have gotten Scout to flip over and maybe tried to play a bit more dynamic of a game from earlier on. But again, she ends up flipping on the men, again, completely burns their jury votes. And I think the issue that comes from how Twyla ends up playing the game is that she essentially burns all of her jury votes along the way, where again, she's very confrontational towards people that inherently won't get her jury votes, from the likes of Eliza in particular. But then also, again, she flips against the men, and through that, very unlikely to get their jury votes. And then she also orchestrates the next flip in the game, which again, very impressive move in taking out Leanne. Again, picking up Chris as a number, getting Chris to pick up Eliza. Again, a very impressive move there. The problem is that, again, it has her flipping against the women to where now the women aren't likely to vote for her. And through that, again, she just completely saps all of her potential win equity through those moves. But I think, again, just in terms of straight navigation through the game, I think she navigates through a game pretty cleanly, where again, there's never really a point where she's in any true danger. So again, she always had Chris and Scout on her side, where again, both which were going to take her to the end. She got them to the final 3. The problem again is that I think at most she gets 2 to 3 maybe votes. I just simply don't think there's a winning scenario. But again, I do think her navigation through the game is very solid. Again, it's one where she's actually more stably in the majority than, again, some of the people that we're going to be talking about pretty soon, where I think even some of the people that are later in the list have, again, at least a blemish along the way, where they were blindsided by 1 vote. Again, Twyla was someone that was in the know for pretty much the entire game. And again, that's something I do want to give her credit for, but at the end of the day, I think her complete lack of win equity, and considering how much of it is on her as well, I do still end up having to land her here, number 12. Now, number 11, now we're moving on to this next sub-tier of the list here. Moving on to players that I think you could argue are second command players that were a part of a powerful duo in the game, where I think you could argue that the other player in their duo was the dominant player, while this person is, again, more of a second command. But I do think these people had enough influence and enough win equity to deem them as, again, above those in the second command tier. And with that, at number 11, we're going to be starting this off with one that I used to actually have in that second command tier, though since then I've given a lot more credit to her game, and that person is Dawn Meehan from Survivor Caramoan. And again, Dawn is a player here that, again, obviously is aligned with Cochran. She is running the game alongside Cochran. She is in the majority for the entire game, never really blindsided outside, I guess you can say, the Philip vote off, but and even then, again, she's in the majority, to where, again, Dawn is someone that has a pretty solid game from beginning to end. And I think the bigger questions just stem from the fact that, again, is she running the game alongside Cochran, or is she more so the beta to Cochran? And I do feel like I lean towards more so her working actively alongside him, where I think it's a position where I do definitely knock points from Dawn, in the sense that Cochran gets his way a lot in the end game, where Cochran is the ones who want to take out Brenda, and Dawn ends up doing so despite it not being in her best interest. And I think that is a major point that, again, I give to Cochran over Dawn. But I think when looking at the game outside that, I think Dawn is also playing in her best interest for most of the season. And I do think Dawn is also someone that is very likely to win the game if she was there against someone that wasn't Cochran. Or again, had it been a Sherry, Eddie, Dawn final 3, I think Dawn is the front runner to win there. And also, again, I think she possibly even beats Eric. I think she definitely does have win equity there if Cochran isn't there. Now, obviously, the issue is the fact that she is trying to get Cochran there, but I still do think she plays a pretty solid game throughout the entire season. And I would say something that I do actually give her more credit for than Cochran is that I think she actually is the one that has these personal connections that actually allows them to navigate through the game. And Dawn is the person that had this connection with Brenda that keeps her in line. She also had the relationship with the 3 amigos and was constantly looked at as a swing vote throughout a lot of the season. And through that, again, it shows her having, again, more power in the game, though, again, I think the biggest knock against her is the fact that she does utilize that power to benefit Cochran's game. And because, again, I think you could definitely argue that she is a second in command, but I do think the fact that she had a lot of influence in the game, probably more influence than Cochran himself had, where I think a lot of Cochran's influence came from the fact that he was utilizing Dawn's influence. To me, that is something that I do think puts her above the likes of, again, like a Chelsea, a Sabrina, these people who didn't really have that much influence on their own and were more so backing off of the influence that Kim had. Again, I feel like Dawn had a lot of influence in her own right, while also, again, having win equity, and someone that, again, I do think was playing pretty optimally for a good chunk of the game. I just think she needed to cut Cochran at the tail end there. But I think outside that, I think her game is one that if she did go on to win the game, I would look at her as a dominant winner. So because that, again, I do feel like she lands around this spot here at number 11. Now number 10, and a similar thing, though I think this person's actually more at fault for their loss, where they literally had a binary choice of losing or winning and took the losing path. But they are also a player that literally came 1 vote away from winning even against their tougher competition. That person is Colby from Survivor Australian Outback. And again, Colby is this player that I used to assess very highly. I remember there was a point where like Colby was like one of my top runners up of all time. And to be fair, again, he's top 10. But I do feel like he's in a spot now where, again, I do look at Tina as the dominant figure of the duo. I do think Tina was the better player of the two. I think she is the person that was able to, again, really utilize Colby's influence early on in the game to put herself at the top of the new power structure. Again, making Colby undyingly loyal to her, also having Keith by her side, and through that, again, was locked safe by the end game. Now, along with that, though, I'll say, again, I do look at Colby as a co-dominant player. Again, I think he is someone that also had his own influence. As I said, again, I think literally at the beginning of the game, it is Colby that is making these decisions that, again, are guided by Tina. And again, that's why I would ultimately give Tina more of the credit on that season. But I think Colby himself deserves a lot of credit in the same way, again, I think Dawn deserves a lot of the credit alongside Cochran. Where, again, I think he is somebody that, again, had these relations with the likes of Amber and Jerry and really plays the middle during the early portions of the season pretty well. He then gets to Merge, where essentially at that point, he is nearly unstoppable. Again, despite the fact that he wins 5 immunity challenges, he's rarely talked about as a target, someone that we need to get out, where, again, him and Tina really just ran the show from beginning to end. Now, again, I think a criticism here for sure is the fact that he gets to a final 3 that's not particularly optimal for him, in that obviously Keith is there, and Keith is someone that would vote him out. Also, the fact that he loses Amber along the way. Again, that's a spot where he just outright loses on that vote. Along with the fact that obviously he makes a bad decision at the tail end. Again, the fact that he ultimately picks Tina over Keith is, again, bad, though, to be fair, I also think he knew that as well and was more so just doing it because he knew it would make him popular more than anything. But again, I think Colby is this player here that has a lot of flaws. I would say actually probably has more flaws than Dawn. But also, I feel like he comes even closer to winning the game. Again, he literally is at, again, a binary choice of winning and losing. Again, he would have won easily against Keith, probably an unanimous vote. And even against Tina, he was very close to even beating Tina. It was a 4-3 vote. Where again, had he sucked up to the likes of a Jerry or Alicia, I think he has a serious chance of winning that season. So again, I think for me, like him versus Dawn, I think it's pretty close back and forth. I think Dawn actually has the edge in most aspects, but I think it is the fact that Colby even almost beats his own alliance member. Again, I don't think Dawn has any chance against Cochran. I think Colby was in a spot where, again, he at least almost beats Tina. So while, again, I think his path is a little bit weaker than Dawn's, I think his win equity at the end is definitely larger. So because of that, for me, he's here at number 10. Now, number 9, moving on to a person that we've talked about already, a player that I do think had their stronger game the first time around. And that player is Amanda Kimmel from Survivor China. And again, Amanda's game in Survivor China, I do think is, again, a co-dominant game alongside Todd. Again, her and Todd are this duo from the very beginning of the game. They end up running pretty much the entire game together. To where, again, Todd ends up winning at the end. But even then, like, to give credit to Amanda, it wasn't like this clear-cut case of like Todd just easily beats her at the end. Again, it was a debate. While again, it didn't really show in the votes where again she only gets 1 vote while Todd obviously wins with 4. It's still a spot where again like the jury was between the two of them and was more so just trying to decide which one to end up voting for. So again, I think in comparison to someone like a Dawn, I feel like Dawn is someone that again doesn't have a single chance against Cochran. I think Amanda at least stood a chance, but obviously did not really perform up to snuff in her final tribal. I think a bigger criticism of Amanda here is again more similar to like Colby and the fact that she had this opportunity to get rid of Todd and just simply doesn't at the end. Again, she had the opportunity at Final 4. She could have voted him out. And to be fair, again, I think the vote between her, Courtney, and Denise is definitely up for grabs. I would lean towards Amanda winning, but I don't think it is this like clear-cut thing. And again, considering how like Todd was looked at as this like big villain out there, I can at least like understand the decision, but I do think it is still one that I do think she ultimately makes the wrong call. But really outside that, again, her game is pretty smooth. Again, she's in the majority the entire time, in the majority from the very beginning, and alongside Todd throughout a lot of the vote. Now, I will say on the show, at least, we do see a lot more of the relationships that Todd was making. We don't see as much with Amanda. And again, from what we've seen also, again, certain jury members did not really connect with Amanda, and where again, they kind of found her a bit standoffish. So where again, I think that is definitely like a criticism to be had here. But again, she's still in a dominant position for most of the game. She is the person that brings up the James blindside when the James blindside actually happens. Now again, it's technically Todd's idea from like a couple rounds ago, but again, she's the one to actually bring it up again when James actually does go home. And outside of that, again, it's just a stable game. Again, there's not really much to say here outside of the fact that she's simply in the majority and has influence throughout most of the season, but obviously is still faulted at the very, very end with her not taking the shot against Todd when she could have. But even that leads to a relatively close final tribal. So again, I think she still plays a pretty solid game. She's here at number 9. Now number 8. And now we're moving on to a player that is one of the more recent players on the board here. One that I think some people would probably argue should not be this high. As again, I do think this person actually has more mistakes in their game than the last few people we talked about. But I also feel like their game as a whole is pretty impressive to me. And that person is Austin from Survivor 45. And again, I think the thing at the end of the day with Austin is that a lot of people are going to call out how outplayed he was by D, and how, again, he was like on the, and again, how she blindsided him and made a fool of him during the Emily and Drew votes, which, yeah, she did. The thing is, though, I think outside that, his game is actually really strong, where I think he plays a nearly spotless game up to that point. Again, I think pre-merge, he obviously is involved in the creation of the Reba 4. He obviously has that alliance with Drew. He has a final 2 with D. And again, they just pretty easily steamroll the season. And we even see, like, at the swap, again, despite the fact that there is this, like, fight for Emily, we see Austin do some very effective work there, where, again, Drew is pretty ineffective in getting Emily on their side. Austin is the one to really solidify that deal. And again, I think Austin does a lot of good work early on the season, and then he comes into merge also in a pretty good position. Obviously, the Reba 4 just as a whole really end up dominating the early portions of the merge, and within that, Austin himself is in a very good position. Again, him and Drew, I think, are the people that you mainly credit with the Kelly blindside, which really allows the Rebas to truly run the post-merge phase, and even in the position of the final 7, where, again, he starts to get outplayed by D. That's even a spot where technically outplays D and Julie at first, where obviously, again, there's the big criticism, obviously, him giving his idol to Julie. That is definitely very questionable, but he actually does course correct pretty well at that point. He does get almost the entire tribe to want to blindside Julie, where, again, at the final 7, he had 5 people on board with that plan. The problem is that obviously he leaks the plan to D, and again, I think in general, like, his biggest issues in this game are the fact that he is so undyingly loyal to D. So obviously D, again, ends up ruining his plan, tells Julie to play the idol, and then proceeds to blindside him at the following vote. And again, I think that is the major downside of his game, though I think a pro within all this is the fact that even despite the fact that all this happened, he was never actually in danger this entire time. Where, yeah, again, he is on the outstarting to Drew vote and completely blindsided there. But again, there was never really an option to take out Austin. Again, Austin was never the planned target at any point, specifically because, again, D was actually loyal to Austin. Where, again, while she is, again, making these moves that undercut him during those 2 rounds, she is actually very loyal to him, as we see in the following round, where, again, they essentially regroup. And again, D had always planned on going to the end with Austin, which I think is something that I definitely give him a lot more credit for, as, again, it's a terrible move for D to go to the end with Austin, as it is a bad move for Austin to go to the end with D, obviously. To where, while I think, again, it is impressive for D to get Austin to be loyal to her, I think it's also very impressive for Austin to get D to be loyal to him. And we see him probably playing the best, I guess, at the final 5 round, where just everyone's playing terribly. Though obviously that's a point where you could debate that. Should he have actually turned on D at that point? But again, he's actually the only person that actually gets his way during that round. And supposedly it was because he did some good work with Katurah right before Tribal that got her to switch her vote. And ultimately, Austin, despite these mistakes that he makes in the game, gets very close to winning the game. Again, he gets to the end against D, who is looked at as this, like, unbeatable force for a lot of the season, and he almost beats her in a jury vote. It's a 5-3 vote. And beyond that, I think Austin has a decent chunk of win equity in most given situations. So while I think he loses against Julie within the end game, I do think he very likely beats Drew. I think he very likely beats Jake and Katurah. I think he was actually poised to potentially win the game had he just been willing to cut D in that end game stretch, which, again, is still a fatal flaw, but it's a fatal flaw that the last few people we've talked about have. And outside that, again, I think he actually is playing a very solid game, one where I would actually say Austin's playing the better game than D up until the final 7. I think he's someone that manages his threat level better. I think he's somebody that actually has probably more influence in how the game is playing out until that point. So again, had it not been for the final 7, final 6 rounds, had he still been a runner-up to D, he would have been even higher on the list. Yeah, I think I think his blind loyalty to D is something that definitely knocks him down a smidge here and puts him here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that I think is a bit of a transitionary player here. Again, kind of in the middle of these 2 sub-tiers, where I think the next tier that we're about to get to is one of these people that I think are more clearly the alphas in terms of how their alliances navigated through the game. There are players that did a lot more independently, while this person, again, I think can fall into that, but also, again, has a more spotty game than those people in the next tier, where in terms of navigation through the game, I think this person's game is probably more in line with Austin, which, again, kind of puts them, like, again, kind of in the middle of these 2 tiers here. But at number 7, I'm going to go with Mike White from Survivor David vs. Goliath. Mike is a player that I do think there are arguments that he should be more in this semi-dominant tier, where I really don't think Mike's true control of the game really fully comes together until, like, the final 9 round, where Carl goes home, where really from that point on, I think he has full control over the game. He's really controlling pretty much everything that's happening, where, again, he takes out Carl. At final 8, he is part of the plan to put the split vote onto Gabby. At final 7, he's in charge of taking out Christian. At final 6, again, he's fully in charge of taking out Davey, and he ends up getting to what his planned final 3 was of Nick and Angelina. Now, I think a question mark there is the fact that Nick is someone that beats him, and that's obviously something that is not great. The fact that he wanted to go DM Nick, mind you, in the real life scenario, Nick obviously wins immunity, and there was nothing he could really do about it, but he also did actually want to go to DM Nick, which I do think is a criticism here. The fact that Nick is someone that just blatantly beats him, especially in a spot where he had a much better other option in Kara, where, again, if it was a Kara, Angelina, Mike final three, again, he does win the game. To where, again, I think that is something that I would definitely fault him for, is wanting to go DN with Nick. Along with the fact that, again, his early game is kind of up and down. Now, again, it's not really bad to the point where I would put him like the semi-dominant tier, but it's definitely something that, again, just has its up and downs. Again, initially, he's not seemingly within the core group on the Goliath's tribe, but he is relatively safe. They do target the likes of Jeremy and Natalie over him, where he's never really in the conversation to be targeted there. And after the swap, I think he does very good work to build a relationship with Nick, and like him, Nick, and Angelina really hold the majority there, which, again, I think is all good play there. But again, I think it is really the merge where I would more so criticize him for, where I think he gets a little bit sloppier in his targeting of Christian and how gung-ho he is about it, especially in a spot where he ultimately ends up failing for a bit. And obviously, again, I think he's technically in the majority during that portion of the game. It's just that the Davids have advantages to utilize to benefit them. But even then, again, he's kind of just like completely aloof in the Dan Rengering vote off. To where, again, I think there definitely are major criticisms at that portion of the game. But really outside that, again, his final 9 on, I think, is very strong. Had he wanted to go to the end against someone that he would have beat. I think also, again, his swap phase is also very strong. It's really just these other holes in his game that, again, make him a little bit questionable here. Where, again, for me, it was this debate of, like, should he be this high? As I think he has, like, more holes in his game than some of the people we just talked about. Where, again, I think, at least before Austin, the players before that are all people that had pretty stable rides through a game. And Austin's that person that, again, I think has that one blind spot. And again, I really debate if, like, Mike is someone that, like, has more issues there. But I do think at the end of the day, his issues are probably more in line with someone like an Austin's. Again, it's really just like one round where he's like completely aloof at what's happening, where, again, while he's not really running things on the original Goliath tribe, he is still like safe there. And again, even at the like John Hennigan boot, he is in the majority. So again, I think there aren't many points where like he's just outright out of the loop on what's happening. I think it's one round, again, comparable to the likes of Austin. And I think a reason why I do have him above Austin for me is the fact that, again, I think his mistake that he makes at the end of wanting to go to Nick is something that is a little bit more understandable, especially considering the fact that, again, he was rich and didn't really need the money, where he was more so in the spot where he wanted to make sure the person that he wanted to win won, which, again, questionable, that person being Nick Wilson at that point. But again, I think it's a spot where, like, I at least understand Mike's motives and think even he understood that Nick was someone that was a bigger threat, but was kind of just fine with that. It's a spot where, again, I think Austin's is more so based on, like, just him being blindly loyal, which I think is a little bit more of a detractor for me. But at the end of the day, again, it's not that big of a difference. I think Mike and Austin are, again, relatively close for me. But I do think the fact that Mike had this, like, really strong end game stretch in particular, something that I do give the edge to Mike here. So he's here number 7. Now number 6, and now we're on to the next sub-tier of the list. As I said, again, these players that were in these dominant positions, had a lot of influence in the game, though didn't necessarily have this like full-on control of the game that the top of the top sub-tier ends up having. And at number 6, we're going to be starting all that off with Chase Rice from Survivor Nicaragua. Where, again, I've talked about this in multiple runner-up rankings at this point, but again, Chase is a player that I don't think he's necessarily the greatest player in the world. I think he's a pretty baseline player, but in terms of the game he played here on Survivor Nicaragua, I think he actually plays a pretty solid game. Again, it's one where he is in the majority for pretty much the entire time. There's not really a single vote where he's like out of the loop on what is happening. Oh, well, he had win equity kind of at the end. Now, again, there were definitely a portion of the jury that did not like him, but again, he gets a 5-4 vote against Fabio, who was a pretty formidable final jury threat. Though, to be fair, there's the notion out there that, again, it was potentially that 2 of his votes were sympathy votes. But still, again, I do think he had very strong relations with likes of Holly, likes of Jane, and I do think he actively won Alina's vote over Fabio at Final Tribal, to where, again, I think Chase has a decent chunk of win equity if he was not there with Fabio. Where, again, I think in the actual planned Final 3, where, again, had Fabio not won out, he would have gone to the end against Sash and Holly, and I do think he is a very likely winner there, considering the jury did not seem to particularly respect Holly either. But again, in terms of his navigation through the game, again, he was in the majority the entire time. Mind you, again, I think there are some weird moves along the way. Again, I think him initially siding with Shannon, then flipping on Shannon, I think that was definitely not a great start to his game, and him very much coming off as wishy-washy there. Then, again, he gets swapped into a position where the younger players end up maintaining the majority, and then gets to merge where he builds this really strong bond with the likes of Holly and Jane, and they end up running a lot of the show. Now, again, I think you could definitely like debate things like the Brenda vote off, where I think that is definitely something that was much more beneficial for someone like Holly. But again, we do see him being a cutthroat enough player when he needs to, and the fact that he like takes out Jane. And in general, again, I think Chase's navigation through the game is solid. Now again, the reason why he's not higher on this list is because I don't know how much true influence he really displays in the game, where, again, I think he's someone that we don't really see like actively putting these plans together in the way that we do for, again, the top 5 people that we'll be talking about, where I think that is obviously a major criticism here for me with Chase. But again, I think in comparison to the likes of Mike and Austin, I think he's more stably in the majority the entire time, is in a majority alliance that he cultivated, that he also is right in the center of, while also having win equity within that group, while also isn't like necessarily like the potential beta to another player, where I don't think this is a spot where like Holly was his dominant player and Chase was the secondary to that, in a way that you can argue with the likes of, again, like an Austin, a Colby, a Dawn, Amanda. But despite that, I don't necessarily think Chase is the most like active strategic player either. And through that, again, I do think at the end of the day, Chase is someone that I think is a solid runner up here. One that, again, almost wins the game. One that, again, comes relatively close to winning the game. Definitely had jury prospects outside of his actual final 3 scenario, and was in a good position for a lot of the game. So again, for me, that is good enough to put him here at number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to the last person I actually have not talked about in this ranking beforehand, where the top 4, and spoiler it for the list, are pretty much the same from my previous top 4s. But at number 5 here, we have someone new. One of the most recent runners up on the board, we do have Charlie Davis from Survivor 46, which, again, Charlie's a player here that I do think some people really sleep on how impressive of a game he played, which, again, I think you could argue how many like active strategic moves Charlie actually makes, but the reality is still, though, that despite that, he is in a very good position the entire game. He is in this swing position where, while he's very, rarely pulling a vote in a certain direction, he is very often the person right in the middle that is ultimately deciding which side goes through. And again, when he is that, while also being someone that isn't being targeted for the majority of the season, while also somebody that has a lot of win equity, it literally comes 1 vote away from beating Kenzie, likely wins in the final 3 combination he actually wanted with Liz there instead of Kenzie. Again, I think Charlie's game here is very, very impressive. It is one where, again, like right away, we see him being right in the middle of his starting tribe. He has a really strong bond with Maria. He has a really strong bond with Ben, and he essentially ends up deciding the gem vote in a spot where he is able to actually get Maria to flip over to his side, where Maria wanted to save the women, he wanted to side with the men. And again, he's able to get Maria to save Ben in a spot where, again, Maria did not like Ben the entire time. And again, it's a move that is so clearly in his best interest, where, again, I think that was a very impressive move. And again, coming to merge, he's definitely on the outs initially. Again, during that Mariah vote, I think that's definitely something to criticize there. But even within that, he knows what's happening, and he still, again, ends up splitting his vote in a way that, again, I think that shows some decent game acumen there. And beyond that, again, he's once again in the swing position following that. Again, when Soda ends up going home, again, he's right in the middle. And he's once again in swing positions during the Tevin vote off, the Hunter vote off, the Tiffany vote. And I think he plays the Tiffany vote very well in the sense that he's able to get Maria to really take the forefront of that vote, increasing her threat level while managing his. And I think that's something that is very impressive from Charlie, is how he manages his threat level. Where, again, despite the fact that he could win at the end, he never had a majority of the tribe targeting him, and was able to, again, push these other targets ahead of him. And while eventually Maria ends up targeting him, by that point, he had already done a lot of good legwork in setting up a new majority. Again, he obviously has his relationship with Ben, he builds a relationship with Liz, and ends up having this debate between Venus and Kenzie on who to bring in. Now, again, I will definitely criticism for voting out Venus. I think that was the wrong call. I think Venus was definitely a major asset for his game, and so he ends up deciding to take her out over Kenzie when she has an idol. I think that is a wrong call. I think that is definitely the incorrect move in that spot. But despite that, again, he still is in a spot where he has an alliance backing him, taking him all the way to Final 4 in a position where he, again, very likely wins against Ben and Liz. And again, that was what his plan Final 3 was. Where had Kenzie lost fire in that spot, he wins the game. And I think something else to talk about is how impressive his relationship with Ben is, where it's a spot where Ben is somebody that ends up essentially being this kingmaker towards the end. And again, Charlie ends up really maintaining that loyalty, where, again, despite the fact that the show portrays it as if Kenzie has this really good relationship with Ben, it was never strong enough to deter him away from Charlie. And again, we see him taking Charlie to the Final 3, and we do know that if there had been a tie at Final Tribal, which, again, they were so close to being one, Ben does vote for Charlie, and Charlie does win. To where, again, I think he was extremely close to winning there, especially when we hear from the jury that almost everybody switched their votes at the last second. Now, again, obviously, that is a failing of his, the fact that he loses like Venus and Q's vote at Final Tribal, but he also gained jury votes at Final Tribal. Again, he gained the likes of Soda and Hunter, to which, again, you rarely see from a runner-up. So, again, he was just so insanely close to winning the game. Also having, again, a pretty solid navigation to your game, and really just that mergatory vote is really the one downside here, and plays pretty optimally at most situations, again, withstanding the Venus vote off. And I think Charlie's game is very impressive. I think he is one of the better runners-up of all time. And again, I did debate him and Chase, and while, again, Chase doesn't really even have this like point that he's like kind of on the outs of what's happening like Charlie does with the Mariah vote. I did feel like Charlie ultimately is one that I would put higher because I think Charlie was more likely to win in the final 3 situation that he was in, while also probably had more win equity and was also probably just in general more respected by the jury. So again, it's not much of a difference, but at the end I did put Charlie above him here at number 5. Now number 4, and again, top 4 are the same top 4 as last time, with number 4 being exactly the same. At number 4, we do have Stephen Fishbach from Survivor Tocantins. And again, my opinion on Stephen's game has not really changed. I still think Stephen is a very impressive runner-up. Despite the fact that he gets 0 votes at the end against JT, I think he's somebody that very likely beats a lot of the other endgamers, where again, I think he was very close to getting to the end of Erin, where he probably beats her. I think he probably beats Taj, very likely beats Coach, to where again, I think Stephen was probably the next biggest jury threat on the board in the endgame. So again, him and JT end up essentially running the show together. Again, they were both very solidly positioned on the original Jalapao, end up winning the day, some endgame votes there, where also even beyond that, again, we see Stephen be the center person in his trio with Taj, where again, he had the closest relationship with Taj, he had the closest relationship with JT, and I think that's very impressive. Now again, I think JT does take a little bit more control after the merge, and again, he ends up building more relationships with the likes of Coach and Debbie, and Stephen ends up being a little bit more of the beta at that point, but even within that, I do think Stephen does some good strategic maneuvering, and where again we see Stephen be more involved in taking out Tyson. We also see Stephen doing a lot more to build the bond of Erin, which is something that becomes very integral for their end game. And also, I think we just see Stephen getting his way a lot more towards the end game, where again we see him again taking out Coach, and while again JT does better during management and how that happens, I do think Stephen ends up making a move that is much better for him than it is for JT. Same thing with taking out Taj. I think that was also a good move for him, as it gets him to a final 3, where again, had Erin won final immunity, Stephen probably wins the game. Now again, it's still debatable if Stephen himself would have made the move if he won final immunity, where again, even he doesn't fully know if he would have done it. But again, he was still in a position where he had a winning scenario even by the end game, in a spot where again, I think he runs the game alongside JT, and I think he gets the better of JT at multiple points in the season, along with also being much safer towards the end game with still a lot of win equity, to where again, I think Stephen's game is pretty good despite the fact that he got 0 votes at the end against JT. But again, I do think he was relatively close to not getting to the end against JT, in which he more than likely wins in pretty dominant fashion, to where again, I think Stephen's game is still very, very good. He's here at number 4. Now number 3, and again, at number 3, the top 3 here are the same top 3. It is the same placement for my global runner-up ranking. Technically, the placements are a bit different from my original runner-up ranking I did 5 years ago, but anyway, this is like the top of the top tier of runners-up. Again, all extremely dominant players, controlled a good chunk of the game, also could have theoretically won at the end. At number 3, we're going to the person who came the closest to winning Survivor without actually winning, and that person is Dominic Abate from Survivor Ghost Island. And again, Dom is in this spot here where he largely is in this tier because of how close he was to win, where outside that, there is a hole in his game. Again, there is obviously the Morgan vote. He does get blindsided there. I think that's pretty bad. And really just in general, I think he starts off the game a bit rough. Again, his handling of Chris was a bit misguided. Mind you, if they had ever gone to Tribal on the original DVD, supposedly Tribal lines were 5v5, and I think it's more likely that Chelsea probably flips on the revote, to where again, I think Dom is probably safe through that first vote anyway, but again, I still think he starts off the game pretty poorly, but I think after the Morgan vote, I think his game becomes very impressive, where he really is in the driver's seat really from that point on. Again, we do see him be the one that actually pull in Laurel to his alliance, creating this 4-person alliance with Laurel, Donathan, and Wendell. We obviously see his relationship with Wendell be a major influence in his game, and I do feel like Dominic does a lot more of the legwork over Wendell, to where, again, Wendell himself does some pretty good work along the way, but I do think Dominic does a lot more of the strategic maneuvering for the duo. I think we see him have a lot more of the strategic relationships there, where we see him again having a bond with like Chelsea and with like Kellen, and again they just end up essentially just running most of the post-merge phase, facing no real adversity. So again, they're able to keep Laurel on their side when Kellen and Chelsea try to flip the vote on them, and again, it's just a pretty smooth ride up until obviously the final 6, where that's a spot where again people do talk about targeting Dom, but again, I think Dom does some very good work there and getting the target off his back, and obviously again it backfires on him in terms of jury prospects. But after that, he has a pretty clean ride to the end, and again, you can argue obviously the fact that obviously he was benefited by having an idol that made it so people never talked about targeting him at 5, and he won immunity at 4, but I also feel like he plays the game intentionally that way, where obviously the way he plays at 6 is very much influenced by the fact that he knows if he gets the 5, he is safe there. So again, I think it's just kind of a little bit of a mixed bag on how to necessarily process all that, and even then, I don't know if either Laurel or Wendell would have made the move, where while I don't think Wendell would have wanted to go to the end with Dominic, I think he was going to try to cut Dominic at the very, very end at Final 4, more so than Final 5. I feel like I'm not super confident in the fact that Wendell would actually cut him in that specific spot, and also, Laurel is someone that seemed to be pretty resolute at that point to going to the end against Wendell and Dominic, thinking your best chance was to split the votes between the two, to where, again, I don't even know if Dominic necessarily even goes there. But again, obviously, he comes extremely close to winning in a spot where, again, he gets 5 votes out of 10, gets to a tie, where obviously he loses when Laurel ends up voting for Wendell. But I still think within that, again, there is some wonkiness there for sure. Again, like Angela is someone that supposedly said the reason she voted for Wendell is simply because he was looking up at her when she was trying to decide her vote, which again is such a wonky thing there. And it's like this weird also spot where, like, had Dominic known it was going to go to a tie, if he actually saved Angela over Laurel, he probably goes on to win the game, with Angela probably voting for Dominic in that position in the tiebreaker. But again, like, how would he know that? So again, there are things to like mention of like ways that he could play better, but again, there's no way that you would actually know that that was your optimal play from the island there. And just in general, again, I think Dominic's game is very, very good. Again, he steamrolls really a lot of the season. Though again, I think there is actually an argument that he should be lower on this list simply because of how advantage heavy his game was and how rough his beginning of the game was. But I still think the fact that he is in this like really dominant position, really from like round 4 up until like the final 6, is still a very impressive stretch. And the fact that he again gets to a tie at Final Tribal in a spot where, again, at least he was actively trying to cut Wendell and just was never really given the opportunity to do so. To where, again, he is at least playing optimally in that light as well. To where, again, I think he beats anybody but Wendell. To where, again, I think there is other impressive aspects to Dominic's game that, while there are some holes, I think his strengths outweigh those holes to put him here at number 3. Now, number 2, moving on to a player that, again, also very dominant game. Again, this person was number 3 on my original runner-up ranking. And again, it is those little holes of Dominic's game that did switch these placements. But at number 2, I'm going to go with Coach from Survivor South Pacific. And Coach is a player that, again, I think just steamrolls the game from beginning to end in a dominant alliance the entire time. I think clearly has a lot of influence within that alliance. So where, again, I think there's a lot of people that kind of downplay Coach's game, talking about how, oh, it's Coach, and that, again, Sophie and Albert knew that they could beat Coach at the end, and that's why they went with him, which, again, fair, but also Coach himself does some very impressive work across the season, again, getting one over the likes of Sophie and Albert. Again, he literally takes out Michaela, a move that, again, he wanted to make in a spot where, again, Sophie and Albert fought really hard to keep Michaela, even voted with Michaela and ended up failing there. And again, even at the like merge vote, we see Coach do a lot of the legwork to pull in Cochran, and Cochran is like pretty much solely his number, along with him also having this bond with Edna, to where, again, I think people that claim that Coach's game is purely based on the fact that like people look at them as a go, I think is pretty misfounded, especially considering the fact that, again, from what we've heard from the jury, it does seem like he could have won. Now, again, it would have been a spot where he would have had to perform admirably at Final Tribal, where Sophie was the front runner coming into Final Tribal, but again, had he owned his game and talked about playing the game in a manipulative way and talked about using religion as a strategy, supposedly a lot of the Savaii members would have flipped to Coach. Yeah, obviously we don't see that actually happen, but again, I think Coach is relatively close to winning, but obviously, again, it is still Coach. Like, obviously, again, the reason he doesn't end up owning up to that is because it is Coach, and I think that is something to definitely call out here. But I still think his navigation of the game is very impressive. Again, he's in the majority alliance the entire time, despite coming into the season with a massive target on his back. I mean, we see from the offset that the likes of Christine and Stacy are very anti-Coach, despite that he's able to form this majority against them, and is never really in danger for really the entire game. Now, I think a major criticism to be held here is to hold against him here is how he navigates through the endgame stretch, where I think the fact that he cuts Cochran and Edna where he does is pretty misguided, where, again, those are the two people that he would have very clearly beaten at the end, like, no question. And the fact that he cuts them, go to the end against Sophie, who's a bit more formidable, I think is definitely misguided there. Though at the same time, again, obviously Ozzy comes back from Redemption Island, and again, would Cochran and Edna been able to beat him? Probably not. So again, it's kind of another weird aspect of his game there. And to be fair, again, even in that endgame scenario, again, he does come relatively close to beating Sophie, who wasn't particularly loved while out there either. Where, again, I think Coach's game is still very impressive. I think it is one where just a minor tweak to his game, I think it's one of the most dominant winning games in the history of the show. But even as a runner-up here, I think he ends up playing one of the best individual games the show has ever seen, and because of that, for me, he ends up landing here number 2. Now number 1, and at number 1, we're moving on to the person I've said for ages is the best runner-up in history of the show, which, again, definitely has some question marks to it, but that person is Boston Rob from Survivor All-Stars. And again, I think Boston Rob plays one of the most dominant games in the history of the show on Survivor All-Stars. Again, he runs the show from beginning to end, never really faces any true adversity, and the only time he really does, he's able to subvert that pretty quickly at the final 5 with Big Tom, and also, again, potentially at 4, but is able to get Jenna to not want to go to a tiebreaker. And again, I think just in general, Rob plays an extremely impressive game. Again, takes control of his original tribe, obviously has the showmance with Amber, but again, has bonds with the likes of Big Tom, and while, again, gets into fights with Alicia, still had a working relationship with her, And again, they blindside Rob Cesternino. I do think he's very much benefited from the fact that obviously he had a lot of pregame relationships. Also the fact that he was not looked at as one of the bigger threats on the board that made his navigation a little bit easier. Along with the fact that obviously Shapiro was also a tribe of kind of lesser threats in the game, which made it a lot easier to cultivate that group together. To where, again, I think there are definitely some lucky aspects of Boston Rob's run here, but I do think he still just steamrolls the season. Again, maintains the numbers coming into the merge. Obviously, we have the entire Lex situation, which, to be fair, I don't think is necessarily like a game move from Rob. Or, again, I think he would have been fine if Amber did go there. He would have actually probably been a better spot to go on to win the game. But still ends up being a pretty impressive move to pull off, even though, again, it's still pre-game related. But from that point on, again, just dominates the rest of the game, takes out Lex, takes out Kathy, takes out Alicia and Sheehan, and again, is able to impressively get Tom and Rupert to go after each other at Final 5, and then is able to get Jenna to flip at 4. So again, it's just like a pretty clean game from a navigational standpoint. Now, looking at it more critically, I think there definitely are still complaints to be had here. I mean, at the end of the day, he is a runner-up. And again, none of these games are spotless, and really just in general, most games of Survivor are not spotless. But again, still, like, Rob still has holes for sure. Again, his jury management's not particularly great with how he handles the Lex situation and how he handles Big Tom on his way out. I think he also just comes off as a dick at multiple points in the season. But I do think he's I think his win equity is a bit more than people give him credit for. I mean, obviously in the Amber Rob final 2 that we see, he gets 3 votes. Again, he's only 1 vote away from winning, which again, to even be in that position where you're only 1 vote away from winning is again relatively rare for these runners up. But even beyond that, I think people talk about it as if Rob can't win the game when I don't think that's true. Again, based on what we've heard from the jury, I do think he beats Jenna, especially if Jenna wins final immunity and takes him. Where I think that would maintain his vote from Amber. I think he would still get Rupert's vote, who had made a promise to him that they were going to vote for each other if they had gotten to the end. And he would get Sheehan's vote, who is very anti-Jenna, to where the question mark would become Kathy, who I do think still votes for him, especially considering her rationale for her jury vote is very much based on their pregame relationship. Even though, to be fair, again, she was also a very anti-Amber presence, to where, again, it's a little bit more up in the air, but I do think it is very likely that he does beat Jenna, which, again, to be fair, he was not striving for that situation, but also I think there's reasons for him to not be striving for that situation, especially on a season like All-Stars, where even the runner-up got more money than they would otherwise. And just in general, again, I think Rob's game here, from a navigational standpoint, I think pretty clearly the best runner-up on the board. I mean, he's someone that, again, is in the majority the entire time, has a lot of control over how the votes are playing out, faces off against very little adversity. So, where, again, I think from a pure navigational standpoint, I think him and Coach are the best runners-up here. But the thing that gives Rob the edge over Coach here for me is the fact that, again, I think he was playing more optimally for a lot of the season, especially in terms of like who he was necessarily getting out in what positions, but also comes pretty close to winning, even in the real-life scenario, but also in the potential other option, where I think Coach had a tougher time actually winning the game, especially Coach, to where, again, I think Rob plays a very dominant game from beginning to end, while also having, again, a modicum of win equity there, which, again, for me is enough to put him here at number 1. But with that, again, that is my updated runner-up ranking for Survivor US. Again, will I do this again in 5 years? Who knows? But obviously, again, I will continue to do these bigger rankings periodically as time goes on. I'll probably end up redoing some older rankings along the way as well. And considering this is the 6-year anniversary video for the channel, I'd like to obviously thank everybody for being here after 6 years. And sure, again, this was actually not supposed to be the 6-year anniversary video. It was actually supposed to be a ranking of every Australian Survivor player, though considering the airing schedule of Australian Survivor didn't really work out in this spot. So again, that'll probably be towards the end of the year at this point. But again, stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for, again, more big rankings, random other reality TV content, random other general content. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.